An unworthy son of a respectable noble family, he lived in the academy like a king until his family decided to get rid of him and erase him from the register. The young man had the feeling that the universe was simply mocking him. Ed Taylor's life was over. He had just been thrown out of his dorm with all his belongings like a mangy dog. Rumors immediately spread throughout the academy that his family had disowned him, meaning Ed wasn't worth the dirt under his feet. The vile, arrogant nobleman paid for his actions, and the attitude towards him was appropriate. But there was also injustice in this matter, because the impudent Ed, who everyone was whispering about, was not him at all, thought the personality in the body of the former nobleman. He launched a game set in the Sylvania Magic Academy, a failed swordsman of the academy. The game gave the choice to play the role of the eldest son of the owner of a large corporation, or a talented young gentleman from a criminal clan, or a high-ranking hunter. But out of all the options, he got a third-rate villain who was kicked out of the dorm at the beginning of the game, the worst character, at the worst time of his life. The new owner of this fate could not believe that this had happened to him because all his life he had lived modestly and simply greed had never been his vice. The disciples who witnessed his tirade were outraged that such a scumbag was talking about justice after all his atrocities. Ed looked in the mirror and saw a status window that showed his stats, even though he studied at the magic faculty and had low intelligence and disgusting stamina. Which is not surprising, since he is written as a mediocre, dissolute villain who appears at the very beginning of the story and is difficult to remember. The settler tried to remember what had happened to Ed. He appeared in the final credits as a beggar who was indistinguishable from the other tramps. It was natural. The hooligan didn't know anything about the world, and he suddenly found himself on the street. Staying alive was already luck. He didn't know why he had gotten into this world, he didn't know how, and he was unlikely to find out now, but the new Ed Taylor wasn't going to give up. The academy was more like a castle. Its territory was the entire island of Arkan to the north. East of it there was a wild forest. Ed hid from the curious students and ended up wandering around in the dense forest for half a day. This time was enough for him to assess his dire situation. The episode with Ed's expulsion happens at the very beginning. Fortunately, although his relatives disowned him, he was not yet expelled from the academy. And this was important. The academy was a first-class institution, and it was enough to graduate from it to ensure your future. All the action would take place in it, and Ed could use the memory of the 5 adventures of this game and lead an amazing life. So obviously the main goal is to finish studying. The problem is the huge cost. The last semester is paid for, but beyond that, there is an abyss. If he failed to get a scholarship, he would be expelled, but with his current characteristics, it was difficult to do so. But now it was more important to provide oneself with food, clothing, shelter, and to manage not to become a vagabond in the next week. There were no problems with clothing. But there were problems with food and housing. Because of his reputation, he was unlikely to be hired. He couldn't return to the hostel, which meant he was stuck in the forest. It was lucky that there was a stream with drinking water nearby. There were 10 days before the start of the semester, and during this time, it was necessary to level up to become stronger. It was lucky that Ed knew a few spells. The wind blade was good for processing logs. It was quite exciting, but he ran out of steam after cutting down 15 trunks, but it was of little use. Using magic whets the appetite, Ed discovered and remembered his grandfather telling him how in years of bad harvests they would eat young bark. Ed used Ignite on a cup of water and tried to cook some sticks. He was ready to eat anything. If you don't look closely, it looks like a chicken breast, he thought, examining the bark. Hungry, Ed popped it into his mouth and began to chew, hoping for a filling dinner. But apparently nothing happened. Only the young shoots were edible, and for the next 2 days Ed felt sick and cursed his grandfather. His attempts to build a hut were clumsy. He could not fit the sticks and branches together. They kept falling. Ed tried to bury them deeper and first install a frame that would hold everything, but there were 4 supports and only 2 arms. That's why it was not easy at all at first, and the house was constantly falling apart. But despite the pain and fatigue, Ed was still able to tie the sticks together with his belt so that now the hut looked strong. It was impossible to sleep on the bare ground, so he covered it with his expensive clothes, which was wasteful, but he had no choice. He spent another day until the morning fiddling with various little things, but now the hut was ready. And he got an achievement. Building a house gave him the skill of a novice craftsman. The system gave them for all actions. Since Ed had lived the life of a nobleman before, he didn't know that he had a talent for working with his hands, better than magic. The skill dexterity came in handy now. Ed made an ordinary spear, putting the ceremonial blade on the shaft. It was time to get real food. After 2 days with an empty stomach and exhausting work, he should have no strength left. But hopelessness and the magical conventions of this world helped him move on, and he also wanted meat. Luckily, he managed to catch a couple of fish, and Ed began to fry them with the fire of the spell right on the river stone. The fish cooked quickly and smelled delicious. There was only a week left before Ed's training began. He just needed to keep going like this, and then he would be able to handle everything at the academy without too much difficulty, he decided. But he was so busy trying to survive that he forgot something important and turned around when he heard a shout. The heroine of the story appeared, a beautiful girl with golden hair who immediately recognized him. Of all the heroes, Ed least expected to run into her here. Princess Fiona, she was the one who expelled him from the dorm and still wanted him to leave the academy. Ed Taylor is a villain using his status. He beats up McLaurin's childhood friend, for which he gets punished. But his vengeful nature does not subside. Ed tried to forge McLaurin's entrance paper on the exam, but he was caught red-handed by the girl who came to pick up the exam papers. Fiona Elias Clole, the third princess of the Empire, she had the skill of insight and could see through lies and conspiracy. Ed tried to justify himself and denied it to the last and was shamefully exposed by Fiona's ability, for which he was subjected to disciplinary punishment and kicked out of the dormitory where everyone must have hated him. And now he met the one he should have avoided the most. Fiona sternly asked him what he was doing here. Ed began to justify himself by saying that even though he had been expelled from the dorm, he was still a student at the academy. Fiona decided to say everything directly and demanded that he leave. She could not bear to see such a scoundrel walking around the academy and promised to get him expelled. She scolded him for his disgusting behavior, and Ed's attention was focused on the food, which was already burnt, and he hadn't eaten for 3 days. The girl promised to be brief, but her flow could not be stopped, but this problem had to be solved. Princess Fiona does have the power to exclude him, Ed realized. He approached the girl to meet her and asked if she shouldn't have security with her as was required by her status. But the sun was already setting. Who would have thought that a noble princess would be alone in the forest, Ed grinned. Fiona immediately bristled and her body was covered in mana. She said that she would not be intimidated and he would regret this. Ed got down on one knee and replied that there was no question of intimidation because he wanted to thank her. Fiona unconsciously used her powers of insight and discovered that there was no lie in his words. Ed noticed her surprise. He was telling the truth and he understood the reason for it. The Taylor family is famous and influential using their status. They exploit people, experiment on them in search of eternal life. McLaurin will consider it better to destroy them. Some will be put behind bars, some will be executed. But fortunately he was expelled, even though he is now cold and hungry. It is better than death in the square. Things would be much better in the long run. Ed smiled to himself. He just needed to convince Fiona. Otherwise, he will be excluded, and most likely the game will simply end since it is dedicated specifically to the academy. There was a week left between his expulsion and the start of training, and Ed began to wonder what brought the princess here. He stood up and told her that her coming here at this time and without security meant that she was taking an assessment test. Professor Glast's assessment test to determine class. The essence of the task is to find hidden magic beads in the forest. Ed knew that the professor's test was quite tough. Of course, the princess wanted to get into the first class. Fiona took his statement with hostility. Ed has not changed at all since he tried to butter her up. She had already decided to exclude him without thinking, but Ed told her that without his help, she would not pass the test. And approaching the girl, he asked to exclude him if he was lying. He directed her to the lake, to the southeast, where there is a small island with a large tree in the middle. And there she would easily find the gift he left, Ed told her. Fiona was confused. 3 days ago, Ed was a liar and a charlatan, and she still remembered his state. However, now a completely different person appeared before her. The class placement test was completed, and Fiona and the other participants returned to the academy. Professor Glast told them to get the beads they found in the forest. The students showed him everything that was even remotely spherical in shape. And they were immediately assigned to the last class because it was very important to listen to your teacher. What was needed were not simple magic balls. Only those who found one of the 3 magic beads got into the first class. The first was Zixs, a guy with a sharp look, short hair, and eyeliner. The second place went to a red-haired beauty with the look of a sly fox. The last bead, which had the greatest energy, was found by the girl the professor pointed to. The best student in the class, he said, and looked in Fiona's direction. Ed lost weight for dinner and no longer had the strength to swing the spear. So he made a primitive fishing rod from a simple branch and a silk thread that he pulled out of his shirt. And the hook was made from the bones of the fish. The third Princess Fiona has been able to distinguish between sycophancy and substitution of concepts since childhood, which has sharpened her intuition. And it formed the ability of insight. No one was able to deceive her because Ed could only give her truthful information. But there were difficulties. The reason why Fiona would be called the Princess of Justice was her failure in the test. Failure would change her. However, if Fiona, who already has considerable influence since the beginning of her studies, gets into the first grade now, it will be impossible to predict what will happen to her next. Even if Ed manages to avoid expulsion, much of his information will be useless. He would have been finished, but of course Fiona wouldn't have done that, and Lucy Merrill became the best student. Therefore, there was a chance that the future would remain the same, because we were talking about the Princess of Justice. Insight can always reveal the truth. Ed did not lie. The pearl was where they said it was. But it was not a gift. Fiona initially hid her identity. She was embarrassed by the excessive attention to her. She wanted to prove herself. The bead would have given her a better result, but Fiona did not take it because she did not find it herself. The title of Princess of Justice was not an ability or a skill. She received it because she was always honest. Ed threw her a bait. She had to see if his words were true. Even though she could always find out, Ed really believed she would fail the test, and Fiona thought she would wipe his nose. But he didn't lie. She couldn't get into first grade, and now she couldn't do anything about him. She just promised herself to look after him. Meanwhile, the former nobleman mastered the important and useful skill of fishing. Now he lived in a place from which, in order to get to class on time, he had to run out early in the morning. Ed stopped to catch his breath when he reached the academy, but he could study at the best institution in the country, he thought, and glanced around the wide courtyard. The opening ceremony of the semester passed quickly, and the students were seated at the festive table. Of course, Ed was greeted coolly. There was a whisper among the students. They looked at him with disdain. But that was the winner's reward, and Ed enjoyed it slowly, absorbing the calories he had lost over the 10 days, taking advantage of the banquet. His goal was to finish his studies, so Ed held his own, and this did not escape the attention of the students, although his reputation was at its lowest. He had no ambitions, he just wanted to graduate, but someone still noticed him. One girl turned away from the chatter of her friends and looked in his direction. It seemed to her that he had become a completely different person. Today was Ed's first day at the academy. He was sitting in the classroom and listening to the professor. However, on the very first day, he ended up in the principal's office and barely avoided expulsion. He didn't expect Fiona to tell the principal about him. But judging by the fact that the old man was smiling like a madman, the princess didn't say anything bad to him. Yet Ed narrowly escaped the worst and had to be careful not to change the original story. In the forest, he continued to hone his vital skills and studied magic. Since he was studying at the magic faculty, the bow suited him perfectly. After he upgrades his skills and learns how to create good quality arrows, he will be able to summon a spirit or draw formulas. Although spiritual formulas were beyond his talents, Ed thought when he came out into the clearing and saw a girl with a book there. It was Jane Fayler, a second-year student, the best in her class and a talented spirit summoner. She looked up from her book and asked Ed if he was the amazing guy Marie had talked about. The girl called his name and introduced herself. She became so close, so quickly that Ed didn't even have time to notice it. Jane noticed his surprise and smiled sweetly to dispel his suspicions. And she hastened to explain that this forest belonged to Marie, a high-level spirit, and from her she had heard a lot about it. Marie is a curious spirit, so she watches everything that happens in her forest, and naturally, she knew about the uninvited guest. And then Ed got nervous. He used the forest as he wanted, chopped down trees for firewood, killed game. But Jane said not to worry about the little things. It was the natural cycle of life in the forest. Marie didn't care much about it. Ed agreed. Even a big wild wolf could have a tender heart. The girl also found this unexpected and laughed sweetly. She wanted to show him something and held out her hands, saying that she had made a contract with this charm just yesterday, as soon as she saw it. And she offered to touch it. Ed knew what a spirit contract was, but he saw that her hands were empty. Befriending Jane would require just the right moment. But Ed said he didn't know what she was talking about, and he couldn't see the spirit. He couldn't see it. Jane was surprised and a little upset by this clarification. Ed immediately made it clear that their conversation was over and turned around. He still needed to get himself some food. Only by sticking to the plot could he profit from his knowledge. Jane Fayler is a very important character. She is someone you should never get close to. He left her alone where he met her, and the girl did not take her eyes off him. But as the wolf Marie had told her, there really was an amazing guy in front of her. and it looks like he really didn't see all the spirits that were with the summoner. And she tried so hard to make friends, but instead of friendliness, she heard only monosyllabic answers. The girl buried herself in the wolf's fur out of frustration. But she still hoped to meet this mysterious guy. Although it was unknown at the moment, a blessed silence hung over the green forest. The distance from Ed's shelter to the hostel was not short, and the path wound like a snake every now and then. Ed ran out with the first rays of dawn and ran at full speed, although it was strange, but it increased his characteristics. To earn a scholarship, he studied diligently, wrote notes on a stone board with a piece of charcoal, and borrowed books from the library. On the way home, he washed his clothes, sweaty from all the exercises in the river. It looked like he would collapse, exhausted by the evening. But he also had to prepare firewood for the fire, a supply of drinking water, and dried meat for dinner, which left him with about 4 hours to sleep. But what worried him most was something else, and he asked the girl how much longer she would follow him like a ghost. She was surprised that she was noticed, and Ed replied that it would be strange not to notice someone who was so persistent. He reminded Jane that he was the worst offender in existence, and asked why she was following him. But Jane objected that others thought that of him, but not she. After all, she didn't know him yet, the girl said, and gave Ed the most sincere smile she was capable of. Then the former nobleman frowned. She really was such a character. Naive, slightly stupid in appearance, but with an independent nature. However, knowing what was in store for her in the future, it was better to simply smile back, Ed decided, because Jane is the final boss of the first act of the Academy story, and she became the only character who smiled. At Taylor, Ed again reminded himself that he was a villain, even though he didn't want to do so. Ed told her that since they were brought together by fate, would she do him a favor, and Jane happily asked how she could help. Ed's life was in chaos. His family had abandoned him, and he was in deep trouble. So he asked her to lend him some money, which made Jane turn as white as chalk, and he promised to definitely return it. Jane received a scholarship for being the best in her class, otherwise she would not have survived, as she was from a very poor family. Money was her greatest weakness, as she was born on a small farm. Jane was forced to refuse, and saying sorry, she disappeared. She fell away from him after that, but now Ed felt uneasy about it and even less inclined to meet important characters. He reminded himself again that he had to be on guard lest the story deviate. But when I came home, I was so taken aback that I even threw away my bag of supplies. Ed winced at the degree of troublemaker. His guest was even taller than Jane, the object of admiration of classmates and teachers, the owner of a rare talent, and the strongest character, Lucy Merrill. She stretched sweetly in his hut and yawned like a cat. Ed didn't know what to say and didn't understand what she needed in his mountain valley. He didn't want to change the original plot. Lucy complained about the noise. The impudent girl didn't even realize that she had occupied someone else's house. But then she added that the source of the noise was not Ed, but a huge wolf behind him. And this wolf spoke not to her, but to the owner of the hut, Lucy said. And now the she-wolf Marie asked him to save Jane one day at any cost. Ed stared at the empty space behind him. He still couldn't see the spirits, but he had no desire to quarrel with them. Of course, it was good that Lucy told him such important information, but he himself did not hear anything. He hoped that he was finished with Jane and that they would not cross paths again, but it seemed that hard times awaited him. Surprisingly, Lucy managed to fall asleep as soon as the wolf left, right in the middle of the conversation. She fell back asleep, but Ed was categorically against it. But then it dawned on him that because of her small size and ability to jump across space, Lucy was called a cat. Whether it's the top of the clock tower or the roof, she will always find a beautiful spot in the sun to fall into the arms of Morpheus. The camp was located in the thick of the forest where no one goes, a cool wind, the sound of a stream. It was an ideal place to sleep. Ed realized that it was his own fault that he had chosen the best place, which Lucy also liked. The next day he stood in the camp and wondered what to do about it. When Lucy came back again, she got here by air, using magic, and if the girl is left here, it's only a matter of time before the plot changes. Ed then began to practice making lasso traps, and now he was much better at it. But a hungry cat appeared and asked if she could take the meat. Ed forbade it, but for some reason she took it as an invitation. Then he realized that they would not find a common language because the girl had appeared for the second time, which meant that she would continue to come. Something urgently needed to be thought of, and Ed began to rummage through his memory. He had definitely read about it in various manuals. He certainly wouldn't be able to defeat Lucy, he thought, watching her shamelessly eat the bait. And he decided to go for a trick. He told her that on the way here, he saw the maid Bella, looking for her. Then Lucy quickly got ready, as if she was remembering some important and urgent matter. There was no way in the manual to defeat the invulnerable sorceress. Players usually skip the text introductions at the beginning of the game, but there was important information there. Namely, that Lucy runs away from her maid every day who looks after her like a mother. Ed smiled, one less problem to worry about. He hoped that Lucy, having been here for only 2 days, would not change the main plot in any way, but very soon he realized that he had been deceiving himself with his hopes in vain. They were to undergo joint combat training, a one-on-one mock fight, and for safety they used training weapons. And the Faculty of Magic could only use basic elemental magic, and deadly potions, rituals, and spirits were also prohibited. The order of battles is determined randomly. Each will have 1 opponent. The idea is for students to encounter a student from another class, and all the important characters will take part. Princess of Justice Fiona, Zixs of the Northern Plains, Golden Daughter of Laurel. Spirit Mage Jane, Lazy Lucy, Evil Klaus. The list is long. I can't list them all. But even so, the most important person remains the hero, the failed swordsman McLaurin. Ed was looking forward to the next fight, which was Mac's fight. He already knew the results, so he didn't really follow the fights, because the first years and the main character, Mac, would win. Ed just wanted to watch, but Jane appeared next to him and handed him a list of fights. He couldn't believe that she had joyfully run up to him after he had humiliated himself and asked for a loan. Unlike Lucy, who was like a cat, Jane was a canine. Ed said he wasn't interested. It was only when she asked him if he didn't want to know who he was going to fight that it dawned on him. In the original story, his character would have already been eliminated, so Ed took it to see who his opponent would be. And this was the beautiful and terrible Princess Fiona. Like pulling the Joker out of a deck, Ed thought. But at that moment, I heard the next participants being called into the arena. The first was Lucy Merrill. And Taylor McLaurin was supposed to be second, and Ed jumped up from his seat. Mac entered the ring and promised everyone that he would give it his all. Now Ed didn't care who he fought, he needed to keep an eye on Mac. Even though it was in a game, he played through this character many times, starting with pathetic endings and ending with real masterpieces. He had walked this journey countless times, and among the many paths, there was not a single easy one. Ed had already decided that he would improve his life, but he also wanted to root for Mac. But why didn't Lucy come out? Ed wondered when he heard her being called into the ring again. A wave of alarm swept across his face because the plot had now changed so much. Luckily, Ed noticed her tail sticking out and pulled the cat out of her hiding place. If the duel were canceled now, there would be trouble. Mac would take up a sword for the first time. It was a very important moment, Ed remembered. Lucy asked him if he had any meat because she was very hungry. And Ed shouted to the cat to fight first. Lucy, stretching, stepped into the ring. McLaurin took a stance. On the contrary, he was going to defeat the sorceress with the help of brass knuckles. Mac was the main character of this story, born to be a swordsman, who had never held a weapon in his hands before. And yet, with the first swing, it will break through Lucy's lightning magic. The spell she thought would stop the blow would be blocked. And then Lucy will be left defenseless, and Mac will be able to get closer. Out of surprise, Lucy will strike him with lightning, which is a mid-level spell, and she will do it unconsciously. But she will be disqualified for using magic of an inappropriate level, and Mac will earn honor because he will be the first to defeat Lucy. It was a legendary scene, Ed exclaimed, and he looked forward to its repetition. The referee gave the fighters the start signal and shouted the fight throughout the hall. Mac didn't have any ranged attacks, so he had to strike first. Lucy immediately hit him with powerful magic as expected. But Mac didn't block the blow, but flew into the wall, leaving the arena. Everyone watched the fight with their mouths open, and at that moment, no one made a sound. Lazy Lucy yawned tiredly. She was clearly bored because the fight did not last even a second. The students realized that trying to defeat the best student was pointless, especially since she was a magician. Mac's life has always been a series of failures and trials, poor guy, a lagging student, a mediocrity that is not worthy of pity. While the students draw conclusions from this fight, Mac is not about to give up. He picked up the training sword and used all his strength to get to his feet. This was how he was supposed to handle it. Ed believed in him, watching as the fighter rushed forward. Lucy should have used lightning now, but instead she let Mac get as close as possible. His strike was stopped by a powerful clot of mana that she gathered in front of her. And then right in front of him, the magic took shape and turned into a beast. The powerful blow sent Mac flying across the room until he got stuck in the opposite wall. Lucy Merrill used wind instead of lightning. Ed stared at the sorceress in confusion. After which, the jury of teachers unanimously awarded the victory to Lucy. Mac lost and walked away dejectedly, facing a long recovery from his wounds. This was a big problem for Ed. He understood that the guy definitely couldn't be left alone. Lucy was protected by the spirit of the wind, the wolf, Marie. Their stories were separate. Earlier, Lucy asked for jerky, but Ed rushed past her. Because the lazy cat found his camp, she met the wind spirit and her defense became stronger. But Ed didn't have time to run to the doors when the next fight was announced, and it was his turn. Fiona just appeared on his way and wanted to tell him something. But Ed passed by. All he cared about was that Mac had lost, and he should have gained confidence by picking up a sword. Fiona looked after the former nobleman who dared to ignore her so brazenly. Mac lost because Ed stayed at the academy, even though he didn't know if there was any point in it now. But he still called the hero. He shouted to the whole room that Mac's efforts would pay off. He had nothing to be embarrassed about or depressed about, because if the swordsman broke, his job would be entrusted to Ed. Ed supported Mac as best he could because a lot would happen at the academy, and the main hero would have to deal with it. The Emperor was the first person to discover her innate insight, but the skill itself was not a gift from God. Life in the imperial family is full of intrigue. Because of the darkness of this abyss, the princess had to develop such an ability to resist. That's why she could be confident in its effectiveness. Her relatives always looked at her with an ugly darkness in their eyes, but Fiona saw through them, only pretending to be stupid. Having no other choice, she always looked into the depths of people, as she did now when Ed Taylor asked her to be gentler. Fiona responded to his greeting with restraint and watched him closely. There was talk among the ranks. They thought that Ed's words were just pretense, a special form of mockery. Ed was nasty from the start, using his title to bully the weak. And when everything didn't go according to his plan, he decided to change the test results. He was always a mean person. But then, he seemed to become different, Fiona recalled, their last meeting. His cry of despair was absolutely sincere, and only Fiona could understand that. The princess told Ed that he had completely confused her and hoped that their fight would clear everything up. She gathered magic in front of her. A regular water ball flew towards Ed, but it was quite strong. He could use wind or fire magic in response, and she didn't know what he would respond with. Only by exchanging blows could one truly talk. She hoped that their dramatic fight would help her get the cunning guy out of her head. But at that moment, her projectile hit the target. The fight ended so easily that the princess was simply dumbfounded. Ed collapsed onto the stone floor of the arena without any resistance. He could see the trajectory of her balloon perfectly well, the girl exclaimed. The other students began to mock Ed, who performed worse than Mac without offering any resistance. The former nobleman bowed to her and formally stated that he had learned a lot from her. But it did not escape Fiona's notice that after her opponent entered the arena, he did not look at her even once. Ed wasn't interested in their fight from the start. It was impossible to cross paths with the princess as with the main character, so he rushed through the corridors. After all, the main character and worker of history was now much more important. Ed looked from room to room, not understanding where the swordsman could have gone. But it turned out that the princess had followed him, and he involuntarily asked her what she was doing here without an escort. But the girl screamed loudly and discontentedly at him, so Ed hastened to justify himself, saying that their duel had really taught him a lot. But this made Fiona even more angry. It didn't escape her notice that he wasn't even trying to win, but wanted to leave as quickly as possible. Fiona had a hard time managing the class as it was. The cunning merchant was only thinking about how to get her hands on everyone. The professors were pressuring her. The servants were pestering her with questions. She had enough to worry about. The girl had exploded, and he was only making things more difficult. He understood how difficult it was for her because of the accumulated stress and put his hands on her shoulders to calm her down. Ed suggested that she take a deep breath and calm down a little. She shouldn't have overexerted herself so much. After an awkward pause, she hesitantly asked him what just happened, realizing that she had given in and shown her face. So, blushing, she asked to forget everything and not tell anyone about it. Ed agreed. He had no one to talk to anyway and realized it was time to leave. The princess agreed with him. It was a bad habit to try to figure everyone out, because you can ask them directly, but Ed was only thinking about slipping away. And she decided to question him directly, whether he tried to break with the family directly because he knew about its dark side. This means that he was deliberately trying to prevent Mac from getting in so that he could be expelled. Fiona came up with a brilliant conclusion. In some ways she was right, of course. His former family really did have something to do with it. But Ed was forced to answer that he had no idea what the princess was talking about. It was information that was closed to her now. Fiona began to choke with anger again and turned red as a lobster. She couldn't be wrong, otherwise everything would lose its meaning. Why would he help someone he hated? Ed tried to make a hopeless excuse that he did it just to boost his reputation, but it was obvious he was lying. Then he assured her that he was telling the truth, which was already a special form of ridicule. The princess had no proof anyway, so he could say whatever he wanted. Once again, he drove the girl to white heat. It remained to hope that the plot would not change. She didn't burn for long. After she had spilled everything, she simply let him go. It didn't escape Fiona's notice that he had been looking at the door from the very beginning, which meant he had urgent business there. Ed thanked her and headed for the exit. This was the first time Fiona had shown herself in this way. She had been influencing the course of events from the very beginning, meeting many people and events that would have given Ed a headache. He himself was partly to blame for this because he remained where he should not have been. Before leaving, Ed nevertheless turned to her and said that his burden was incomparable with hers. Even though he was crossing the line, she looked exhausted. Even though it was important to pay attention to everything, rest was also needed, Ed said. This was not the place to worry about every little thing. Fiona had spent her entire life learning to understand others, but now, for the first time, someone understood her. Having lost a lot of time, Ed quickly caught up with Mac in the training room. If the guy gave up, they would all be in trouble. But before turning to the future swordsman, he thought about what he should say. But at that very moment, a girl appeared in his path and covered Mac with herself, telling him not to come closer. With tears in her eyes, the main character, Oelis, said that she would not let Mac be disturbed. It was hard enough for him, and he was tormenting Mac even more, she said, looking after her friend like a mother would a child. Mac stood up and remarked dismissively that Ed was still at the academy after all. But then Ed realized that the fighting spirit that never fails had returned and was sparkling in the guy's eyes. All because while their fight with the princess was going on and then the conversation, Mac's friend Ayla and his main supporter was rushing to him. She was the first to support the hero after a humiliating defeat. These were simple words but spoken with warmth. As long as Ayla was around, Mac would always get back on his feet no matter what, Ed realized. He looked again at the face of the hero with whom he had gone through so much until the very end. Ed turned around abruptly and said that he didn't need anything else. Previously, he thought that since Mac would save this world, then he just needed to take care of his own survival. So he was worried about the hero. But now I felt relieved, not because the story, which had deviated from the original, had returned to normal. And because Mac was okay, Ed didn't need anything else. He left his two friends completely bewildered. They did not understand why he was acting tough. There was no way around it, Ed thought, as he saw the flashes on the training ground. In the original story, everyone would have been in the arena when this fight took place. A fight between the cunning fox, the golden daughter of Laurel, and her terrible rival. Laurel used ice magic against a giant fire spirit. But it was unlikely that such a weak barrier could hold back the furious flames of the dragon on which the sorceress sat. Jane Fayler smiled sweetly at her rival, not a bit worried. The plot was going as usual. Ed was sure that Mac and Isla would see this fight. He told Mac to keep his eyes open because this was his future test. Laurel could barely put up her defense to somehow hold off her opponent. The fire dragon poured a stormy stream of flames at her. Jane Fayler smiled. She was about to become the final boss of the first act. After the fight, all her classmates congratulated her. She was the only one who defeated her first-year student. Everyone poured out streams of flattery and praise on her, and the girl smiled modestly in response. She noticed how her rival was carried past her. Laurel was in a deplorable state. Although Jane was considered the pride of the sophomores, this kind of thing scared her. Unlike the original, where Lucy lost, Jane became the defender of the second year's honor. She already had a lot of friends and attention, and now life would go at an even crazier pace, Ed thought. And he thought that this was for the best in his own way. He wouldn't see the girl in his camp anytime soon. It was worth contacting the main character. His head was spinning. 2 weeks had passed since the battle, and no one had looked in on him, so Ed was able to concentrate. He created a net for fish and solved the problem with food. His health improved because he pumped up his endurance, but it was too early to rest. When he came out of the bushes, he saw Jane, who shamed him for being naked, although she had just appeared when he was just swimming. They were sitting by the fire, and Ed asked her why she kept coming here, and Jane replied that it was because it made her feel like an adventurer. Today, she wanted to talk to him a little and ask his advice. Ed was surprised by this question. Why him? He answered while getting dressed. Jane told him what happened at their joint training session, because he left early. The girl was very worried that she had seriously injured her rival, although Laurel herself used a spell of a higher level which was forbidden, but Jane was too kind-hearted to leave it. She tried to forget about everything, but she still thought it was her fault, and she had overdone it. Now she was wondering whether she should apologize to her rival, and her friends were trying to convince her otherwise. Ed answered very simply, if she thought it was right, that's what she should do. Sweet and playful Jane is like a treasure to everyone, Ed thought, looking at the surprised girl. So when she feels guilty or criticizes herself, people try to convince her and encourage her. But Jane herself knew that it was good to have allies, but it would not erase the bad things she had done. That was probably why she came to him, Ed realized, and the girl said that this was what she was waiting for. She felt relieved and reached out because Ed never just took her side. Then the homeless commoner said that if he had offended her, he could not help. But Jane replied that he had simply misunderstood her. She wasn't at all offended by this guy, who was different from the one he was last year, and Jane was observant. She noticed that the last time Ed asked for money, he didn't act desperate like people in his position. It was clear that he wanted to keep his distance. The girl thanked him for encouraging her, and she wished that everyone in the world would be like him. Surprisingly, she felt comfortable with him. The next day, Ed was in a hurry to the academy as usual and was in a bad mood. The game was quite difficult. Not all the newcomers knew it. For example, you could get a bad ending if during the test you learned the secret of the fox Laurel. She sent an assassin after you. In another episode, it was possible to accidentally skip Ayla and team up with Laurel, but then Ayla would fall off a cliff to her death. If Laurel was protected from the fire spirit Tarkin that Jane summoned, Mac would simply burn up. Ed went through the various dangers and persistently tried to ignore the one that was calling him. But in the end, he was caught. Laurel didn't even think that she would be ignored like that, gritting her teeth. Of course, Ed had to do this because before him was the fourth heroine of this story, the only daughter of the tycoon Elta Crechet, and it was she who wanted to buy a couple of hours of his attention, although he knew her nickname, the Rookie Fighter, in this game. Laurel is a hidden heroine. Unlike Fiona, she was treated as a villain from the very beginning, but her true colors only emerge in the second part of the story, when players begin to realize the reality of Laurel's loneliness and suffering. And they found themselves at a crossroads between the fair Fiona and the cunning Laurel. But he couldn't give in to her tricks. If he danced to Laurel's tune, he would lose the initiative, Ed understood. He continued to ignore the girl who begged him to just listen to him and offered her help. Ed stubbornly avoided her gaze, and she stood in his way again to prevent him from leaving. Laurel noticed that he was irritated, which was not surprising considering that in his circumstances he was still continuing to study. Of course, she had heard about his ignorance and egocentrism, but now it didn't matter. The fox grinned. She asked him to listen to her proposal and showed him 3 gold ducats, which she would give as an advance. Laurel knew that he had become close to Jane lately and asked him to help him become friends with her. 3 coins was a large sum, a month's wages for a servant, but Ed merely remarked sarcastically that she made connections with money. But the girl was not embarrassed by this, and on the contrary, she put the money in his pocket. She, like no one else, understood that the more friends, the better. Laurel felt that she had to fight with Princess Fiona for influence in the academy, and that she needed to start gathering people into a team right now. Ed agreed and offered to shake hands. He looked welcoming. Laurel smiled too. She understood that for a person who had lived in abundance all his life, falling to the bottom breaks the heart. Usually this leads to the collapse of such people. They sell their families and themselves for hard cash. The desperate are the easiest to hunt, or so it should be, Laurel thought, and felt the heavy metal in her hand. It was quite interesting, the first time someone had outsmarted her in a game she had started first. Ed left with nothing. It would have been easier if he had accepted the reward. It would have solved many problems with survival. But it was scary to even imagine what kind of nightmare he would have to go through if he got stuck between Jane and the fox Laurel. Ed's refusal did not offend Laurel, and she met with Jane, aware of all the pros and cons, the benefits, the personal interest. The ideal entrepreneur will not miss any opportunity that he can reach. The girls exchanged greetings. Ed's refusal, on the contrary, spurred her irresistible desire to make Jane Failer her own. Everyone was talking about how she used forbidden magic during their fight, Laurel said. Even though a lot of time had passed since then, she was looking for an opportunity to apologize and at the same time test the best second-year student. Jane saw that her rival's wounds had not yet healed, and Laurel told her not to worry about it. She hoped to manipulate the feeling of guilt. It should have been a simple matter, but Jane suddenly asked about their conversation with Ed. Jane smiled sweetly and showed that she is not so simple. Usually when it comes to personal matters, she asks them to restrain themselves. "But what can you do if spirits like to communicate?" said Jane, and her devoted friends appeared nearby. It turned out that with their help, Jane learned most of the conversation with Ed. Jane was touched by her desire to invest gold in their friendship. But Laurel said that she herself should understand that sincerity cannot be bought with money. Ed's behavior evoked more feelings in this case. As if hearing herself, Jane became embarrassed. She was not used to such conversations and attributed it to the fact that she was communicating with the younger one for the first time. At this, the girl proudly went to her room, leaving Laurel alone to reconsider her views about her. Laurel had previously thought that Jane was like a fairy tale heroine and ignored the real world, but now it was clear that this was definitely not the case. Finally, Jane turned around and asked for forgiveness and expressed her hope that Laurel would be stronger by the time they met again. Laurel realized that the girl knew the dark side of the world, but she had not lost her cheerfulness. It was hard. She sighed. Jane pressed herself against the door. It was not easy for her either. It was great that only good was expected of her, but it took a lot of energy. Lucy stared at the clothesline with Ed's laundry on it and wrinkled her nose. Unable to stand the smell, she rocketed into the sky, causing the things to fly into the dust and dirt, and Ed had only hung them up. But he heard footsteps and understood the reason for the lazy cat's hasty escape. The headmaid of the best dormitory in Sylvania, Bella. She was the one who threw Ed out of it last time, and now she came to visit. Ed tried to justify himself, but Bella already knew that he lived here. Jane told her a lot about him. But she hadn't realized that things were like this, Bella said, looking around his home with disdain. She told Ed that this was a good chance for him, but he ignored her words. After all, his gaze was directed in a completely different direction. The dormitory maids are an elite group of women who perform all types of housework to perfection, including cooking for students, which means that this basket may contain excellent ingredients that she collected in the forest. This kind of information is usually not available from books, so Ed tried to remember if there were any events in which Bella influenced the main plot. Bella told him that he could speak without formality, just as arrogantly as she had done before when she lived in the dorms. But Ed, on the contrary, said that she deserved to be treated well. She had no influence on the main plot, and he wanted to know the contents of her basket. So he heard Bella's story about useful and edible herbs, berries, and mushrooms. Ed improved his fishing net and hunting skills, so he had plenty of meat and fish. The hunger problem was almost solved. He used the cup to heat water using magic and wood. Until now, Ed had only mastered 2 basic spells, but he used them so often that he had reached level 10 of mastery. Using the herbs Bella had collected, he brewed a delicious tea that increased his stamina, which helped him in training and work. The sun hadn't set yet, and after everything that had happened to him, Ed had to admit that it was kind of funny. Until the moment when a star flashed in the sky, and then an asteroid fell to the ground, raising a cloud of dust. The shockwave sent Ed tumbling backwards, but fortunately he survived. True, now his precious camp was completely destroyed. In the middle of a rather large crater sat lazy Lucy, the main culprit of this mess. The girl was worried that she almost died, but Ed grumbled in response because she was the best sorceress in the world. But Lucy was trembling with fear because she was being chased by a nightmare in the form of the maid Bella, although for Ed, she was the sweetest person. Lucy overslept for another class, but for some reason Bella was in a bad mood, and her fist clenched tighter than usual. Everything happened so quickly and suddenly that Lucy simply teleported to this place. She was so scared by the pain from the blow that she reacted faster than she thought. Ed was furious. Bella had caused him problems after all. The lazy cat brazenly asked for some dried meat, but Ed hit her on the head because the girl had ruined everything with her visit. The homeless commoner himself was surprised that his fist reached its target, since Lucy usually defended herself with magic. But it turned out that the cat had used up all her magic and was now nothing more than a defenseless kitten. She was completely at the mercy of the owner of the destroyed house, who immediately returned the favor and added another flick to Bella, who was taking care of her. And so, he decided that he needed a stronger house, and he would build the next one out of wood. Ed was lucky that he could get any knowledge from the books in the library. He learned a lot. All that remained was to learn how to sand wood and create a roof. But at that moment, the librarian girl came up to him and said that they were closing. Ed was so focused that he didn't notice. Aaliyah Iceland said it was okay because her motivation only grew when she saw his hard work. Looking at her, Ed realized that the girl was literally begging him to tell him her name. So he introduced himself and got the expected reaction close to shock. On her face, bad reputation does not go away quickly. But Aaliyah said he was completely different from how he was described. He read many books that she couldn't even understand and worked hard, and Aaliyah decided that rumors should not be trusted. Now she was convinced that he was an honest man like a hero. She promised to root for him, and Ed thanked her modestly. He was in no hurry to get close to others. Aaliyah wished him a good journey and hurried back to the dorm. When the floor beneath their feet began to shake and a loud crash was heard, The earthquake shifted the heavy cabinet, and it began to fall on the fragile girl, spitting out books. A huge magic circle appeared above the academy, and a stream of light hit the ground. A disaster struck, and thanks to Mac and the efforts of his friends, the students gathered in a temporary camp for protection. 2 hours had passed since the beginning of the unprecedented catastrophe, something they had only seen in books on spirit magic. The rune of summoning the high-ranking spirit of darkness, Glaskin, floated in the sky. After assessing everything, Fiona realized that things were bad. In the entire academy, there was only one student capable of summoning such a number of spirits, and it's very likely that she's their enemy now. She's enraged by the spirit of darkness, the best second-year student, Jane Failer. The barrier behind which the students hid would not last long, and when the demon appeared, the losses would only increase, so Max suggested leaving the camp. The captain of the Imperial Guard hoped that the teachers and the headmaster would take care of the demon, but Laurel insisted that it was better to deal with it themselves. The director was not at the academy, and if they joined forces, they could defeat even a high-ranking spirit. Klaus Nord immediately refused, although he was a first-year student at the military faculty. Laurel was confident that they could easily defeat the medium spirits and the boss, and then make their way into the building and catch the possessed Jane. But these were not all their enemies. Inside, they were awaited by the spirit of fire Tarkin and the spirit of darkness Belosfer. Such an operation bordered on suicide, so Klaus refused in horror. Laurel was surprised that Jane was able to summon everyone, even though she was the best in her second year, and she was also summoning the demon Glaskin. Isla assumed that this was all Belosfer's interference, and Jane was hardly average. The spirits of darkness are the enemies of summoners who would not have the strength to control them. Demons can take control of such a magician and convert him. Now Jane was the most gifted and outstanding summoner in the academy and was under the power of Belosfer. But for now, it was important to decide what to do next, and only one person could do it, Zixs told everyone. He turned to Princess Fiona as the most noble person now and asked what they should do. At the moment when everyone was waiting for her decision, she remembered the words of one guy. Ed spoke as if he knew what was coming for her, as if he knew what was coming for her about how no matter what burden he was carrying, hers was heavier, and yet she needed to relax. Fiona sighed and said that they would leave in an hour, but in a small group with her at the head, her guard, and the best students from each class. Only those who have proven their abilities will go. She told them to prepare and get ready, and took all the responsibility upon herself. Later, she was informed about how things were going with other students outside their temporary camp. Audrey's Hall and the potion archives were under attack, the student said, and for some reason fell to his knee, so there was no point in expecting help from those places. Fiona realized that there was simply no one else who could prevent the worst from happening. In addition, another girl reported that she saw students in the library when she ran past. She called them Elia. Hearing him, Zixs grabbed her by the shoulders and began to shake her, asking if she was mistaken, but the girl was confident in her words. Zixs let her go and immediately headed to the library. He had to save the fragile girl who would not have coped without him. Laurel and Fiona stopped him and made their arguments in turn. Jane was the main target, and Aaliyah was still a sophomore. They suggested that he rely on that student, and Zixs thought about it. Fiona asked the girl who was with Aaliyah, but she delayed answering. Zixs noticed that she was hesitating and began shaking her again, asking what she was hiding. Under such pressure, she named Ed Taylor, and Zixs instantly went off the rails. The girl began to tearfully ask for forgiveness. Ed sat until closing time, and she left early, leaving him with Elia. Everyone knew what kind of person Ed was, but Elia insisted that she didn't care about the rumors about him. The other students were shocked by what they heard. Ed was stuck in the library with a fragile girl. Fiona belatedly realized that she could no longer hold Zixs back. She still tried to block his path by spreading her arms out to the sides. But even so, Fiona suggested trusting Ed, which left everyone shocked. Seeing their expressions, she belatedly realized how stupid she had said something. Zixs left them before she could think of anything else to say. Dark spirits blocked his path, but Zixs didn't care. He cut them all down and rushed forward, paying no attention to them. He promised himself that he would grind Ed into dust if even one hair fell from Aaliyah. The expression from rags to riches doesn't even come close to describing the life path of Zixs, nicknamed Grass Spear. Zixs was an excellent hunter, able to track down prey and hide well in thick grass. The steppes in the north are wild lands where the voice of the Empire has never reached, a world where it is easy to lose your head every day. Zixs was born into a family of nomads who roamed these lands, and before he came of age, he was cast out of the clan without knowing why. He learned to behead deer before he could read, and he mastered skinning corpses before he could write. Needless to say, he lived like a beast, a child of barbarians who maintained his isolation even while living with the people of the Empire. One day, he met a girl who wanted to be friends with him. The little girl wasn't afraid of him at all, and there was no prejudice on her face, so he didn't even notice how he introduced himself to her. With a sweet smile on her face, she compared him to a wolf that walks on two legs, and at that moment, he saw his life from the outside. A life of eternal wandering across the vast northern wastelands, eating carrion on the side of the road, sleeping under the moon. This is how a wolf cub lived, abandoned by its pack. He was so lonely. On the day they met, he felt lonely. Aaliyah and her father accepted Zixs into their home. In his quest to fit into civilized society, he almost forgot his wild life. The wolf cub became a human, and Aaliyah was always by his side on this journey. And now he was ready to become a beast again. The scoundrel had cheated on the test, insulted the princess, beat up a first-year student, and now it was even scary to think about it. What could he do with the small and fragile Aaliyah, thought Zixs, and rushed down the corridor. He found Ed at the entrance to the library hall and shouted at him. Zixs grabbed Ed and began to interrogate him about why he was there, where Aaliyah was, and what he did to her. Ed told him the exact location where he hid the girl, and the mad barbarian immediately abandoned him. She lay alone between the bookcases covered with a red jacket. The girl was fine and just sleeping, so Zixs sighed with relief and thanked fate. And then he saw that heavy bookcases, which one man could hardly lift, were arranged in a circle protecting Aaliyah. The curtains were drawn so that no one could see them from the outside, and there was a note on the board warning them to stay put and not to panic. It all had to be over before sunset. If she didn't show up and was careful, she could survive this, Zixs realized. There was blood on the jacket that covered the girl, but it wasn't hers. Zixs realized that Ed had kept the girl safe, despite the fact that he himself was wounded. Now he was sitting under the statue, although he could have run away long ago and left the girl. That same Ed Taylor, about whom no one will say a good word, but who knew why he needed it. 3 hours ago, Ed was close to being seriously hurt, but the results of his training paid off and he was able to save Aaliyah. The plot moved faster than expected, and from the summoning rune he understood that the confrontation with Glaskin would soon begin. Ed pulled the curtains. He was sure that Mac could handle it, and he shouldn't even look at the main characters, because there was no way to allow the course of events to change. But even so, he decided not to sit idly by, because a swarm of low-ranking spirits would soon arrive. He had to close the doors and build a shelter. Now he could eat jerky and search for useful information all night, he thought. What makes Jane's strength special is that she has the skill of understanding the spirit and connecting with the spirit. These characteristics grow through contracts. Since meeting spirits was her area of expertise, for him, who had never even seen them, promotion was close to impossible. However, Jane killed materialized spirits, so he could too. It was an incredibly lucky coincidence. Ed wished himself a bon appetit and summoned a wind slash. The growth rate was simply insane. For spirits, the understanding of the spirit increased a little more, and he would be able to conclude a contract with one of them. But Ed had already pushed himself to the limit a little more, and trouble could happen. He was still sitting there when Zixs returned. The barbarian couldn't ignore Ed, seeing that he was sitting here covered in bruises and resting. There was no reason to lie, so Ed replied that he was just training. Zixs thought that only a naive fool could believe that. But he realized what kind of man Ed was. Now he was in his debt, said the noble savage, and bowed to him. Zixs promised to repay this debt as soon as the time came, at any cost. Ed remembered that Aaliyah was Zix's lover, but she was not important to the plot, so he forgot about her. However, this guy's Mac's friend. He trusted him from the very beginning, and therefore he is very important. Ed noticed that Zixs had left the temporary camp when he came here, and once he was sure that Aaliyah was okay, he should return. He asked the savage to help Mac. If he did everything he said, the crisis would be resolved, although he was always a hair's breadth away from failure. But Zixs was surprised that Ed had a good opinion of Mac, although he had never even mentioned him in conversation before. It wasn't a matter of opinion, but of compatibility. Tarkin's armor could only be pierced by cutting the Mac element. Zixs thanked him for the advice, and Ed told him to hurry up so he could rest here for now. He even gave the barbarian some instructions, so everything should go as smoothly as possible. But then it dawned on him that Zix's question meant that he and Mac had not yet become friends. In a duel with Zixs, Mac suffered but studied the cut, thanks to which he broke through his magic. The savage recognized him, and they became friends. However, the last scene of the first act started a month earlier than in the original story, Ed realized. Zixs has not yet become friends with Mac. who was unable to study the element's cross-section. And now no one in their squad can harm Tarkin. Until this moment, Ed refused to understand that the plot had already gone wrong. Zixs returned to the camp and asked everyone for forgiveness for the delay and promised to pay for his misdeed. But Princess Fiona replied that even with him on the team, they would still have lost. The first attempt at assault had failed. The knight captain said that for the next attempt they needed more men, and he would go with them as soon as the pain in his leg subsided a little. Fiona told him in a trembling voice that it wasn't necessary. Even when he continued to insist, she had a heart too. Fortunately, they managed to retreat and avoid irreparable losses, but the captain was out, and Klaus was also slightly wounded. She thought about how to deal with this and said that she would try to deal with Tarkin with the forces that she had. But Ed abruptly interrupted her and said that they didn't have time for this. He showed up when they least expected him. The summoning was soon to be completed, and although he did not want to do it, he would now have to interfere with the plot. He suggested splitting into 2 teams, and Klaus couldn't resist asking him, does he think this is all a joke? But Zixs calmed his cowardly comrade and said that first, they needed to listen to Ed. The homeless commoner will tell them the details of the plan. First, we need to get around Tarkin, then deal with the demon Belosfer, who has subjugated Jane. But as they had already noticed in the fight against Tarkin, it was impossible to damage him due to his strong armor, and they did not have to fight directly. Once the first team distracts the dragon, the other team will pass by and subdue Jane by simply walking straight ahead. Laurel countered that they had never encountered anything like Tarkin even in training, and it was lucky that they were able to simply get away from him. There was a flaw in his plan. If something went wrong, both teams could get hit and they would have to deal with 2 monsters at once. Ed replied that it was good to weigh the risks when there were other options. Their main goal was to defeat Jane, then Tarkin and the other spirits would disappear on their own. Zixs said the problem is who wants to be on the decoy team and willingly take the risk. Laurel offered to choose from those who were eager to end their lives, and everyone became gloomy. Mac volunteered first, as befits a true hero, but Ed objected. A hero should definitely be on the pacification team. Mac thought that since he was a fast runner, he could distract Tarkin for a long time, but Ed said that he was wrong. They are not looking for extremes. They did not necessarily have to split equally. Klaus, Laurel, and he would be enough to go against Tarkin. Ed delighted them, and they immediately refused. The homeless guy tried to quickly convince them he knew a way to immobilize the spirit of fire, but the very idea of the battle caused Klaus to have a fit of hysteria. Fiona sighed heavily and took his side. It was all right, even if she didn't understand his intentions. As the 3rd princess of the Empire, she ordered them to split into 2 teams and led them. Ed, Klaus, and Laurel were to distract the dragon and allow the main team to move forward. Before they left, she ordered them to try to survive this battle at any cost. The students split up, and each group moved to its own position. The trio of Bait found themselves in a narrow corridor of the far pavilion. Laurel asked him worriedly how he would stall for time against the lizard, and Ed replied that she simply had to do as he said. So they definitely had to win, Ed said, and they ran straight towards the spirit of fire, who was peacefully dozing, blocking the entire corridor. Gloomy Klaus was very cowardly and unsure of himself. Despite his abilities, Ed understood. However, among the first-year students, he was the best in the combat department, and Ed gave him confidence, saying that they could handle it. Klaus believed that they really had a plan. Jane was outside the door, and they just needed to distract Tarkin. Only the determination of the Princess of Justice convinced him to come here. But since he is not alone, but fighting with friends, he will be able to overcome his fear, Klaus thought. He was blinded by a bright flash from the dragon's mouth, which was preparing to blaze with fire in their direction. Klaus turned to his comrades, suppressing a fit of panic. The battle was about to begin, and he wanted to know where to lure the dragon. But unexpectedly for himself, he realized that his friends had evaporated even before the fiery flash. And now he was left alone with this problem. Klaus felt the dragon's heavy gaze. Out of fear, he decided to pretend to be a crocodile. But the dragon didn't bite and growled terribly, and Klaus ran away in horror. Laurel took the position Ed had given her and calculated the moment of impact. He told her to leave after they brought Klaus. That was the end of their role. The sly fox grinned. She realized that Ed wanted to sacrifice the guy. The idea was not bad, but afterwards he would not avoid criticism. But Ed countered that Klaus was not a victim. Despite the guy's appearance, he was the best student and very nimble. Moreover, the fox itself will be given a more important role. She will have to guard the passage for the suppression group and will deal critical damage to Tarkin. Laurel chuckled. She shouldn't have jumped to conclusions based on rumors and summoned multiple magic circles. Ed told her that everyone was feeling nervous and hesitant right now, but she was holding up well. She just needed to blow up the passage, which the girl did with great pleasure. When the dust settled and the debris from the walls fell, a passage opened up. The first team appeared in the hole that had formed and asked her in surprise what she was doing. But Laurel only told them to pass on and not to linger. During a mock battle, she blew up the ceiling of the training ground, forbidden by mid-level magic. That's why Ed entrusted this matter to her. It was truly amazing prudence. The first team passed through the passage without any problems. All that remains is to deal with Tarkin, from whom Klaus was running away and ran away to kill them after everything. Even if their plan worked and the first team got through, they still needed to distract the dragon so it wouldn't follow. If they went against him, they had no other choice, Laurel thought, as Klaus screamed as if he was being cut. Ed then reassured them that they wouldn't be able to escape anyway. The only way out was to detain him. Because of the armor, their attacks are useless, and besides, they lost once, Laurel countered. Ed showed her the pouch and said that they were using a secret weapon against Tarkin, and told her to calm down and save mana. Of course, Laurel was right. Without cutting the element, Tarkin cannot be defeated. She summoned a huge wall of ice to give them some shelter, but the armored and evil dragon easily pierced it with his head. Ed kicked down the doors leading to the roof. He was in a hurry. They needed a lot of firepower, and fortunately she was dozing, where she always did, despite all the surrounding commotion. Ed picked her up with one hand. The lazy cat had no intention of waking up, and they had little time. She was there because Ed's camp was destroyed, so the cat climbed onto the roof where she slept, so she was absent from the plot. Jane was in bad shape, which angered Bella, so Lucy used teleportation and ran away, using up all her magic. In this way, the game would temporarily disable an overly powerful character. The cat smelled the dried meat and immediately woke up. Delicious pieces appeared from the bag. Ed had no time for foreplay, so he simply shoved the entire contents into the sorceress's mouth. And he took proper aim in the direction of the fire dragon. Ed thought about the distance. He had thrown grenades a lot in the army, so there shouldn't be any problems, so he threw the cat down. The timing was perfect. A few more moments, and his partners would have been reduced to 2 piles of ashes. Lucy screamed with her mouth full about his cruelty, but she didn't spit out the meat. A flash of hundreds of lightning bolts filled everything with light brighter than the sun. Laurel barely managed to put up a protective sphere and protect herself and Klaus from the shock wave. The power was so great that the clap almost blew Ed off the roof. In a sense, this was the most important moment. Tarkin is a powerful dragon whose armor could only be pierced by such a blow. Now they could at least cause him some damage and get invaluable experience points when he died. Since he had already been through so much, Ed wanted to take back what was his and deliver the final blow. Jane remembered her mother's hugs, always telling her how proud she was of her. Her friends were proud of their friendship with her. She was their hope for the second year, who was a diligent student and showed herself well in training battles. She was constantly surrounded by people who placed their hope in her. After some time, the first team reached the goal and burst into the training hall. Jane forced a smile to greet her friends as usual, but it was forced because the girl was in chains. Behind her stood the puppeteer, pulling the strings to force Jane to obey. The demon spread his wings, holding Jane in front of him and rising higher. Ed heard that the first team had begun the suppression and believed that they would succeed. Luckily, he also arrived in time before the dragon burned his friends. He asked where Lucy was and heard from Laurel that she was hiding somewhere. She must have run out of strength. But it didn't matter. It meant they would finish off Tarkin themselves, but Laurel was also tired after 2 powerful throws at the dragon. Ed said that he needed to cut his throat. Her magic wasn't very good for that, so he volunteered. The swordsman Klaus was the best fit for this role, but he could hardly do anything now. That's why Ed said he'd take responsibility. That's why she just needed to immobilize the monster. Ed trusted her with his life, and Laurel was surprised that he would say such words when in fact he was becoming the scapegoat. The homeless commoner objected that the value of human life was high, so it was his investment. Laurel liked these words. She liked it more than when Fiona acted like a ruler just because of blood. Now she was ready. Klaus finally ran out of breath and collapsed to the ground when they started. All this time he had been distracting the dragon. They were both at a loss with Klaus, but Ed understood why he was scared to death. Despite this, he rushed straight into the dragon's mouth. Ed tried to get as close as possible so as not to miss. Klaus was dumbfounded and could not rise from horror when he saw the demon's huge paw in the sky. Glaskin's right hand had already appeared in the rift, meaning Mac's group had moved on to the final phase. Everything was going according to plan, but the timing was unfortunate because it could distract Laurel, on whom his life depended. But fortunately, as soon as Ed saw the gaping mouth, the dragon was hit by a blast of ice fired by the fox. Even during the severe shock, having fully recovered from her wounds, Laurel's hand did not tremble. The same thing happened to Ed. He was at the perfect striking distance. He had used this spell thousands of times. Finding himself under the dragon's paws, he slashed at the exposed neck, cutting it off with a windy slash. The spirit of fire immediately began to disintegrate into many fragments. Ed received a reward for killing him. Now he could make contracts with spirits. Meanwhile, Mac was doing the main work and jumped straight to the paw of the huge demon. He made a lot of cuts, and when the paw exploded, he began to fall. He was clearly the main character. Even his hair changed color to white. The distraction squad watched the incredible rain of sparks that fell from the demon. It was all over. Dawn came, and they settled down under a tree, and Laurel said that she had met many who said they were risking their lives, but they all turned out to be cowards. She asked Ed what was wrong because they had gone through a deadly crisis together, and he was so calm. Now she could introduce herself to him formally again and extended her hand as a comrade. Ed accepted her handshake without a second thought. After all, they had fought together, but found 3 gold ducats in his palm. The cunning fox declared that since she had won this time, he owed her and would not get out of it again. Smiling, she told him that they would see each other again, which Ed definitely didn't want. Mac came up to them. He was upset with Ed, and he had to understand why. His swordsman form showed up, just like in the game during the fight. Mac stood frozen in front of Ed as if gathering his courage. To say that duty is duty, and thanked Ed for helping them so much. Klaus was indignant and shouted that there was no point in showing respect to such a person, because of his meanness, he almost died. But 3 people looked at him at once and told him to shut up immediately. Fiona also noted that he had done a good job and promised to recommend him to the student council, but Ed said that this was not necessary. He said that Lucy had made the biggest contribution and that Balasphere and Glaskana had been defeated by Mac, so she should have paid attention to them. Elvira chuckled. She noticed that he was trying to refuse the achievements and thought that he was embarrassed. Ed simply kept his distance from them and watched the spontaneous altercation where Zixs demanded that they show respect to their elders. But looking at this company, he felt warmth, because he had lived with them for so long, even before he met them. He had been watching them for so long and solving their problems. Mac became stronger with each training session, and Alla kept up. Fiona has accepted her destiny to become a ruler and is gradually growing up. Zixs found his place in civilization and became a noble savage. Klaus is gaining confidence. Elvira has realized that life is not all fun and games. Laurel, who had been swimming in money all her life, reconsidered her principles. Each of them is a main character who has his own important role, and at the end, they will receive a trophy called Success. Knowing this, Ed turned away from them. He left so quickly that no one noticed. He entered a place where it was impossible to get to according to the plot, clearing away the rubble. The training room had been destroyed by the battle, and Ed walked towards a familiar locker that was undamaged. This scene came at the end of the story, a spare podium where the lazy cat usually slept. To highlight the success of the main characters, someone had to stay behind the scenes. He opened the door and she smiled. While he was still at the tree, he asked Laurel why Jane became possessed, but the fox did not know. One day, quite by accident, a fox entered her room. Every item there was a beautiful symbol of the sincerity and gratitude shown to her. There was not even room left for books on the huge table. The stickers above the table were weighing heavily on her. The solution was simple: take it all off and shove it in the corner of the room. But the pressure only grew. She was simply unable to do so. She was obsessed with the duty to honor all signs of attention. There is no need to explain how reckless this was. Balasphere took advantage of the darkness in her heart, and Jane went mad. It all happened a month earlier because the laurels of the winner went to Jane and not to Mac, who lost to Lucy dryly. The reason for Mac's defeat was that Lucy went into the forest and made a protection contract with a she-wolf, and she went there because she found the perfect place that he built there. In the end, all the threads led to Ed. The character who was supposed to leave the academy set off a long chain of events. Jane scratched her head in embarrassment. She said that she understood Lucy now, but she didn't think that they would find her so quickly, although the others forgot about her. Jane hid there because she thought they would immediately start looking for her because of the damage to the academy. The girl was ready to burst into tears. Ed remembered the words of the she-wolf, whom he could not see. She asked him once to save Jane. Marie did not want her ward to end up in such a situation. But this was impossible because Ed alone knows the future. The she-wolf understood that everyone was putting pressure on Jane and only he kept his distance. But in the end, Jane failed. She tried to make a contract with a high-ranking spirit, but became a victim of the darkness that destroyed the faculty. Every day she studied until late, always responded with sincerity to all kind words, and tried to live up to their expectations. She had done well so far, but oddly enough, the failure hadn't made her any worse, Ed thought. He didn't know how much he could help her now, and he simply said that she tried hard. with a smile on his face. The proud protagonist walked onto the stage and applause broke out. Behind the stage it remained dark and quiet. The villain of the first act retreated into the shadows, giving way to the main character. Ed had watched the end of the first act many times, but only now could he see them, the spirits that had gathered to support her. And only now did he feel that he had completely completed the first act. Due to the leveling up of his connection with the spirits, low-ranking spirits showed interest in him. And even the high-ranking spirit Marie was extremely interested in him. 10 days have passed since the conclusion of the disciplinary committee trial. Jane has admitted her mistakes, and she declared that she would accept the punishment, but during the very first meeting, her friends and professors expressed their enormous support for her. At the second meeting, Fiona dropped all accusations against Jane and confirmed that she was being controlled by Belosfer. Laurel took up the issue of restoring the school. The merchant college fully covered the damages without demanding anything in return. However, a clause was added to the contract to have customs duties on educational supplies for the academy. As a result, rewards for top students were withdrawn. A ban on visiting the training hall was imposed, and Jane's expulsion was rejected. It felt like they had finished filming a touching coming-of-age drama, and everyone was happy about it. Her friends continued to whisper behind her back, expressing their concern about her condition. They thought she blamed herself. In this case, they decided to make every effort to lift her spirits. And what could be better than sweet rolls and cakes with tea when you are depressed? The girls agreed not to bring up the topic of what had happened, not to disturb Jane, and to act as if nothing had happened. But Jane suddenly asked them if there was a difference between being in love and being in love, and thoughtfully twirled a strand of her hair. The girls stared at her in bewilderment and asked why such a request. Jane replied that her friend was interested. This friend had a dream in which she was weaving a wreath of herbs in a clearing, and a handsome prince appeared on a white horse who called her by name. The girl placed this wreath on his head because she wove it for him. This dream kept coming back to her, or rather to her friend, Jane corrected herself. But looking at her, the girls immediately remembered that Jane was on a 10-day probationary period and could not see anyone. But Jane continued and said that she constantly remembered the man's face, and one of her friends, unable to withstand such pressure, hastily retreated. The remaining girl thought about how to explain everything so as not to hurt her friend who had a tender heart. Otherwise, everyone at the academy will find out about Jane Filer's love story. And she said that Jane should take it easier. Love and hate are rather mysterious things, she added. It's better to be honest with your emotions, of course only with close friends, Clara said, and Jane agreed with her. So Clara told her to be careful about touching on such topics, otherwise it would reflect badly on her reputation, and Jane got it. She thanked her friend for the good advice. She needed to return to the hostel, and Clara decided to think everything over. Clara hit her forehead on the table, barely coping with the crisis of her love-struck friend. Ed had been saving up money until now, but thanks to Fiona's petition, he was exempted from paying for the next semester. And with the gold he had, he bought tools and happily walked home with the box. On the way to his temporary permanent camp, he ran into Jane, who was walking in her thoughts. Ed had avoided her before, but now that the first act was over, where she was the main character, there was no need. He greeted the girl, congratulating her on the end of her probationary period. Now it was time to make the first move. But Jane's reaction surprised him. She shuddered as if scalded and hid behind a tree. Jane collected her thoughts and remembered Clara's words to be honest with her feelings. But she still didn't have enough determination. The level of difficulty was beyond her strength, so the girl quickly rushed away. Ed was surprised that he had even embarrassed kind Jane. In some ways, it was an amazing skill. But he had many other things to do, for it was time to build a forester's hut. On the first day, he chose a spacious, unremarkable area in the shade and peacefully set to work. Then he collected and dried the wood. The wind blade helped a lot with this. On the 6th day, he received his report card. The grades in theory and practice were higher than last semester. That was good, but Jane continued to avoid him and did not hide it. Her friends Clara and Anise looked at Ed as if he shouldn't be seen by Jane, but he didn't plan to. Ed finished collecting the logs, they were properly dried, and his wind blade had developed into an everyday tool. On the 20th day, the holidays began, and Ed began to assemble the house on the foundation. When he went to check the trap, he found a lazy cat instead of prey. Jerky as bait was a bad idea, Ed realized. The head maid, Bella, brought some greens and mushrooms and asked how he was doing with Jane. In response to his words that Jane most likely hated him and therefore avoided him, Bella shook her head. On the 30th day, the wind caused the frame to collapse like a piece of card, and Ed realized that there were not enough stiffeners and supports in the center. He was in a bad mood, and in the bakery he bumped into Jane again, but she ran away as soon as their eyes met. 37 days passed, and Zixs came to his aid. He told him that he had become friends with Mac. Everything returned to the original. Together they boarded up the entire roof, leaving room for the chimney. 45 days later, he sat down on the wooden floor of his home, feeling tired but also relieved. Bare walls, no furniture, a hut made of only rough logs, but there was a roof over my head, no insects biting me. Ed's building skills had improved, and making such a log structure was no easy task. But now he had a home, his first real home with a roof. Ed leaned his back against the wall and closed his eyes. He didn't notice that he had his first guest. Jane clenched her fists. This time she was determined. Ed was thinking about what else he wanted to build. And when he left the house, he bumped into Lucy's legs and told her that this was no place to sleep. When he saw Jane come out from behind the tree and greet him, Ed asked her how she ended up there, and the girl became embarrassed. Bella told her that she saw something amazing in the forest. Jane immediately realized that they were talking about the cabin. She had also seen Ed's new house when she was walking in the forest. Although Ed told Bella that he was building the house himself, it turned out to be much more impressive than she expected, so the maid appreciated his talent. She also wanted to look in there and check if the house was stable, Bella whispered conspiratorially. Of course, she is interested in this as a completely ordinary person. Anyone who saw such a house would want to know what it is like inside. It was perfectly natural and normal, Bella said, and Jane's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. Embarrassed, she nervously explained that she was just passing by, and when she saw the house, she wanted to take a look. It was completely natural, she blurted out. The house was excellent, Jane praised, and Ed replied that he had just recently finished it. The spirits must have told her. Jane realized she had been caught red-handed and said she only knew a little. In fact, the spirits were much more involved in the observation process, telling her everything. They talked in unison about how he had become stronger, what muscles he had developed, because they were fighting for the attention of the mistress. Jane lied that they didn't talk much, and she didn't really listen to them, although she herself received a daily report. She didn't even know where his house was and stumbled upon it completely by accident. Ed understood what she wanted and offered to look at his simple home. Pleased as 40 cats, Jane agreed and accepted the invitation. In the evening, they sat by the fire and drank herbal tea. Jane was worried that she owed everyone, Fiona and the others, and did not know how to pay now. Ed replied briefly that if she didn't know, then she didn't need to. Debts don't have to be repaid on principle, he said. And Jane was surprised. The thought had never occurred to her. Of course, she was such a person because that incident happened because of the burden of hopes that others placed on her. Even though she received help with her tuition fees, or rather investment, she decided to move to another, much more modest dormitory. All to reduce her debt. In Ophelia, 1 room per person. In Dex, 1 for 8, where she will be under the supervision of others all the time. For her, it was like being in prison, but even that didn't solve her problems, and Jane certainly wouldn't get out of the vicious circle. Ed suggested that she come here if she wanted to be alone. He didn't mind. Jane agreed and told him that if it was difficult and he couldn't cope alone, he could definitely share with her. And then she promised with all her might to help him. And her smile warmed the cool evening. Ed thought about it. Before this, he simply hadn't had time to really observe his condition. The second semester would soon begin. But for now, he could enjoy this lull. Because the second act won't be easy, it's like a cold autumn rain. The Sealed Grimoire of the Sage, a small tattered book in which the great sage Silvani made notes. It will cause a storm in the academy because it describes the magic of aspects that can influence the principles of nature. Laurel looked with satisfaction at the exhibit, which smelled of money. After thinking, Ed replied that something like that wouldn't happen to him. All the difficulties would fall on Mac's shoulders, who would have a hellishly hard time. The second act in The Failed Swordsman began with the capture of Oelis's dormitory. The top students from Oelis are practically guaranteed a decent life. They have the benefit of benefits, free time, and servants. It was precisely on this basis that the problem arose. A downpour began in the Valor area at a time when everyone was returning from vacation. The academy provided ships and carriages. Only those who lived in Ophelia, if they did not make it in time, they were entitled to a discount on rest. The residents of decks below, in turn, returned on foot in the rain to avoid penalty points. The accumulated discontent finally burst out in front of Oelis's dormitory. Of course, all this was planned by the hands of one cunning fox. She had entered into an agreement in advance with a representative of the ignoble students, who was only concerned with how to annoy Ophelia. The discontent had already reached the boiling point. They just needed a pretext for it to explode, and villains skillfully gave it to them. Ophelia's headmaid and some of the Academy's administration were already under Laurel's influence and were ready to support her proposal to change the conditions. In such a situation, the Academy did not have to make concessions. It was enough to simply take it into consideration in order to calm the students' anger. But the conflict flared up even more. Oelis was decorated with works of art, walls with stucco, carpets, furniture. Everything was made to order. Therefore, the instigators of the rebellion wanted to cause as much damage to the dormitory as possible, which would hit the Academy's finances, which were already in a leaky state. At this time, negotiations were being held to sell the grimoire, which was like the heart of the Academy, but in difficult times, people were willing to part with it. Of course, this gave the Laurel Trade Federation an advantage in trading. There was not a ray of sunshine in the gloomy sky. It reminded Laurel of the sky she had seen in the slums when she had stood in the cold streams of rain in rags. Laurel couldn't stop making fun of herself for feeling relieved. There was a lot of light in this incredibly romantic land, and the picture of her living in pitch darkness covered in dirt was more realistic for her. And the conspiracy plan on her desk is proof of that. It is the work of a man in whose life there was not a drop of sincerity. There were always only lies and suspicions where desperate attempts to survive turned her into who she is. But the essence of her cunning nature has remained the same, so she desperately seeks out others like herself, even in Sylvania, where there are plenty of honest people. But even here, there was someone who was familiar with the vile life of a garbage rat covered in dirt. The endless search for others like yourself never ends. Despite the fading hope in your heart, you cannot change your nature. To break through the miserable reality, Laurel was a dark screen that hides everything behind the scenes. The players called her the Black Veil. The cries of the crowd could be heard above the drumbeat of the rain. They could no longer tolerate inequality and demanded change. In the original, the Oelis capture incident was a story of how the protagonist stopped the angry students who were egged on by Laurel. From the first to the fifth floor in Oelis, there were mid-bosses that hinder the main character and help the rebels. The middle boss of the first floor is a bait bag. He once made fun of Mac, calling him a loser. But he got a scolding from his friends, after which he harbored a grudge and was bribed by Laurel. His role was to defeat the maid on the first floor. Then open Oelis' door and let the angry rebels inside. They rushed into the room completely confident in the legitimacy of their actions and in a fair retribution. When the rebels entered, the role of the first intermediate boss did not end. In the future, he must detain the main character. The spectacled villain immediately realized that Laurel had bribed him. Everything was exactly like that. He played this role from the very beginning. He was assigned to check the first floor and stand guard. Ed took off his raincoat and showed his face. Cold drops immediately hit the back of his collar. His face matched the weather, for from the very beginning of the second act, he was once again drawn into the story. 2 days ago, Ed was hunting in the forest with a bow. Unfortunately, he had no talent for combat skills. He had been using a bow for hunting for 6 months now, but his skills in handling it still left much to be desired. However, what is more important is that recently his camp has been receiving frequent guests. He was constantly bumping into someone who was just running past. The number of people who knew that he lived in the northern forest seemed to have grown exponentially. One way or another, among the frequent guests, 3 should be especially singled out. Guest A possessed a rare talent for magic, and her visits during the week were spontaneous. Lucy demanded that a back entrance be made and at the same time a chimney. But she was shown the door like an annoying cat so as not to interfere with work. However, this did not help, and she continued to shower Ed with invaluable advice on glazing the windows or making a window in the roof. For Guest B, on the contrary, his doors were always open. She came with gifts from Bella, said the best spirit summoner. This spirit mage visited him almost every day to chat or help with little things for which Ed was grateful. He was surprised at how much she knew about ways to wash clothes so that shirts were white and starched. Embarrassed by such direct praise, Jane turned away sharply. Sometimes it seemed that she was easy to understand, but sometimes she revealed previously unseen facets of her soul that he was unable to understand, Ed thought when she asked how often Lucy came here. The third guest was Guest B. She came with her personal maid. Known as the Golden Daughter or the Cunning Fox, Laurel came to him for help. The Black Veil of the second act, she was probably gathering people to capture Oelis, Ed immediately realized. This time, he was not eager to interfere and planned to ignore her. Laurel was not eager to cooperate either. But as soon as she said that the bastard Tot was out of action, Ed immediately demanded to be told everything in detail because it meant a plot glitch. Initially, Toth had a spat with Mac, intending to ridicule him and beat him up in front of everyone. But his next remark was a mistake, because he called Mac an even more pathetic little bug than Ed Taylor, for which he immediately received a punch in the face from someone he didn't expect. The noble barbarian Zixs responded to the insult thoughtfully, because he considered himself indebted to Ed for saving Elia. Whether it was because of Mac or Ed, Elvira told Laurel that she had never seen Zixs so angry. The task she proposed was simple: open the door to students, to which Ed said that there were still plenty of people for such work. But Laurel countered that even if she paid a large sum, there was no guarantee that these pawns would remain silent after everything was over. If they said too much, it would reflect badly on her reputation. And Ed realized that she had come to him because he already had a bad reputation. Laurel figured that since he had been kicked out of Oelis, he would want to get even and wipe the noses of its inhabitants at least once. Ed wasn't particularly eager, but he agreed to listen to everything since he could act in moderation. Laurel promised a round sum, 20 coins, and he accepted the offer, shook her hand. Before the story became more distorted, he had to return it to its original course. There is one day left before the riot. The capture of Oelis is a ploy by Laurel to bring down the price before the auction for the Sage's book. It is just a step in the plan. According to the plot, Laurel, having succeeded, creates an independent group, and thus enters into confrontation with Princess Fiona and her student council. The side that Mac chooses will win, and all Ed needs is to simply join the winner, because he also needs to live with a piece of bread in his bosom. While he was thinking, a wet Jane appeared on his doorstep, thinking that the rain would soon stop. The girl sympathized with Ed because he had to spend the night in the forest even in such weather, but the guy was getting more and more used to this life. She was soon to move into a smaller room, and she promised to give him the things she no longer needed, which she had no place to store anyway. Blankets, pillows, lamps, watches, and besides that, she had consumables. Throwing it away would be a waste, throwing it in the trash, too. Furniture was the property of Oelis. Ed agreed to accept her things, and the girl was delighted, promising to bring everything at the beginning of the new semester. But looking to the side, she asked him how often Lucy stood like this, and Ed replied that it happened sometimes. The power that goes beyond common sense was not given to Lucy just like that. It is the life from which she runs, justifying herself with laziness. For several years now she has been living like this, fixing her gaze on the fate prepared for her. On such rainy days, even a lazy cat thinks about the future. Ed said that Lucy was always like that when it rained, and there was no point in dwelling on it. But Jane took this to mean that he was not interested in a lazy cat. It now dawned on Ed that Jane was still in the Oelis building. If the dorm is captured, the space defense system will be activated, and all students will be locked in their rooms. Of course, if it was Jane, she would have no trouble getting out, so Ed asked her what she would be doing tomorrow at 9 o'clock. He wanted them to meet at the Rose Garden at this time. The girl's heart skipped a beat when she heard about the Rose Garden, and Ed said that he would tell the reason for his request there. He couldn't think of anything else. He wanted her to stay away during all this chaos and couldn't stand it in the rain. The girl agreed and stood up abruptly. Red with embarrassment, she quickly left his home despite the downpour. Ed knew that on the morning of the induction ceremony, the rain would stop, he would see clear skies, and the forest would be filled with the scent of autumn. The smell of mushrooms, rotten leaves, moisture, and today he was seeing off the last day of these holidays. Zixs had been training his will and self-control hard since Elia scolded him last time. He heard footsteps on the wet cobblestones and looked out the window, noticing a man in a raincoat. The man entered the building and asked the one who was looking after the first floor of the dormitory where the other maids were. With the exception of the essential staff, most were meeting in the common room where the head housekeeper had called them together, and so far everything was going smoothly. The maid led Ed down the hallway and said that she had prepared the item he had asked for. He thanked her for the bucket of oily liquid and set it aside. Now all preparations were complete. The riot and occupation of the Oelis building had begun. All the actors were in place. Students with torches filled the entire square in front of the building. They demanded equal treatment. The academy should be a kingdom of knowledge where everyone is equal. Villain led the crowd forward, constantly egging them on and shouting louder than anyone else. The students were ready to batter down the dormitory doors, but they suddenly opened. Someone kicked them open with a boot, and they rushed inside without thinking. Ed cleared his throat and gave a prepared speech about how he agreed with everything they were doing and how he wanted revenge on Oelis. Willie, like a real idiot, fell for his acting and said he regretted believing the rumors about Ed. Ed stopped all the snotty nonsense and rather pushed the intermediate character further along the plot. Simpleton Villain is the one who will take all the responsibility later. Ed even felt sorry for him. The maid he detained ran away, but there was no point in catching her. The boss she ran to report to had already been caught. Because Oelis, the head housekeeper, was acting on Laurel's orders, she was controlling the protective barriers. Activating protective magic, she locked all the residents in their rooms, which should have delayed them. Everything was going according to plan and script, Ed noted, as he checked the reliability of the magic locks. When I heard the voice, I was delighted with such a grand beginning. The Black Veil who started it all appeared on the scene and thanked Ed for the good work. She was glad she hired him. Laurel said she didn't like the rain because she was soaked to her socks, and Ed realized she had been standing outside watching everything. The cunning fox said that as soon as the teachers intervened, everything would be over, so her plan required quick action. Laurel suddenly asked him if he had ever killed a man before. Ed shuddered at the question and shook his head. Laurel didn't have that experience either, but she said she had done worse things than this because she had to survive. For the sake of survival, she trampled on other people's destinies and was the first to stab someone in the back to avoid the same fate. She always considered herself innocent, told herself that there was no choice, but all this was simple self-justification. That's how her nickname, Golden Daughter, came about, and she knew better than anyone that she deserved no sympathy. But despite this, she wanders like crazy in search of a person who will be close to her in spirit. The feeling of loneliness haunts all people. She wants to escape from it and looks for those who are also smeared in mud in order to sink to the bottom with them. But Ed replied that he would not sympathize with such a thing. She herself should be responsible for her actions. He was definitely not her salvation. There was an awkward silence, and Laurel was the first to break it, saying that she had said too much, which was not becoming of her. At this point, she stated that she would do what she had to do because time was running out. Ed sighed heavily, his work still ahead, and he sat down on a chair in the hallway. Now Laurel will talk to Oelis about plans for the future. The story will escalate when Oelis' protective magic fails, and Villain takes over the circle of protection. Thus, the representative of the commoner students, having received all the protective magic, becomes the boss of the 4th floor. This is a scenario where you need to quickly subdue Villain, who fell into unconsciousness from the mana whirlpool. From this moment, Ed just waits for Mac and his friends. If Ed stalls for a bit and loses, Mac will quickly go up to the 2nd floor, and during the fight he can get hit or even injured. But nothing can be done. It was a necessary sacrifice for the sake of the stability of the plot. A rich carriage drawn by 4 horses drove through the rose garden. Jane, who arrived early and was waiting for Ed, wondered if she could be there since an important person had arrived. Ed left her a note that he had some business to attend to but would be back soon, and Jane thought he was doing something special and blushed even more. Whoever was riding in that carriage, that girl would never leave the rose garden because she hadn't been able to sleep for the last couple of days. Although she suffered from pangs of conscience, she continued to send spirits to watch Ed and listen to their reports. Not only Lucy visited him, but also Princess Fiona, Bella, Zixs, and, in addition, the cunning fox Laurel. And the fact that most of Ed's guests were students made Jane even more nervous, so she firmly decided to wait for him. She touched the hairpin and wondered if perhaps she had chosen the persimmon flower in vain. The cosmos flower would have been more suitable. That's why the girl just decided to quickly go to the hostel and change the brooch. Mac's team stood frozen in front of the dorm, wondering if they should intervene, but Elvira's medicinal herbs were very expensive. They could wait for the teachers, but Elvira was indignant. If they did not have time to cast magic on the herbs, they would lose their value. Hyla also believed that they shouldn't go there. Elvira could take care of herself. But it wasn't the alchemist girl who was dangerous, but the headless students who could break into her laboratory and spill dangerous and expensive reagents. So instead of chatting idle, she went to the dorm and asked for help. All they had to do was get to her room on the 4th floor, and the alchemy girl promised to destroy anyone who stood in her way. But when she knocked down the doors and went inside, she found there the one who had been waiting for them for a long time. Ed Taylor himself stood in their way by the will of fate. Mac covered Ayla with his body almost instinctively and asked the homeless commoner what he was doing in this hostel. They could not hide the traces of vandalism, the furniture that was lying around haphazardly, and the fact that the only way up was blocked by one person. Elvira grinned. She couldn't have imagined this. She pointed at Ed without any respect and asked him if he wanted to stop them. As if he had become a game character, Ed said the usual phrases that they could not go any further. Elvira only became more excited. She heard from Zixs that Ed was good at magic. But in essence, these were just basic spells, and he was completely alone. If you looked at it that way, a skilled swordsman, a mage, and the best alchemist in the class had an overwhelming difference in strength. Mac reached for his sword and asked Ed what his intentions were and what was going on upstairs. He didn't really want to fight him. Ed was silent, so Mac attacked first, trying to force all the answers out of him. Then Ed threw the chair he was sitting on at him. It was all calculated. As expected, Mac reacted in time and destroyed the expensive furniture with one blow. Elvira immediately realized that Ed was using a basic spell. Since he was a mage, he was targeting Mac, who was the most dangerous opponent for him. But instead, the wind blade cut the chains that held the heavy chandelier, and it began to fall right on Mac. The swordsman barely managed to dodge this blow, using his super reflexes. There was a crash that was heard even by the students locked in their rooms, and Klaus immediately threw a tantrum. Due to the dust and the shockwave, they were temporarily disoriented. Elvira even fell from surprise. But at that very second, a wind blade almost cut off her head, taking away a lock of hair. The enemy did not play with them. To top it all off, the blade accurately cut through her bag of potions, and they scattered across the floor. Elvira realized that a difficult battle was ahead, which meant that something was brewing up above. But when the dust cleared, she didn't find Ed in front of her. The girl reached for the jar of potion that lay below. But a wave of ignition blocked her path. Ed had been aiming for her from the start. The fire streaked across the room. Everything was covered in smoke, and the girl froze in place, not knowing what to do. Ed created a battlefield where everything flowed like water, and his actions were fast and precise. Zixs didn't tell them everything because it wasn't just about high mastery of magic. He rolled up his sleeves. As an alchemist, Elvira was the core of their powers, but she had a fatal flaw. If she was deprived of magical ingredients, potions, and elixirs, she would have no fighting power. Usually students carried rings or necklaces, various pouches for alchemical tools, but Elvira considered this unnecessary. After all, she thought she was a genius, but it looks like Ed took even that into account. He broke the chandelier, took advantage of the delay, and created a wall of fire. In order to deliver a precise blow to the bag and deprive it of all its tools, the girl analyzed her opponent again, although in that case, Ed should have been aiming at the bag itself, not the belt. In front of them was just a former nobleman who didn't have any outstanding skills. But Elvira also had an ace up her sleeve. She took out a blue ball and turned it into a hare. She then added resistance to fire and magical attacks and strengthened the puppet's body, causing it to become enormous. Meanwhile, Aaliyah was preparing a spell to put out the flames. She was very nervous and was wasting time. The heat and smoke scared her, causing her thoughts to become confused and preventing her from gathering mana. To make matters worse, Ed interrupted her cast with his wind blade, which he wielded with great precision. Luckily, Mac arrived in time and shouted to his friend to get ready. He blocked Ed's blow. Isla was confident in her knowledge of magic, but her combat power was average even in her first year. Ed was aiming for Isla, so Mac had to protect her, and together they couldn't improve their position. Elvira shouted at him that if he got a little closer, he could suppress Ed's attacks, and she ordered her summoned familiar to attack. A wild rabbit with a fierce look rushed at Ed. The familiar didn't care about the wall of fire that was between them. Mac realized that he had no right to doubt. He simply had to do it. Elvira also rushed forward, covering herself with a cloak so as not to get burned. Isla saw how the alchemy girl bravely threw herself into the fire. So the crazy girl was able to get to her potions and was happy to see them as if they were her old friends. Ed grappled with her familiar, and he had to control Mac's movements and couldn't stop her. With his free hand, he tried to take aim at her. He completely ignored the bloodthirsty rabbit in front of him and stabbed Elvira with the blade. The girl kept herself in hand, even though Ed had prepared the reset spell. It had already been launched. Elvira threw the jar towards his magic and the blade cut it. The reagent prepared from chestnut flowers, mushrooms, and the magical reset reagent burst out. Its effect was to temporarily suppress the magical power and the products that were created by it, causing Ed's fire to fade. Ed pierced the bloodthirsty rabbit with his sword, but it served its purpose. Now the wizards could not use their power. Elvira's plan succeeded. Mac began to pursue the weakened wizard, who could no longer restrain him. But Ed easily turned over the pre-prepared cabinet. The oily liquid that was in the bucket spilled onto the dying fire, and the flame separated them again. By the smell of burning, they realized that it was oil. Elvira shouted at him that he was crazy, because if the fire broke out, there could be casualties. Mac returned the sword to its sheath for his elemental slice technique, which could cut through anything. He had to hurry, because the effect of the suppression potion did not last forever. But Elvira, who was watching the fight from the side, shouted at him to stop. The windows were opened to let the smoke out. Carpets that could catch fire were removed, as was everything that was easily flammable. Ed Taylor had clearly planned this, the alchemist girl realized, but Mac didn't hear her. Ed pulled out his hunting bow, which he had been hiding among the junk. He had enough time to take careful aim. Mac ran straight towards him, completely unprotected. Even though his opponent had a bow, Mac was sure he was simply blocking the arrow. But what was his surprise when Ed released the bowstring? The arrow flew towards the target, spinning around its center of gravity past Mac. straight into the defenseless Ayla, who no longer had time to either put up a defense or dodge. Ayla couldn't even use basic magic because of the block, but at the last second, she was saved by Elvira's potion. It was on the edge, the alchemist girl barely managed to save her friend, and the arrow fell next to her. She used her clawed hand, a magical tool that allowed her to attract small objects within her line of sight. But how surprised Elvira was when she saw soft cloth windings instead of a tip. The enemy succumbed to them here too. She warned Mac again that Ed definitely had something hidden away. Mac struck him with his sword, and the homeless student defended himself with his bow. But at this time, the boss of the second floor, Klaus the Grim, woke up above. Hearing the sound of him waking up, Ed breathed a sigh of relief. His work here was done. He stopped holding back Mac's power and instantly flew back to the wall. Elvira was stunned again. After all her efforts, the enemy simply gave up, so she didn't believe in such an easy victory. Mac grabbed Ed and started yelling at him. Was there a reason to go that far, he asked. Elvira was also unhappy, as if she had been playing to someone's tune throughout their entire fight. If he really wanted to stop them, he would have ambushed them by dropping the chandelier right on them. But instead he attacked them head-on, blocking their path. And in the future he fought in such a way that not a single action of his could be called stupid. As she thought, there was clearly something wrong here. Elvira realized when Ed said that it was all over. Mac threw him on the floor, and Ed said that they should hurry up because this battle was over. The friends were stunned by this news because up until this moment he had not let them pass, but now he was rushing them. Elvira asked him directly why he had given in to them, which surprised even Mac. The proud girl could not leave it like that. She felt humiliated and demanded an answer. Sometimes the gap between reality and imagination hurts with its cruelty. The young man who was supposed to wait for her in the rose garden lay bleeding on the floor. Jane did not understand what was happening and judged everything from what she saw with her own eyes. So she immediately became furious and asked them in an icy voice what they were doing. A slight sense of dissonance had struck Jane in the rose garden, but then she remembered whatever Ed did, whatever the problem. It always creates some kind of expectation that the problem is it will be resolved no matter what. And only when a decent slap flew into these self-satisfied thoughts, she began to look at these events in a new way. Even though she offered him her sincere help, he did not ask for it. Ed made sure she was away from everything by leaving her a note, and then went into battle himself because she had already been punished for her past. Jane didn't know what was going on, but she immediately realized that Ed had made sure that she wasn't drawn into this incident. While she was wasting her time choosing insignificant trinkets, he got into trouble, so she instantly became furious. Mac tried to explain to her what had happened, that the other students were locked in the dorm that had been taken over by the rioters, and Ed was with them. But Elvira was more perceptive, so she shouted at Mac to move away immediately because Jane was now an enemy. The girl released her enormous mana and said that she was not particularly interested in what they were doing here. Ed shouted at her, but she didn't listen and called upon her strongest defenders. Jane, with a sparkle in her eyes, asked Ed to wait just a minute. Elvira estimated the combat power, the spirits of the average level, 4 attributes, plus a lot of small stuff. A whole army. Elvira pulled Mac aside. They couldn't break through here. They barely defeated the fallen aristocrat. And now their opponent is the best second-year student, whom the entire academy barely defeated last time. Mac froze in place as the spirits pinned them down, and Elvira was the only one remaining in control, demanding a retreat through the broken windows. But Mac wouldn't be a hero if he could back down. He could let her valuable medicine go missing or someone get hurt. It is obvious that it is Mac who will be the hero in such a situation. The young man bravely stood in the way of many spirits. Ed grabbed him by the collar and said that when they tell him to retreat, he must do so or the hero's life will not be long. Turning around, he told them that he would tidy up Jane and that they should go up to the second floor as they had planned. Elvira was indignant. Before Ed had blocked their way with all his might, but now he simply let them go. The alchemist girl didn't understand how he was going to stop all these spirits if he was covered in wounds. But then she immediately received a slap on the head for speaking disrespectfully to her elders. Ed told her to grab all her potions and apologized for the torn bag. He completely confused even the smart girl, but she accepted his offer. The trio hurried upstairs, leaving Ed to deal with the furious Jane alone. The girl was about to break and destroy, but the homeless guy just walked up to her. She asked him not to bother because she could figure it out completely and detailed explanations could be left for later. Ed put his hand on her shoulder even though she might perceive it as rude and told her to act in moderation. Jane was completely taken aback by this change in mood and was at a loss. She was embarrassed that he touched her like that, but Ed explained that if she didn't call off the spirits, he would simply fall over because of the wind. The wind died down, and the three friends looked at Jane in surprise. Ed really did calm her down. He gestured for them to move up faster, although he himself could barely stand on his feet. Without the support of Jane, he swayed and began to fall. Before it collapsed at her feet, the friends didn't have much time left to climb to the very top. Jane helped him sit up and pounced on him with questions about why he let himself get beaten. The younger ones had gone too far, she said, and she asked him to promise her that wherever he went, he would not get hurt again. Ed thanked her for her concern. Even though things had gone wrong, he had still fulfilled his role as the boss of the first floor, and now he could return to the hut with peace of mind. But Jane told him that she had seen a richly decorated carriage in the rose garden. She rushed by so quickly that the girl could barely see her, but she saw the coat of arms of a golden crown. The coat of arms of the golden crown and the rich decoration indicated that this was the symbol of the trading guild of Elt, Laurel's adoptive father, who killed her real parents and will disappear in the final act, losing to Laurel, the fake boss, the golden king of Elta. On the 5th floor, Laurel told Oelis how Ed rejected her, and the housekeeper understood who she was talking about and appreciated the lady's taste. Ed had an attractive appearance, but for Laurel it was not the main thing. It seemed to her that he emitted the same smell as Oelis. But at the end he made a lot of emotional comments to Laurel, which is not typical of him. And then without hesitation, he rejected her hand, saying that she herself must bear responsibility for everything. People like them have to listen to words like that all their lives, Laurel told her housekeeper. Oelis had been a housekeeper at Ophelia for 20 years since joining at 15 and had been recognized for her abilities. That's why Laurel spent the most money to bribe Oelis and break her stubbornness. It cost Laurel a lot of money, but she didn't regret it and was glad that Oelis had joined her. After all, she found another person who was close in spirit. Only in this way could she understand that they were kindred spirits. This was the only way Laurel could escape her oppressive loneliness. Now Black Veil wanted Oelis to hand over control of Ophelis's defense systems to Willie, who would destroy the building without realizing it. No matter how bleak her past was or the circumstances she found herself in, this girl is a real villain. Events were unfolding according to plan, and Laurel hoped to simply hide in the pantry. She had to play the role of a good student. Oelis sighed. Her mistress was such a pathetic person at such a young age and was never able to love anyone. And so he would die alone, Oelis thought, and told Laurel that they were not soulmates at all, as she believed. The sword at Laurel's throat burned her skin with cold and spoke more eloquently than 1,000 words. Mac quickly caught Klaus on the 2nd floor, subdued him, and forced him to join their group. On the 3rd floor, their way was blocked by the maid Kelly, but without her twin sister Shelley, she was no match for Mac's squad. They still couldn't figure out why the twin was alone, but they ended up getting to the 4th floor much faster than they planned. It's just that the obstacle on the 1st floor was initially too difficult. The 4th floor was a complete mess with students running in all directions. Villain fell under the control of a protective magic circle and was unable to control it. The self-defense techniques engraved throughout the Oelis building were originally intended to protect students from outside invaders, but now the site looked more like a monkey with a bunch of grenades. Mac parried many spells with his sword but could not get close to Villain. Due to the noise, the locked students panicked, not understanding what was happening. Then those who had enough spirit and strength simply broke the windows and using magic jumped out onto the street. Everything was gradually moving towards disaster. Students were leaving the Oelis building en masse. Mac asked if Elvira had any mothflower extract, but the alchemist said it wouldn't work now. The monkfish reagent was better suited for confined spaces, and Elvira sprayed the contents of the bottle. It allowed the basic magic in this corridor to be blocked. All of Villain's spells were supportive, albeit quite powerful. She kicked Klaus in the ass and told him to ignore it and just knock out Villain. The bespectacled man became even more enraged, seeing how they had moved into close combat. But Klaus and Mac had enough reflexes to get through his barrage of blows without taking damage. There was a massive explosion on the 4th floor, no matter how it ended. Laurel had achieved her goal of damaging the academy. Meanwhile, Ed and Jane watched the carriage, hiding from the rain under a tree. Jane was worried that Ed's wounds would reopen, but he said the blood on his shirt wasn't his. The Golden King of Elta was usually accompanied by more than a dozen carriages and a procession, but such an appearance meant that he had arrived here quickly and secretly. Elta is Laurel's adoptive father and her enemy, who leaves the scene after she defeats him, but he shouldn't be at the academy now. Ed wanted to know what he was doing here. The carriage had been standing here for a long time, but El came out only now as if he was waiting for the building to be destroyed. He was met by Shenny, the twin maid who was supposed to guard the 3rd floor, one of the orphans Oelis raised. Oelis had been completely bribed by Laurel, so it was strange to see Shenny with her mistress's enemy. Shenny would never betray Oelis, and the housekeeper was bribed by Laurel, and Ed assumed that she betrayed the mistress. This meant that there was only one future that could be predicted: the collapse of Laurel. The person who will wage a political battle with Fiona in the third act, and the one who will become the hero's greatest support in the fight against Ed's family. He had such a hard time taking on the role of intermediate boss, and now he was also taking on the role of Laurel. Such madness was out of the question. So Ed had to intervene before it was too late. Ed was forced to turn to Jane, no matter how awkward it was, and thought about how to explain it all. But Jane, without thinking and without waiting for his words, said that she was ready and asked what needed to be done. The thing is that Elta received a report where he was told that his adopted daughter wanted to betray him, conspiring with the rest of the guild members. In addition, acquiring the grimoire of the sage gave Laurel the status to attract Elta to the academy, and he did not have time to react to the coup in time. Oelis found out about this for some reason, and also stole and kept the secret letter that could prove Laurel's conspiracy. But this service was not free. Oelis wanted to be paid more than Laurel offered, otherwise she would side with her. Oelis was losing her sight and had lost most of her hearing in an accident. This was her last year as a housekeeper, and the outcome of the war depended on her choices. The housekeeper pressed the sword to Laurel's throat and told her not to move. Her father would arrive soon, and it would all be over. Laurel wanted revenge on her adoptive father, but from Oelis's point of view, the two of them weren't so different. That the same thing applied to her. Oelis would choose the one who paid the most to the orphanages she looked after. Her speech was interrupted by an explosion that sounded next to Laurel. Mac's squad dragged Villain along with them. Elvira immediately realized that such a simpleton would never have access to protective magic. This means that the housekeeper is behind everything, holding Laurel hostage, Elvira quickly realized, everything in her own way. Taking advantage of this pause, Laurel dodged the traitor's sights. And she jumped to Mac's team. Her friends immediately rushed to support the girl. Laurel bit her lip. She had to put all the blame on Oelis now and tell them that. But she hesitated, and Elvira asked what was wrong with her face. Overwhelmed by her feelings, Laurel could no longer lie convincingly, so she ran away while she could. The Golden King is coming here. He came on his own because he didn't trust anyone. The plan to overthrow him is almost complete, Laurel thought as she ran. All she has to do is contact the main office, send a carrier pigeon that is hidden in her room, and then disappear. Everything will work out. There is no need to despair, the girl convinced herself. There is simply no one who would understand her. She was prepared for betrayal, as always, because she had encountered it countless times. So now, having gone through such a path that broke her heart into pieces, shedding tears was not at all becoming for her. So she decided to do everything she could. Now she just had to run and get to her room before Elt. It was worth sending a carrier pigeon and her problems would be solved. At this time, Elt went to the first floor. Elt saw the student and told him to leave the building quickly. Ed stepped forward and said that due to the risk of collapse, no one was allowed in here until the teachers arrived. Elta asked if he was acting on orders from the academy, but Ed countered that it was his decision under the system that Sylvania used. There were 3 people who controlled the course of this story, Ed understood. Laurel seeks to overthrow Elta and avenge her parents and her childhood, as well as remove him from his position as head of the company. The Golden King wants to thwart her plan and tries to succeed with his plan to obtain the sage's treatise. And Oelis, walking between these two like a thin blade, is the main reason for this crisis. Ed didn't know why she betrayed Laurel, but now they were both on the 5th floor. But was it worth it for him to go there after her? Definitely not. Even if he stays on the sidelines in the scenario, Oelis will run into Mac and his company. This part of the task could simply be entrusted to the main character, and one could believe in his success, because the main character's characteristics have already been confirmed by their battle. In that case, he had to take over this side so that Elt would not be planning in Oelis's building. He just needed to be detained. Ed pretended to only acknowledge the Golden King and formally greet him and asked the reason for such an important person's arrival here. Ed said he would contact the Academy's management immediately and ensure that he was given the reception he deserved. But Elta, who had been calmly listening to the guy in front of him, interrupted him. He already understood that the young man who blocked his path was on Laurel's side, and it could not be said that he was wrong. 10 minutes earlier, he and Jane had punched a hole in the wall. Ed asked the occupant of this room what he was doing, that he didn't even leave it after everything. Zixs replied that he had no intention of acting hastily. Even if the building had collapsed, he still would not have died. But what to do now? After another door appeared in his room, it will be cold to sleep, said the noble savage. Zixs formally greeted Jane, the first time they had seen each other since she had been possessed by a demon. The girl apologized to Zixs, and Ed told her not to be too upset about what happened, because the disciplinary punishment had already passed. The noble barbarian looked closely at the couple and, ignoring propriety, asked directly if they were dating, causing Jane to scream. She began to deny everything too violently, which made her even more embarrassed, and she looked at Ed uncertainly. Jane asked if he was upset about it, but Ed said it was okay. It was Zix's question that was tactless. The noble barbarian immediately bowed and asked for forgiveness, and then he asked why they had come to him and knocked down his door. Ed said he had one request and promised to repay the favor later. Zixs watched from the side as Ed greeted the big shot at the academy. Elt leaned over to Ed and suggested that the young man had fallen for Laurel's looks and offered him some hard cash if he behaved. After all, that girl inherited fox blood and would strike in the back as soon as he opened up. Elt, who raised her from a young age, knew this like no one else. He promised to give him twice as many coins as the girl had promised and demanded that he get out of the way. Ed thanked him for the offer, but there was no point in doubling an amount that no one had offered him. Elta realized that words would not work with him and gave the signal to his men. He ordered his bodyguards to get rid of Ed quietly, and the boy took off running. But his path was already blocked by two men with swords at the ready. But they were immediately swept away by a powerful blow of wind-type magic. Zixs and Jane appeared behind him from the dark corner where Ed had left them. He told his friends that he would go ahead and ask them to hold Elt and his dogs. For a couple of strong mages, this would not be difficult, and besides, Zixs was initially in debt to Ed for saving Elia. Elta immediately realized that these two were not as simple as they seemed at first glance. Therefore, he ordered an attack with all his forces, and his dogs rushed at them. There was a powerful explosion that caught up with Ed, but he had already managed to run out of the lobby. He was supposed to find Laurel and give her all the information, but he felt her presence behind him. Ed asked if she could move, and the girl was taken aback. Ed asked if she had the strength to run and suggested that they first go to the back exit, and told her to follow him step by step. Trust is built on its own reasons, Secretary Charo curried favor with Laurel because he hoped to find out important information. The bakery clerk was welcoming because she left him a generous tip every time. The reason her pet was so affectionate towards her was because she fed him the best treats. Every act of kindness has a reason, at least in Laurel's world it was, but Ed asked for nothing in return. It was all her fault, a stupid mistake, Laurel thought. Although she grew up receiving much favor from the world, like Jane, she was not always kind to the world as a summoner. She realized this the day she saw Jane's gaze directed at Ed, which did not demand anything in return and did not feel greed. Laurel thought she could have the same relationship, so she told Oelis everything about her plans, not knowing that her attitude towards life, in which she does not fully trust anyone, will become so insignificant. Seeing that dark and dirty face, she should not forget and part with the illusion that she could be such a romantic person. Laurel bribed 5 men to capture Oelis, housekeeper Oelis, the twin sisters, the representative of the commoner students, Villain, and the fallen aristocrat, Ed. Oelis and her sisters betrayed her by siding with Elt, and Villain will do the same. And that meant Ed too, Laurel realized, and stopped. She herself did not know why she was saying this and asked him for forgiveness. Right now, she is not in a position to pay him the reward. The situation was unstable, she said. Ed quickly dismissed all her doubts and grabbed her hand. They could be caught right now. And first they needed to get out, and therefore think about the future. Laurel was stunned. He had no reason to help her, but she absolutely had to. Ed asked to explain the situation to him rather than think about the bad. If the reason is not visible, you can't trust a person. Everything should be like this. But she said out loud that there is a plan to manipulate prices on the market that Elt came up with. After the war ended, the price of weapons dropped, so they bought up the surplus weapons and conducted transactions internally several times after monopolizing. To implement this plan, money was urgently needed, and the father said that he had found a buyer for the grimoire at a high price. Then he sent Laurel to the academy to find a way to get his hands on the book and increase the margins, and Ed figured it out. Correction trading is a method in which 3 traders enter into a cartel, monopolize a commodity, and trade it to raise the price. Because in the eyes of the buyer, prices are rising rapidly, and one thought comes to mind: you need to buy now. At this time, if you sell all the goods, you can make a solid profit. However, the key to this deal is the trust of the participants. If someone secretly sells the goods before the deadline, the price will immediately fall, and the partners will suffer losses. Then Elta, who spent the bonds and bought out most of the goods, will suffer a huge loss on his own and will be on the verge of ruin. To implement this plan, Laurel gained influence over the companies, but only when Elt leaves office they will be able to start trading without him. Now Ed understood her plan to the end, to capture Oelis and put pressure on the academy to get a discount and at the same time distract Elt. Laurel was surprised that he understood everything so quickly. Ed got the gist of it and realized there was one more thing she had to do to make it work. She needed to send a pigeon to the main office immediately and start bidding. She had one in her room, Laurel said. The dove will go to her safe environment close to the office. If after that she can hide, her plan will be completed. But Elte learned about this plan from someone, which means he is going to capture her today and force her to give up the names of all the conspirators. Ed told her that from now on and for as long as possible she needed to hide in her shelter. If he were Elt, he would have left his men on both bridges leading off the island, and then he would have been able to grab her 100%. Ed advised her to hire a coachman and simply drive the carriage across the bridge and escape to a convenient place. This should distract the guards, and Laurel herself could hide in his hut for 3 days in the northern part of the forest while the enemies were put on a false trail. Ed will go to her room and send a pigeon. All he has to write is "sell now," and the situation will settle down. At the exit, Ed grabbed her by the shoulders and said that he would deal with whoever was waiting for them and that she needed to watch carefully and escape when she could. Laurel thought about it. They acted so harmoniously, as if they had known each other for a long time, so for a second it seemed to her that she could really trust him. Ed shook her again to make sure she had collected her thoughts and was not frustrated, and the girl said that she understood everything. Maybe this time everything will really work out, the fox thought, and asked why he was helping her, blushing. Ed winced. Girls were difficult creatures after all. Why was she only now asking such a question? And he said that he was doing it just because he thought she needed help, and left the girl alone, in silence. Laurel fell to the floor from the overabundance of feelings because she could no longer stand on her feet. She heard a loud noise and thought it was the end of the battle between Oelis and Mac's group. But the sounds were closer. Maybe someone was fighting on the first floor, she thought. And again, no. The noise was coming even closer, although it was hard to believe, but it was her heart. The maid, Shenny, blocked his way. She didn't expect him to appear from that exit. Even though this was his last obstacle, the maid looked weak, but now this rebellion will come to an end. All of Oelis's magical protective circles are trying to seize the initiative. Oelis had swordsmanship skills comparable to those of the military faculty, with magic that barely reached the average level, but nevertheless harmoniously blended into the environment. And yet, even she was unable to defeat the hero Mac. After all, he is the main character, and he has just started the final battle of the second act. It was raining, and the Shelleys waited tensely to see what Ed would do. The amount of mana was at a minimum. Ed had 2 or 3 uses of basic spells left. And the maid had already rushed towards him with a sword in her hands. But Ed knew her attack system. First she would strike low, so he easily dodged. Then the maid opened her thigh with a garter of daggers. But Ed managed to grab her hand and throw away the garter. He knew her every move. The twin girls could exchange abilities with each other once a day, and Shelley used telekinesis on the daggers. The knives flew straight to the target from the place where Ed had thrown them before. Some of them whistled past his face, but some of them stuck into him. However, Ed was expecting this attack, and fortunately the telekinesis was not strong, so he did not let go of the girl. The borrowed abilities were flawed, so the wounds were deep. Ed pulled out the blades so they wouldn't interfere with movement. He pinned her to the wet cobblestones and told her not to move. Only a minute passed. The girl screamed in pain and frustration. She could not let down her teacher, Oelis. Ed said indifferently that the housekeeper would lose, and then Shelley asked what he could know about her. How much pain this woman experienced, and for what kind of fight she came here. Oelis was giving in to Mac, but she wasn't going to give in, firing multiple spells at him. There was a powerful explosion, and the entire corridor was engulfed in magical flames. Ed didn't know how many orphans Oelis had saved, and her character isn't explored in much detail in the game. Mac broke through with the swordsman's strength, his hair turning white. Oelis was protecting not only herself, but also all the orphans who depended on her. She understood that without her, they would not be able to live as before. And Ed stepped in without even knowing anything, ruining their efforts. He honestly admitted to Shelley that it really was none of his business, but his attitude didn't change at all. Shelley clenched her teeth in pain as he pressed on her shoulder joint and muttered that she would never forgive him. She passed out and went quiet, that's right. He didn't know the extra story, so what did they want from him? I should have started with the fact that there are still many stories in the world that have not been covered. Everyone has one. People who weighed the pros and cons, thought about good and evil, could go and work right now and provide themselves with a full life. But Ed's way of acting has never changed since he entered this body. He acted simply to survive in this dangerous world. For defeating Shelley, Ed received a skill that delays pain for later, surprisingly only now, but it helped to penetrate Laurel. Her room was well furnished, luxurious furniture, various decorations. The table was covered with documents. The books were arranged in perfect order. It was completely in keeping with Black Veil and her business style. Ed wrote a letter and released a dove. Elt will be in Sylvania for 3 more days, sell everything, that's what he wrote, and the bird flew away after the magnate's head. The stab wounds would heal quickly once they were fleshed out, Ed thought, hoping he would be okay as he headed home. If it weren't for the help of Zixs and Jane and other improvisations, Laurel would have already been captured and on her way to falling. But by this time, the bait ordered by Laurel was racing at full speed away from the island. Elta had no choice but to give chase. Even if he caught the coachman and interrogated him, the pigeon would already have arrived at the main office. If all goes according to plan, Laurel will be waiting for him at the forester's lodge. But Ed saw a shadow that glided in the forest. It came to meet him. It was very kind, Ed told her. But then he froze, realizing that he had been too careless because his opponent was none other than the golden daughter, Laurel. There were 5 people involved in this case. Oelis, with the fall of Elta, was in Laurel's hands, her maids too. Villain was easy to bribe. But in Laurel's eyes, Ed Taylor was a variable that couldn't be bought, and a chill ran down his spine. Once she eliminates him in this god-forsaken wilderness where there is not a soul, her perfect crime will end in success. Laurel's essence, the Black Veil, she uses people and throws them away, true evil in the flesh, approached him with a knife. If he wanted to survive, he had to work hard with his brain and legs, but his body wouldn't listen. Laurel came within striking distance of him, and Ed's heart sank. But the steel cut through the clothes, and tearing off a piece, Laurel bandaged the wound on his arm, reproaching him for allowing himself to be wounded. Then she helped him get to his hut, where she had already managed to make a fire. Fortunately, the rain had already subsided. Laurel looked at him with a tender look and said that they needed to warm up first. They sat by the fire and listened to the crackling of dry logs. Fortunately, everything went according to plan. Laurel received a firm promise from the coachman to divert all attention to herself, even if it meant risking her life. Ed was afraid of what could be the source of such devotion of the coachman, but the girl said that she promised him a generous reward. And to leave such an important person like her in debt was a big deal. And she asked him with a sly fox look if he understood how influential she was. Ed remained unmoved by these statements, and Laurel was disappointed. She sincerely thanked him for his help, and Ed simply asked him to return the 20 ducats he had promised. Laurel assured him that he need not worry, and she had one more question for him. It concerned a girl named Jane. They were quite close, and it was hard not to respect Jane, who was so kind and considerate to others. Ed agreed that Jane really was like that, but he was surprised why the question was asked. Laurel replied thoughtfully that she wasn't nearly as kind as sweet Jane. At the same time, Elta received a report from his subordinates and hastily left the Oelis building, recalling his people. Even for a noble barbarian, facing several mercenaries at once was a difficult task. In such a situation, he was more likely to try to keep Jane from becoming too radical than to fight himself. At first, Jane was simply concerned about what was happening, but as the battle progressed, the spirit's power suddenly increased along with her rage. And it was necessary to stop her before the first victims appeared, Zixs realized. He asked the girl what had made her so angry, and a messenger, a white dove, was sitting on her shoulder. After Jane listened to him, she told Zixs not to be angry at all. Villain took full responsibility for all the destruction. Oelis, according to Zixs, was taken into custody and did not say a word. Ed didn't let Laurel leave the stage, and since there was no news from Elt, their operation could be said to have been a success. Now they just have to wait for it all to end. Because of this work, Ed lost a lot of time that he could have spent on development, and his physical condition was also not the best. Now he decided to study the spiritual infusion that grew from the connection with the spirits, but magical engineering required tools. Ed wanted to catch at least one low-ranking spirit and make a contract when he saw Jane visiting him. The girl skipped classes, citing a headache, and decided to rest in the forest. Ed was even worried that his request made her feel ill, but everything was fine, and she immediately asked warily where Laurel was, glancing sideways at the hut. Although the scene with Oelis' capture was over, Laurel still had a lot of work to do. It was necessary to lure the housekeeper Oelis to his side again, to lay the foundation for negotiations about the sage's book. However, over the next 3 days, she will have to wait with anxiety in her heart for good news from the office. But even though this was true, she was not upset because next to Ed, her heart was beating wildly with joy. For his goodwill, without demands or conditions, made her feel immersed in a soft bed. She never wanted to give him up to anyone else. For someone who had lived her whole life on the street, he seemed more valuable than gold. There was no way she was going to share this with anyone, and especially not if that someone was Jane Faylor. After all, for her, relationships without conditions and with trust are something ordinary, since Jane has everything. She can give up one thing, and if she refused to back down, then there would be nothing left to do but start a fight, and that was her specialty, Laurel thought. Living in such a place for 3 days is an undeniable advantage for her. To begin with, she decided to use her favorite tactic and bury this hut under a pile of gold. But she immediately became despondent. It was unlikely to work, and she didn't have the funds now. Then it was worth helping Ed with the tuition fees, the cunning fox decided. It was worth doing it as naturally as possible, casually. It was not for his sake at all. That's what she would say. But she banged her head against the wall because it sounded so embarrassing, and she had no connection with it before. When she heard a voice that politely asked her to leave here because this was her place to sleep, a lazy cat appeared in the doorway holding a blanket in her hands and yawning sweetly. Laurel was surprised to see the best sorceress here. She acted like a weirdo and declared that this was the best place to sleep at this time. But Ed grabbed the cat and, despite her protests, dragged her out of the house. He apologized to Laurel for waking her up and said that Lucy was coming to hide in his house. But he had removed it so that she could continue to rest. And Laurel realized that the lazy cat was also a frequent guest in this place. And she frowned. Ed replied that he viewed her as a natural disaster from which there was no escape. But to Laurel it was obvious. Another competitor. She thought she still had plenty of time and started the morning of the second day with a greeting and a smile. But unfortunately Jane greeted her and she was unable to be alone. Laurel returned to the house, realizing that now was not the best time to show her claws. At this time, a lazy cat was dozing in the hut all the time. Ed tiredly wiped the sweat from his forehead and sighed. He was finally finished. After learning how to lay bricks, he was able to build his first fireplace. After which he began to cook the meat on skewers. The smell was appetizing because he added basil to it. Now they relaxed, even though they hadn't received any news, but since there had been no bad news, they didn't have to worry. Laurel said that as a merchant, she still had a lot of business to take care of and paid Ed his reward, and also asked if he wanted any additional items. Ed thought about it. What came to mind were building materials or some kind of magical tools for engineering. Laurel promised to give them to her later, and Ed also had a request for Jane. He asked her to help him with the contract for the spirit. Jane stated quite happily that she would be happy to be his teacher, and he would be able to make a contract with a mid-level spirit in no time. First, she suggested checking what kind of connection he had with the spirits, and suggested concentrating while holding out the spirit. Ed said he could hear the chick, but only in snatches, and needed a connection with the spirit to hear more. The bird got mad and started flapping its wings, and at the same time revealed all of Jane's important secrets, that she had been watching him. Therefore, the spiritual sparrow immediately disappeared between her palms. She asked if he had heard what the chick had said, and Ed replied in snatches something about a meeting. Jane immediately darkened, not knowing what to say. But Laurel intervened in their awkward pause and asked if they were finished. Laurel immediately offered him her services in the supply of materials and tools at low prices. Supposedly for her, they were a dead asset. In return, he would have to come to her office every 3 days. When he came, they could discuss the price and other details. Jane stated that in this situation, Laurel could have given everything away for free since Ed helped her. The fox stated that it was all about the merchant's ethics. While they argued, Ed chewed meat and thought about how he could now begin magical engineering and spirit magic. At the same time, Laurel's maid Bella came to her, looking for her. She apologized for interrupting their heated argument, but came to deliver the grim news as the new housekeeper. Because I brought news from the former housekeeper of the Oelis dorm. Jane's friend whispered that she had one very important secret, which must remain so. She whispered in Jane's ear that she liked that same Ed Taylor. Bella wondered if she should at least pretend to be surprised out of politeness, and the maid said that she understood and saw Clara's concern. The girl was indignant that her friend had fallen in love with a scoundrel, although she supported her. Ed's reputation gradually improved, but the main thing was not this, but another name that Jane mentioned. Clara didn't know what was going on, but lately the cunning fox and the scoundrel had been absent from classes. Relationships between a man and a woman are about attraction and repulsion, in which case Jane has little chance, Clara worried. Ed also ignored the loving glances, as if he was insensitive, but Bella said that he simply didn't have time for a relationship right now. But Clara shuddered at such words. She believed that Ed was definitely enjoying his popularity, which is why he surrounded himself with a crowd of girls. Bella thought about her words when she came to Ed's camp. There was an angry stray cat sitting in front of the fish stand, an innocent kitten trembling with fear in front of a tiger, and just a lazy cat who likes to sleep on the roof. Bella had a migraine and told Ed that everything was fine. She just felt dizzy when she saw everyone. But Laurel insistently reminded her that what was more important was what Bella had come to say, and Bella repeated it. The burning fire attracted crickets and dispelled the darkness of the night. It was late, and Jane returned to the dorm, and Bella took Lucy with her. With Laurel in hiding, it was a shame to know that Oelis' instructors had found out about her, Ed thought, as he tried on his worn clothes. They had received good news of their victory. Now Elta had to give them a fight in the main office, and he would not be able to think about Sylvania. Elta was a cunning man, so it was possible that he had something else hidden, but Laurel was being helped by a man who was aiming for the position of CEO. Laurel was most worried about Oelis, who could give her away, but these issues were also settled because the housekeeper received an advance payment. From the very beginning, she decided to take the winning side, so she didn't care who she served. Bella handed over a parchment with a detailed list of the orphanages that Oelis had supported throughout her life. Ellis's hard work never ended. Her health deteriorated significantly, but the school continued to pretend that it did not hear anything. In the end, Oelis could no longer work, so she bet her life on this risky plan, always keeping a cold face, not showing emotions. And of course, those who followed Oelis understood her situation and feelings. Of course, it will be difficult to regain trust, but instead of threats, Oelis offered a deal. In the world of a merchant, there is no concept of sympathy, only exchange. Laurel decided to take the housekeeper back. There were no permanent friends or enemies, but relief was clearly visible on her face. Laurel had to go back and asked if Ed would come to the company branch to sign the contract. He agreed and handed her the torch, saying that it would be enough to light the way for some time. He saw her go silent and asked what was wrong, but Laurel suddenly noticed that he came out taller than she thought, suddenly wondering about his height. Laurel spoke in a low voice, even though this step was hasty, but she wanted to seize the initiative and therefore move on to something more radical. She gently took him by the tie and said that relationships are about push and pull, just like how crooked his tie is. Ed countered that no one could see anything anyway, and Laurel replied that there was nothing wrong with looking a little neat. And while he was thinking about what to say to this, her hand pulled Ed down and a kiss burned his lips. Laurel pressed her finger to her lips. The raspberries they had for dinner had been delicious. It was nice to taste them again. Ed sheepishly said that she should have kept her boundaries, and she replied that such words were upsetting, as they could have made him lose all his popularity. She added, smiling slyly, that next time she hoped he would pull her in, and she was practicing pushing him away. Having said this, Laurel went home, but accidentally stumbled on the slippery path. Ed tried to avoid interacting with the main characters of the main scenario. But as expected, in this world everything did not always turn out the way he wanted, Ed thought, and covered his red face with his hand. The stars visible from the forest were still beautiful. The moon was shining brightly, the crackling of the fire was the same, but there was a feeling that the scenario was steadily being distorted. Ed felt a sense of discomfort as he was being pulled deeper into the story against his will. Despite this, his survival policy did not change. Even though he watched the heroes from afar, his goals remained the same. This plan of action may seem simple, but now Ed began to notice how foolish and difficult this task was. So the summer passed, and autumn came. Jane sat in her favorite place under the white tree and listened to the report of the spirits about the previous night and the thief. Sparrow insisted that in such a situation it was necessary to act decisively, but Jane did not understand the meaning of what was said. Tarkin said that he also saw everything. The scene was young and hot. The red fox knew how to play with human hearts. Jane got angry and demanded to get to the point and tell him what Ed's reaction was. Tarkin said that the guy kept his distance, even though he had just been burned by passion. Not a single muscle on his face moved, showing extraordinary resilience. Since Ed was so cold about it that even Tarkin shuddered, there were two options. Either the fallen aristocrat was indifferent to women, or he does not see a woman in his rival, the spirit added. And Jane sighed with relief. The dragon sounded the alarm because Ed was weak in defense, so the more he pushed the fox away, the more she became obsessed with him. "So Jane could lose, Ed," the dragon shouted until the other spirits took him away to cool down, but the panther told the sorceress not to worry and be herself. Tarkin butted in again with his love advice, recommending that she continue to maintain her innocent image. The spirits asked her if she imagined something exciting, and Jane replied that she would like to hand-feed Ed. And while she was embarrassed just from her imagination, Ed was spoon-feeding the lazy cat. But the taste was not very good. As expected, he began to make notes in the recipe to Lucy's indignant hissing. His main stat of dexterity is affected by the sum of all vital skills. Pumping only one will not give anything. You need to pump everything evenly. The problem was that he had little time now. Classes had started, and he could spend 5 hours a day on survival skills. As a result, he slept less. It was difficult to get used to the regime, but the need to follow the characters and the main plot also caused problems. Ed kept a very close eye on Mac and the 4 heroines of the game. Mac was a combat student, hard to get in touch with, but he was growing steadily and Oelis supported him. Fiona was living well with no apparent problems, but she should have had a conflict brewing with Laurel, so she needed to be kept an eye on. Laurel looked like she was walking on thin ice. It was hard to tell what changes Elta's early arrival would bring. However, there was no change in terms of obtaining the grimoire, and the reason why Ed needed more time was to check the professorial core. Because the final boss of the 3rd act is Professor Glast. Claire came to the professor with a report that said there was a hidden figure behind the capture of Oelis, and it seemed plausible. But still, Professor Glast said in a scary voice, she shouldn't forget about the task he gave her before and find the dissertation. Claire was the professor's assistant, and her assistant Anise brought materials related to the capture of Oelis. And Claire took up the task again, despite the dark circles under her eyes. She was so tired that she doubted whether it was worth doing any more, but no matter how she looked at it, Ed Taylor's personality was suspicious. The fallen aristocrat came to the cunning fox, and she said that she had completely forgotten about his contract, so he would come for it next week. And as an apology, she offered him tea and sweets, saying that he could take the materials and tools from the warehouse. Ed noticed that she was dressed differently, and Laurel smiled and said that she simply had an important meeting today, which was why she looked different. The girl sparkled in all her glory, so Ed was surprised at what kind of meeting this was due to his naive nature. Of course, the fox couldn't say everything directly, but the answer was obvious. And she changed the subject, asking if he had finished setting up the hut. He was at the final stage. Ed needed furniture, but ready-made was too expensive for him. Laurel agreed understandingly. She couldn't sell the thing cheaply, but since Ed was good at woodworking, she simply broke her chair. The item had just become unusable, the girl reported, and promised to send it to the hut tomorrow, but even so, it was a luxury for Ed. But since the job was already done, there was no point in refusing, and Ed thanked her. Despite what happened that evening, the fox showed no signs of slowing down. She was surprised that his expression didn't change at all and sat down on the table next to the guy. She made a clear no-lose move that night and opened up completely, but it seemed like Ed didn't see her as a woman from the start. But she saw him as a man, and all her help was filled with a hidden motive. She ran her finger over his chest. Even though she didn't expect an answer since she hadn't entered into a fight she couldn't win. Even though he was acting distant. But one day, she wouldn't be the only one who couldn't control herself, Laurel warned him. Always the same charming smile on your face, no matter if you have a chance to win or you are in a difficult situation. It was the nature of a merchant to never reveal true feelings, but then Ed saw how her hands were shaking. He later met Jane, who agreed to give him a lesson in summoning spirits, which she was very happy about. She told him to focus his mana and form a link. A fireball appeared in her hands. Ed tensed, and the ball of fire turned into a spirit who immediately greeted him. His name was Bruce. The bat introduced himself, and he was a low-ranking fire spirit. Bruce then proceeded to babble on about how he had gone through many tests and a rigorous selection process to earn the right to become his spirit. He talked so much about being the best of the best that Ed's head started spinning. Bruce was burning with impatience to serve his will, demonstrating extreme zeal. During the game, he once obtained a spirit-type skill. They laughed a lot together, supported each other, and formed a strong bond. Ed was surprised by such strict discipline, and Jane explained that she had chosen the spirit with the best magical energy coefficient. The selection process itself was a little complicated, Jane said, and Ed wondered who came up with the selection method. And Jane said it was Tarkin's idea, then Ed imagined this hell. First, he had to accept Bruce. She gave him the spirit. Ed was surprised to feel the warmth, and Jane explained that this was part of the spirit's manifestation. Sometimes they needed to be controlled or it would get too hot. Depending on how he adjusted the connection, the firepower changed, Ed realized. But Jane was confused. He spoke as if the spirit was a machine. The fallen aristocrat turned his gaze back to the spirit who was waiting for instructions. In his eyes, it was a small heater, which was very useful before winter. Ed's eyes lit up. This was a very useful survival tool. You didn't even need to chop wood, and Jane was happy to see his satisfied face. She promised to help if he had any questions and quickly outlined the stages of preparation for him, adding that there were tools in her room that would enhance communication. Jane suggested meeting next time, but quickly stopped herself and covered her mouth with her hand. She said that she was also busy because people were lining up to ask her for help, and it would be difficult for her to find time. She remembered the advice of spirits and friends that she shouldn't pay too much attention to the guy and that she should push him away. Her voice grew hesitant as she spoke of payment, and Ed agreed, reaching into his pocket to pay, even though he couldn't give a decent amount. But Jane immediately dismissed the question of money because he himself was busy surviving and could not throw it away, and it was so cold on his part. They didn't have the kind of relationship where they would pay with money, so Jane asked him not to say such inflammatory things anymore. Simple-minded Ed reminded her that she had been the one to talk about payment first and said that she was acting strangely, looking at the girl's worried face. And Jane said that Clara taught her to say no because she was too kind and open, which was good advice, Ed agreed. But Jane objected that she was not like that with everyone and looked at him intently. At this point, they agreed to meet next time, and she promised to take the necessary tools and waved her hand at him. All Ed could do was wave back. His head was spinning from the girl's antics. The materials that Laurel gave him had a fairly simple structure, so he quickly analyzed them and obtained a high-ranking skill. When he runs out of firewood, Ed uses Bruce, and when he runs out of mana, he resorts to the fireplace so he can consistently heat the air in the room. He received a comfortable living environment for rest and work. Just realizing this fact made him incredibly happy, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Ed looked out the window. The moon was already high, which meant it was late. Late at night, Claire walked into the forest to check on something that was bothering her, and it concerned a fallen nobleman. Everyone involved in the takeover of the building was a worker at the dormitory, but Ed was not involved with them. Claire had heard that Ed was appearing in the northern part of the forest, but he wasn't the type to eat and sleep in the middle of the forest, she thought. And she was horrified when she saw something she didn't expect to see at all and immediately hid among the trees. Claire peered out cautiously, trying to figure out what was going on. The headmaster of the academy is great enough to be comparable to the great sage of Sylvania, but even he would have a hard time against Lucy Merrill, who lay on the shoulder of a fallen aristocrat. So Claire came to the unequivocal conclusion that Ed was definitely involved in the capture of Oelis. Despite the initially false premises, the conclusion was correct. Claire followed Ed straight to his cabin, feeling like a real detective from the novels. Ed threw Lucy into the hut and tossed her a bag of meat. He had a meeting scheduled for the next day and was overloaded with things to do, so he decided to go to bed early. Claire waited until he went into the house and then went to the hut to save Lucy, as she thought. She crept up as quietly as she could, but Lucia suddenly jumped up and found herself behind her. Claire politely introduced herself as the professor's assistant this year. This answer was satisfactory to Lucy, and to Claire's surprise, she returned to the hut. Two glittering predatory eyes stared at her from the darkness, and then the eccentric sorceress with meat in her teeth jumped into the heavenly heights, leaving the young detective lover completely bewildered. Claire came to the professor again and started a conversation about the nobleman who was struck off the family register. Glast replied that he would not stoop so low as to remember scum without talent. Even though he had spoken rudely, he should have remembered Lucy Merrill. That same sorceress was so suppressed by Ed that she could not use her power, and dumped her story full of Claire's nonsense on the professor. Claire used the recording spell in the dorm despite not having permission to do so. She simply brought all the recordings. Glast indifferently demanded that she write an explanatory note, but Claire had written it in advance, but insisted that the professor first look at the entry. In her opinion, Ed was a real hidden figure, said the romance novelist with a rich imagination. But the professor was not convinced. Even the fact that Ed carried Lucy on his back could have happened because the sorceress was simply sleeping. And after an awkward pause, Claire found herself back outside the door, completely disappointed. The professor thought for a second. Ed tried to hold Mac back, but his team quickly got through. It was all in the report. Mac was born to follow the path of the sword, while Elvira was an alchemist with a good sense of combat and reaction. That's why no means would have helped someone like Ed stop those two. But upon looking more closely, the professor let out a surprised cry. There was an explosion, and Ed's ceremonial knife sank deep into the tree trunk. This dagger had been with him since the beginning of his exile. He had used it for so long, and now he felt proud of the fact that he had cast so many spells on it. The spiritual formula fit well, Bruce appreciated it, and said that the more often he uses the item, the better the result will be. But after this, the spirit did not remain silent and began to sing praises to Ed. He started to sing clumsily, but his master grabbed him by the wing and shook him. Even after this, Bruce did not calm down and spoke in such a pompous style as if they were ancient aristocrats from legends, and Ed sternly told him to drop the formal tone that made it stuffy even in the forest. Spirits that have escaped from the physical body and entered into a contract receive magical power from the owner to increase their status. So Ed didn't understand why Bruce was so fussed about making a contract with him, as if there was some kind of promise behind it. And he demanded that the bat tell everything as it is, since they had been together for more than one day. Bruce began to justify himself by saying that he was simply overwhelmed with frantic sympathy for him and so on, but he admitted that when he made a contract with him, he received improved magical power from Jane and would be able to grow twice as big as other spirits. Now Ed realized that it was natural for Bruce to try his best to please him because the spirits were determined by their rank in the hierarchy. Ed's fighting skills were still weak, but his endurance had increased so much that he was no less than an adult man. His pantry was filled with meat, vegetables, and other things so that he would no longer sleep in the cold and on an empty stomach. The theory of magic was easy if he just worked a little. If he slept less and repeated the material he had covered, he would gain a new skill. Since every day was a forced march for Ed, he couldn't call these days calm, but compared to the beginning, everything was going well. Ed didn't notice how he fell asleep, and when he woke up, he didn't immediately understand where he was. He saw Jane's worried face asking him to come to his senses. Ed apologized for being introverted for a moment, and Jane told him not to push himself so hard, as his health was more important. He needed to concentrate because that day he received 3 letters, the first from the Academy Council, the second from a trading company, nothing special. But the third was important because the course of events had already been distorted. The main event of the second act, the negotiations about the Sage's book, were in full swing. Elta's original client entered into direct negotiations with the Academy, which created a 3-way conflict between them and the Academy. The head of the Taylor family that banished Ed planned to use the book to research eternal life, but he himself was the boss of the 4th act. But it was so strong that there was no way to suppress it now, although it was absolutely necessary to erase it from this episode. If Craig Taylor gets the book now, he'll just walk away in cold blood, but he'll become even stronger and impossible to deal with later. The letters discussed Craig's possible actions and doubts about them, and also included an invitation to a meeting. The captain of her knights arrived to greet Princess Fiona, who was pondering the financial difficulties of the Academy. Since the Academy was a private institution, she could not support it directly, and it was shameful to sell the heart of the Academy. That's why Director Obel asked her to help figure it out. It was strange that Craig Taylor found out about everything and wanted to participate in the auction. Clark suspected Ed because he lived at the Academy, and rumors could have reached him. In his place, he would have done everything possible to return to the family. But a third party came up and intervened in their conversation and said that this was not the case. Laurel asked permission to have a cup of tea with Her Majesty, and Fiona was surprised. She thought she couldn't stand her. Laurel said that these words hurt her. If that were so, she would not have come to give the princess sound advice. And she said that Creed's participation in the auction was not Ed's doing, but the work of her adoptive father, Elt. Craig was the main customer from the beginning, asking Elt to buy him a book. Even though his father was overthrown, the plan to get the book remained the same. Fiona was surprised that the guild didn't plan to sell the book to the Taylors at a better price later. Their interests coincided, but in reality there were differences. And Laurel explained that she had no plans to sell the book, as she had to keep her distance from her father's clients for her own good. But these words only caused even more suspicions. Fiona did not understand why Laurel was talking about the company's internal affairs. The enemy of my enemy, Laurel said. Fiona could hold off the Taylor family and she would get a valuable book. Besides, this situation could harm Ed, whom she looked after as his younger comrade, the sly fox said bluntly. Ed had already separated from his family, so it would be unpleasant if people thought he was somehow connected to them. Fiona was surprised that Laurel was keeping an eye on someone, but she said out loud that this young man could really be useful. You can ask a person for something or give them an order, but if the person still remains silent, then they should be eliminated, Fiona said. Hearing these words, Laurel could hardly restrain herself and began to tremble. To deceive and exploit, she said, and asked who would use whom and wiped away a tear. Clark yelled at her for being so impudent in front of the princess, but Laurel continued. She approached Fiona and said that they were allies this time, and she had one piece of advice for her. She warned the princess not to even think about using Ed for her plans, or someone would use her instead. Clark demanded that Laurel be held accountable for such tactlessness, but Fiona refused. Fiona was confused. She knew nothing about Ed Taylor's intentions, and now Craig Taylor was involved in the bidding. But what she really had to fear was an arrogant girl with a character who would not bow down even to a princess. Fiona wondered if she would be able to see Laurel's face when she was confused and didn't know what to do. But that's exactly what happened when Ed showed up to meet her with the company of the noisy, chattering Jane, and he himself was gloomier than a cloud. The girls immediately started squabbling over the tea because Laurel was not going to play at hospitality and said that there was only one cup, so Ed gave it to Jane. And Laurel was forced to change the subject because Ed came for tools for magical engineering. She prepared for him a whole cabinet of the best magical devices. They looked like new items and did not resemble stale goods, which did not escape the notice of Jane, who said that giving away such things was contrary to the ethics of a merchant. Laurel objected that the girl didn't understand at all since the things had defects. The scratch was very tiny, and Jane suspected her competitor of deliberately damaging property, but the fox simply brushed it off. Ed was grateful but felt a burden of debt since he had not yet paid for the last time, but Laurel said that for her it was just a pittance. Jane insisted that they break their agreement, but Laurel replied that they would sort it out without her. Ed stopped hearing their voices. At some point he felt a familiar sensation that again engulfed his body. It felt like he was diving into water. He had a lot of work to do, and he had been stuck in that state a lot lately. After all, he had to keep Craig Taylor under control. He only had 2 weeks to spare, and he had to make all the preparations. It was also necessary to make a mattress for the bed, weave fabric for the upholstery, and stuff it with grass or fabrics to make it softer. And it was also necessary to cut up and cook the caught deer, and clean up the inside of the hut, and make some jerky for Lucy, Ed thought as he sank deeper. From somewhere on the surface he could hear their worried voices and anxious glances. Fiona had to admit that Ed had been acting completely different since that fishing trip, and the way he had behaved during the battle against Glaskin. He had gained a reputation among the students as a diligent student, and Laurel warned her not to treat him carelessly. There was a feeling that the boy was beyond her grasp, and she wanted to make at least one test to make sure. Fiona decided to invite Ed to her place and ask Clark to clarify her schedule, but the captain reported to her that she would not be able to meet him anytime soon. Fiona was surprised. She wanted to summon Ed to her by royal decree, but Clark stunned her that Ed Taylor had collapsed from exhaustion. The status window showed exhaustion, high fever, upset stomach, pain, migraine, heavy breathing, and other joys. Ed felt a heaviness in his lower abdomen and could barely breathe, but when he looked down, he saw the reason. The lazy cat snored peacefully, using him as a bed. Ed was outraged that the brat was chatting carefree in his sleep, on top of everything else. Lucy is as light as a feather, even lighter, so sometimes you might think that she is not a person at all, but a ghost. But now Ed was unable to even move, and since Lucy was the same as usual, it was most likely he who was terribly weak. He was in his hut. The blanket looked new, most likely brought by Laurel, and he asked Lucy what else she was doing between eating and sleeping. The lazy cat congratulated him on waking up. His mana flows were distorted, all the consequences of his training and constant work without rest. She continued to treat him all the time while he was sleeping, nothing complicated, but it was boring, so she took a nap herself. Moreover, due to the sharp glances of the two rivals, she seemed to be walking on a razor's edge all the time, but they could not tell her anything, since Ed needed to be treated. The cat told him not to get sick because illness is serious and can kill, because her grandfather, who raised her, died of illness in his bed. And Ed sincerely thanked the lazy cat, seeing her depth for the first time. Zixs looked through the doorway. He had lit a fire outside, since he did not know how to light a fireplace, and greeted them. Seeing the unexpected guest, Lucy quickly pulled her hat down to hide her face, and instantly left the house through the fireplace like a real Santa Claus. Zixs looked at Ed with a strange look and asked which girl this was. Zixs thought about it. It was not surprising that a strong male would be surrounded by several females, and he thought that civilization was open in this regard. Ed interrupted the noble barbarian's thoughts before they could go any further and asked him where he was from. Laurel had gone off to take care of the company's affairs, and Jane had returned to the academy, Zixs told him, and his hair had grown because it was already autumn. He gave Ed some slop, but even the unpretentious commoner winced. Zixs admitted that Jane or Clara would have done better. But Laurel had clearly insisted that there should be no women in the hut, the barbarian said. Ed decided to check the script as usual and casually asked that the students had started a secret production of mandrakes, which had become a problem. Zixs said that the troublemaker Elvira, Mac, and Klaus quickly dealt with that issue. Act 2, Scene 5. Everything went according to plan. Several monsters that were not destroyed by the church made their way into the water supply, and the heroes group dealt with them as well. The 7th scene was fine. So the last big event was the Sage's Seal, and Ed asked how long he had been lying there. Zixs stunned him by saying that today was already the 10th day, and Ed jumped up on the bed, taking the soup from him. He thought his sleep lasted 2 or 3 days, but not 10. There was little time, so Ed asked Zixs to pass on his words to Laurel as quickly as possible. The next day, the battle for the Sage's Seal began with many variables. The first party to bid was Princess Fiona. Laurel, the Golden Daughter, represented her merchant guild. And the one who shouldn't be in this act is Duke Craig Taylor, the final boss of Act 4. They began their negotiations with a dinner party, Fiona keeping a careful face. Even though it had been a long time, Craig decided to make a formal apology, as their immature youth had caused Fiona a lot of trouble. As she requested, he excluded Ed from the family register, and upon hearing this, the princess replied that it did not bother her. Duke Taylor sat in front of her, smiling politely. Previously, Craig was full of nobility, wisdom, dignity, and respect for him could be read in every gesture of his vassals. But Fiona's eyes could see the essence of the Duke without hindrance. He is the devil. Then Craig turned his gaze to the second girl at the table, and she introduced herself. Laurel stood up for the formal greeting. Craig had heard about the only daughter of the Golden King, Elta. She told him that if there was an item for sale that could make a profit, they had to buy it at all costs. The essence of the trade was simple. After lunch, everyone wrote down their price on a piece of paper. The seal of the sage will be given to the one who bids the highest because the book is the treasure of the Academy. But the Academy does not want to officially announce that it is selling the relics because it is experiencing financial difficulties. The princess, as an observer, guaranteed the secrecy, and Deputy Director Rachel could calmly open the bidding. And the method was very simple. Whoever writes the largest amount takes the prize. Fiona knew in advance what method the auction would be conducted, so she studied all similar transactions for the sale of such books. The Book of Order, or the Book of Inertia, the works of wizards or alchemists, cost within 10,000 ducats. They possessed valuable knowledge about their subject or could act as a valuable luxury item. Laurel probably knows the prices and sales records of all such famous books. However, Craig Taylor would be the bearer of the Sage's Seal, Fiona believed. They wrote down their suggestions, and Rachel thanked them for their participation. This was an auction with no upper limit. The decision is made on one bid, and in order to win, you need to know the upper limit of your opponent's bid. Laurel stated outright that she wanted to sell the book later and make a profit. If she wanted to make a profit, she couldn't offer more than 8,100 ducats for the book, which would make the book the most expensive in the history of auctions. Creed only had to offer a little more than her maximum bid, and he would win the auction. Rachel announced the proposed amounts. Creed offered 8.5 ducats. As Fiona expected, he was certainly not interested in profit, and she wanted to know his purpose. But then, Rachel named the amount of 9,400 coins that Laurel had offered, and the cunning fox fooled everyone. Creed winced and quickly left without further ado, and Laurel was invited into another room to sign papers. Fiona tried to understand what Laurel's goal was. If it wasn't profit, it seemed like from the very beginning she wanted to take the book from Craig. But a fox is not someone who acts in the name of justice, and this confused everything even more for Fiona. It felt like a request or an order, like someone was controlling Laurel from the shadows, someone who knew about Craig's dark side and wanted to stop him. Fiona remembered how Laurel had spoken about Ed and his connections to the family. Even after his exile, he had worked so hard that he had collapsed. But despite this, he tried to resist the Taylor family until the very end, Fiona decided. The princess grabbed her head from the flood of thoughts and was horrified by what she had done. She was overcome with guilt for driving such a man into the abyss, but for someone her delusion turned out to be a blessing. Laurel's words that she would not sell the book to Craig were disingenuous. She had already calculated the difference between their offers. For just 900 coins, she got Ed to promise to do anything as long as she had this book, no matter what happened to her later. How could he make such a mistake, tell the merchant that he could offer any price? It was so unlike him, Laurel thought. A free pass to Ed for only 900 coins, it was a good deal. Laurel smiled with satisfaction. If Princess Fiona saw that face now, she would have a stroke. Zixs told him the news and said it was good that Jane was so pure and innocent because Laurel's face was frightening when she received Ed's letters. Laurel's interest and information from the tailor's house paid off, but thinking about what would happen next, he wanted to apologize. But at that moment, Jane appeared in the camp, rushing in as soon as the morning classes ended. Ed thanked her for her concern. He apologized for causing her a lot of inconvenience, but the girl denied everything. Zixs said she ran around the academy crying, that everyone thought she had a broken heart, and Jane grabbed the tactless barbarian. She made a gesture to her spirits and said that it was chilly today. Let him be careful on the way home when he was dragged into the forest. Bruce appeared from behind her hair and fell on his face, begging to be punished, blaming himself for not looking after his master. All this time he hid at Jane's because he was afraid that if he got close to Ed, he would use up his mana, and the young man said that this was nonsense. But according to the returning Zixs, the fact that he lay unconscious for 10 days was no nonsense. It was only now that it occurred to Ed that 10 days had passed, and his supplies in the pantry were heavily fermented. He lost all his food supplies, and now he has to start all over again. Jane couldn't bear to see him work himself to death again and volunteered to help. Zixs joined in, promising to help with hunting and woodworking. Zixs added that if you deal with everything in order from the very beginning, then everything will somehow work out. Suddenly Ed remembered it wasn't such a distant past to forget. The time when he sat penniless in the forest under a wooden canopy, and at that moment he had no one to lean on. Of course, there were many things that stalled, but he still solved many more issues while he was busy surviving. That's right, Ed thought. Everything will work out somehow, he smiled weakly. And Jane looked at him still worriedly. She remembered the words of the she-wolf Marie. Even though Ed looked tired, this was her chance because the red fox was busy with her own affairs and would not be visiting the camp. The fox was quite skilled in these matters. There was much to learn from her, like it or not. To get a man, you need to be a fox, said Marie. First of all, in her clothes she looks like a country bumpkin, said the she-wolf. And Jane agreed, but then Marie added that the girl had already earned 100 points, and she began to instruct her that now she should look like a girl who copes well with everyday affairs and can provide support. Today she will go and see him, Marie wished her mistress success. Of course, she herself had no relationship, but from the outside it is clearer, of course. Jane, like a saint of simplicity, stared at her with saucer-like eyes. The wolf persistently asked if Jane had tried to close the distance between them after she had helped him so much, but the girl hadn't even thought about it. Even the spirits were surprised when the she-wolf howled as if in grief. Jane covered her ears from her scream, and the girl scolded Marie for the fact that there would be no more such chances because Ed was as strong as flint and would become stronger. She had to be with him to win and take advantage of her position no matter how insidious it looked, Marie insisted. Jane barely reassured her by saying she had a plan, and the wolf admitted it was a good one, and by then it was deep night. Jane cooked delicious meat. It was divine after Zix's cooking. Ed wanted to learn a lot from her, but first he needed to rest. Even though they were helping him, he couldn't show them his weakness. Although he didn't feel well, his headache and fever were still with him. Jane appeared in the doorway, although Ed thought she had already gone home, and asked the girl what she was going to do. Jane was worried that Ed would start doing something when she left, so she simply sat down next to him. She told him that he shouldn't pretend that it wasn't difficult for him. If the body gets tired, the spirit gets tired too. The process is the same for everyone. Jane already knew that he copes better than anyone else. When she was going through a hard time, she received a lot of support, but the biggest help she got was from the person who was simply there for her. He had many difficulties, but he had worked hard, the sweet spirit summoner told him. When Ed started grumbling, Jane demanded that he simply admit that he was having a hard time and say so. Then the former nobleman simply gave up and fell onto the bed. It was really hard for him. Ed closed his eyes and was finally able to relax, as if life had loosened its grip for a second. He woke up at dawn and immediately got out of bed. All this time the girl lay next to him, as if guarding his sleep. Now his body is fully restored, Ed chuckled. Over the next 10 days, he was unable to make the progress he had planned, especially in his magical engineering research. These skills had a strong influence on all the others, but the problem was that there was a limit to how much you could grow using self-study. Most of the blueprints for magic items are rewards for the main quests of the hero, and it is quite difficult to obtain them without interfering with the scenario. Laurel asked him what he was thinking about because he had only just come to his senses and was already frightening her again. Ed was also happy to see her healthy, but the girl said that she achieved this at the cost of great effort because she suffered from chronic stress. Laurel said she dropped by to take a break and to let him know she was removing her father's name from the company and needed an assistant. A person who would help with management, employees, assets, essentially a co-manager. The sly fox smiled and suggested that we just imagine it. They will work in the same office separated by only one wall. He will also receive great benefits, shares. It is almost like joining a family. In her dizzy dreams, Laurel pressed her hands to her rosy cheeks. But Ed responded with restraint, saying that her involvement was excessive and that it looked strange. The fox, embarrassed, pulled her hood up to hide her face. He didn't understand anything, Laurel said. She knew what he might think of her, that her decisions were spontaneous based on the emotions of a young girl. Most likely he wants to have a business relationship with her until the very end, said the fox, and hit the nail on the head. But he said so only because he knew nothing of how she lived among the heaps of gold that come and go, where there was betrayal all around. This means that the most important person for you in such conditions is the one who will never betray you, she said, and looked out from under the hood. What matters is the one who stays with her, even if her wealth disappears at once. Even if the whole world turns away, she said, placing her hand on his. For some it's a seed, for others it's a lover, or a person they've spent years with, Ed thought. But Laurel has seen countless ups and downs of traders, and the fear that the same could happen to her haunts her constantly. No more, no less, she asked him to simply stay by his side again and again, inventing plausible excuses but not losing hope. But Ed saw through her game. She changed her tone too much during her monologue, and her smile was too captivating. The girl laughed. She simply couldn't help herself and gave in to her game, but it's usually hard to restrain your protective instinct when she makes that face, the fox said. Usually their hearts melt from her gentle and timid appearance, but nevertheless everything she said was not a lie. Ed thought for a moment and then gave his usual serious answer. He still planned to finish the academy, and until then he would not leave it. Even though he hadn't decided what he would do after graduation, his words made Laurel smile. Standing up, she said that although she had intended to wait until his release, he had no choice in the first place, the fox warned. Perhaps she would soon use her free pass. She waved his letter of request and said that she was glad to see him. Thinking about what awaited him in the future, Ed thought that he had done something truly terrible, as if he had fallen into her debt. And that was dangerous. Laurel was just going to make a statement that he was now hers and hand over the document. But seeing his appearance, she failed with the plan of execution. If she had not turned back in time, it would have definitely upset Ed, she understood. She took the change from the payment for the materials with her, brought everything except one coin. But now, she didn't know how to look him in the eye. You could have just thrown the bag in the hut when he wasn't looking. That's what Laurel thought when she saw her rival at the door of the hut, holding a pillow in her hands, wearing an apron and preoccupied with household chores. Both girls were stunned when they noticed each other. The meeting came as a surprise to them. They both wanted to know why one came out of the hut and the other went there. And this was only the beginning of a new disaster for the former nobleman. Ed was chopping wood while Bruce was chatting endlessly, his concern about his diet, sleep, and rest now redoubled. The guy realized that Tarkin had given the spirit a dressing down and apologized for it, but wherever he went, there was a madhouse. Anyway, thanks to Jane and Zix's help, he prepared enough food and firewood, and with Laurel's help, furniture appeared in the house. Now he was worried about Professor Glast's letters, which said that he wanted to hold a personal meeting after the magical conference. Unfortunately, Ed was bedridden due to exhaustion and was unable to meet with the professor and did not even know the reason why he was called. Glast is the final boss of Act 2, Marcusto, and the final chapter of Act 2 has already begun. Ed remembered most of the second act. The professor always believed that a few gifted people could change the world and resurrect the greatest sage. He was studying star magic that distorted the laws of the world, and to complete it, he needed the Book of the Sage. But the Academy sold it to Laurel. In his desperation, the professor would steal the book and attempt to introduce the spirit of Sylvania into the body of Ayla, who had a talent for star magic. To start a new progressive era, it was literally the ravings of a madman. But then, in order to save his girlfriend, the main character Mac will come onto the scene. He will break through traps and dungeons. Glast's last words after he suffered a crushing defeat were unexpected. He who always dreamed of academic success, the development of the era, and dedicated his life to the search for talent, threw out a strange phrase. Ed tried to remember the words that the professor had spoken. One way or another, it all started with Ayla and her kidnapping. The girl came to her senses and screamed for them not to come near her. It was no wonder she was scared, because the demon of the underground water supply system was terrifying. But the girl screamed that it was all because of him, she again, the one she hated so much. Ed Taylor stared at the girl in surprise and asked if she was going too far. After all, they were both kidnapped and were held in the same cell as hostages. The final chapter of the second attack, the Battle of Glast, begins, Ed thought. 3 days before the events described, he was in his forester's hut. Now he learned to create all the objects that he had not been able to do before, although it was a shame that he had lost so much time due to illness. The Battle of Glast was about to begin. He still hadn't managed to raise his skills in magical engineering, and he still needed plans and materials. And then Ed remembered that there was one way to increase his stats in this skill. There were only 4 stages in the last chapter of this act. Among them, the highest level was the stage bosses. The secret laboratory was the 3rd phase of the battle. Librarian Reyna was so strong that it was difficult to break through her without holy sword techniques. But that was Mac's problem. He was only interested in the contents of the Library of Souls. It was filled to the brim with useful loot. And there were 2 formulas for producing legendary-type magical engineering items, although the undertaking was dangerous. But if you don't go there alone, there shouldn't be any problems, Ed thought, glancing briefly at Jane. The academy was filled with noise and hubbub as usual during the short break between classes. Professor Glass told the students that even if they were promoted to a higher grade in the middle of the year, they would quickly adapt to the new classes. Although Glass said that there were many talents in the first class, there were only 3 of them, and from the next semester there were 7. There were cases when the class was closed altogether. Isla's combat power was mediocre, but she had excellent talent in star magic. Zixs asked the professor whether talent was the main criterion for selection into the class. After all, even the students themselves didn't know what they could become if they put in the effort. The professor asked Zixs if he thought the students' efforts were being ignored or denigrated. The surest way to ruin someone's life is to convince them they are talented and give them a mixed message, the professor said. Laurel sighed. Before entering the academy, she collected information on each of the professors. The obsession with talent, which could be seen as complacency and stubbornness, was connected with his daughter. His only daughter, Murray, was a mediocre wizard, but he had boundless faith in her, which is only natural for a father. But Murray perceived this not as her father's faith, but as the faith of Professor Glast from the Faculty of Magic. Based on her father's faith, she quickly took part in subduing the demon at a young age. And in the end, she died a brave but arrogant death, which broke her father's heart, after which he became obsessed with finding talent. As a professor, he devoted himself entirely to the unknown magic of the stars. But if you look back in time, you can see that the professor was not looking for magic itself. And the man who invented it, the wisest man, the best talent in history, Sylvania. The reason why the professor moved Ayla from the 3rd grade to the 1st was precisely for this reason. The professor turned to Laurel and said that he would invite her to a meeting tomorrow, and the fox immediately understood what they would talk about. The girl did not consider it completely useless because tomorrow she would perform the ritual and become the full owner of the seal. Claire finished her lesson. Ed waited for the ritual of receiving the sage to begin soon. Although he was a little anxious, he had already carefully worked out the entire plan for the next operation, the point of which is to follow Mac and his team to rescue Isla. He will quietly follow him and collect all the items he finds that Mac won't touch, and even prepared a list. Ed was going to take Glock's Eye, which increased magical power, and the Hourglass, which resets physical states to their previous ones. In addition, he will appreciate Mac's growth during the battle in Phase 5 and quietly return to the camp. The battle will begin on the day of the sealing ritual. Ed told Jane that he lost something in the plumbing system and offered to look for it together. He thought the girl would not like the idea since it involved a dark, narrow space, but she agreed with great enthusiasm. Even though it was hard for Ed, his plan was perfect because he had a reliable comrade. When he turned around, Claire told him that Glast was waiting for him at his place. He had heard from Jane that Claire had recently been at the camp, and he thought that this would be the topic. The ritual of the sage's seal was tomorrow. It was strange that the professor called him to him, although he had little time, but Ed agreed to come. Last time, he did not accept the invitation because of illness. This time, he did not want to refuse, but when he came, he saw the cat, Isla, there, her fur standing on end. Although she could understand they had been clashing constantly for 10 months, and he had also used arrows against her. But what was more important was why Ayla, who the professor would need tomorrow, was here with him in the office. By the way, they also invited him here, and then Ed had an idea. He began to sort through the papers on the professor's desk. Ed looked around anxiously. As far as he knew, there was no room for change in the future. But if there was a trigger for contact with Ed Taylor, it would have been his personal file on the professor's desk. It was a report from Claire's assistant, who was keeping an eye on him, which meant the professor could have been aware of his actions in Oelis's dormitory. Ed didn't understand what he could have to do with all this, but hearing the movement, he turned around and drew his knife. Professor Glast closed the doors to his office behind him. Naive Ayla rushed to the professor, screaming for help. But she screamed even louder when Glast used his magic. The magic of the Star World has trapped Ayla in a time prison. Ed threw his dagger at the professor, but he was confident that he would block this attack. However, then the spirit of Ed Bruce detonated the spell placed on the knife. The professor was unharmed and praised Ed for quickly realizing what was going on. The reaction was smooth, almost perfect. Amazingly, in a couple of minutes, Ed looked at the research materials and understood everything. But the strange thing was, said the professor, that from just a couple of papers it was impossible to understand all his plans, and Ed asked why he was being dragged into all this. He promised to keep his mouth shut, since the professor had already gotten what he wanted anyway, but Glass said that he was pursuing his own goal and asked not to hold a grudge against him. This answer was too vague and did not give Ed any new information. Even if he escapes from here, the professor will definitely not sit idly by. And there is a high probability that the script will not be able to be executed. If he gets kidnapped here, he'll most likely be locked in the basement with Ayla, which means he'll be taken straight to the third phase of the fight. And the former nobleman thought that it wouldn't be easier to just let himself be caught. Ed emerged from his hiding place behind the professor's desk, and Glass decided that the boy had decided to take the fight to the open. And he said that this would serve as a good lesson for him, holding out his hand with a spell. The time prison worked on the guy, just like it did on Ayla before. The professor confidently approached the boy who had turned to stone. At first, Glass couldn't believe that living in the wild, Ed was able to succeed in his studies, as if Ed had 48 hours in a day. He couldn't even imagine the sweat and blood that went into these successes, but then he saw his fighting style in a crystal ball, and I could confidently conclude that the guy had an exceptional sense of combat, but this was the path of the weakest. The way to carefully analyze your opponent and use all means. All this is a product of effort, not talent. His face did not express even a drop of concern, and also reminded the professor of a grave loss, his only daughter screaming that she will bring glory to her father by opening a new specialization in magic. This memory kept coming back to him again and again. The professor didn't notice how a nimble spirit of fire jumped out of Ed's pocket. He left the office unhindered and rushed off towards the forest. At this time, Jane was preparing dinner for Ed, skillfully using the fireplace in his hut, and was worried that the guy was late. The sage left the last lines about his journey to the south. There were still so many undisclosed truths that his title lost its meaning. His teacher Sylvania had passed away at a young age, still beautiful in his memory. His past years had been truly eventful. The sadness of losing a teacher was smoothed over by time, but if you live a long life, melancholy appears. Grief over what was lost sometimes paralyzes the mind. Of course, sometimes he had thoughts of breaking the rules and seeing the teacher's face again. But what's gone is gone, and the one who has experienced loss must remain strong, even in sorrow. So he asked her to become strong and gave his hat to the girl pupil. He dedicated the last sentence of his book to her, the girl he met just before his death. Lucy clutched the book in her hands, and too salty as the sea streams rolled down her cheeks. The sage himself accepted his death, so Lucy accepted it too, and wondered if the day had come when the pain of loss would be washed away by the rain and the sadness carried away by the wind. Of course, she had her joys that briefly distracted her from her sadness, like the bag of dried venison that she clutched in her hands. But right now, it was completely empty because he hadn't filled it. Lying on the roof, Lucy saw Ed's fiery spirit rush into the camp. And when Bruce told the terrible news, Jane was instantly transformed. Even Lucy looked up from her thoughts to ask what had happened. The secret ceremony of handing over the sage's seal took place in a luxurious hall. Only those directly involved in the entire ritual were present in the hall. The Black Veil itself, Laurel, stood out from the rest, and the director of the Sylvania Academy, Obel Force, who stood opposite. The director's height and build were roughly the same as Craig Taylor's, but they were still very different. Laurel hadn't originally planned to sell the book to Craig, but it was a significant amount of money worth lying to the princess for. Laurel asked for 12,000 ducats, which was an impressive sum. But Craig accepted the condition immediately, so Laurel regretted not asking for more. Craig warned her that Elta had hired people and was heading to the academy with them. He said this out of concern that this time everything would go as it should, even though Craig was an extremely unpleasant person. It didn't matter. The information about Elta was valuable, and she also solved the issue with the book. Having a certificate for the purchase, she more than compensated for the difference in price. Moreover, now she would have a free ticket to Ed in her hands, and the girl could not hold back a greedy smile. But a second after she placed her hand on the sage's seal, Professor Glast appeared in the room. Along with him, stone golems appeared in the room, which he summoned with magic. While Director Obel held them back, Laurel wanted to take the sage's seal. But Professor Glast had already captured her and was successfully moving back. He disappeared in a blinding flash of magic along with the fox's precious asset. Despite Ed's absence, the story progressed as planned without a hitch. Isla shuddered again under his gaze, making it clear how disgusting he was to her. Right now, the professor had to steal the seal, Ed figured, not paying attention to the girl. When some fat man told her to shut up, otherwise, she would wake up the monster behind him with her screams. It was a great stroke of luck for them that the professor ordered him to refrain from experimenting on them, since he needed them. The fat man was surprised by Ed's calmness when he simply agreed with him. He warned them that even though he would be doing his research, he would still keep a close eye on them, and Ed sat down on the floor. Now all I had to do was wait for Mac to burst in and start a fight, by which time the library would be cleared out. And he would get all his materials. This thought was so sweet that even he felt ashamed. And it was also annoying that he was here with Ayla, who screamed with every breath he took. Ed tried to calm her down by saying that he had no ill intentions towards her. If he wanted to, he would have taken advantage of the moment long ago. In fact, he has always treated Ayla well, because she is the main character's support. The girl flatly refused to believe her words, and Ed made another attempt to convince her, saying that Mac would come here soon and save her. Isla tearfully replied that he had no right to even speak Mac's name. Then the fallen nobleman apologized for the past and said that he had his reasons for it, even if she did not believe him. She could believe Mac. The girl was shocked that the impudent and arrogant nobleman with a bad character had just apologized to her. But at that moment, Bruce flew into their cage with cries of concern. He reported that he followed a faint trace of Ed's magic and found him. Ed asked the spirit where he had managed to fly during this time and praised him for finding him. Ayla was surprised that Ed had already learned to control spirits because before that he only had access to basic magic. And since we were talking about the spirit, now they could send a request for help, Ayla said, instantly forgetting about their differences. Ed reflected that there was no need to make any further changes to the script. Bruce informed Ed that more than 2 days had passed since his abduction, but he could still clearly see Jane's beautiful expression and sense her cold anger. Moreover, he believed that the red fox and the lazy cat would join them, so that the power of the rescue squad would be like that of 1,000 soldiers. Bruce chirped that there was nothing to worry about. He would always find a way to save his master. Now he could just wait here. Ed grabbed the bastards by the head from the number of edits he made to the script, blabbered to the whole world about Ed's kidnapping. In anger, he threw the overly ardent spirit straight into the wall. Ed shouted to the fat man that he had changed his mind, he couldn't stay there, and he wanted to leave immediately. Ed told him that he wasn't joking. The fat man grinned and reminded him that if he screamed, the demon would wake up. The fallen aristocrat said that if he was not released, the problems would not be his but the fat man's, but he only laughed harder. He left indifferently, saying that Ed could make noise, but in moderation. Isla asked Ed in surprise what had come over him, since he himself had told her to sit still and wait for Mac. Bruce placed the keys in Ed's palm, which he had stolen while he had the fat man distracted. The guy really was a quick learner. Ed told him to come back. Bruce was constantly doing things that no one asked him to do. Using the keys, Ed easily opened the dungeon and Ayla followed him. But then the prison cell closed right in front of her nose. Ed told her to shut up and answer only yes or no. He told Ayla that there were magical experiments going on outside, so it was dangerous there. She needed to submit to her captors. No one would harm her anyway. Besides, she was too nervous now, so she wouldn't be able to run fast. Ayla tried to object, but Ed interrupted her. He demanded from her only yes or no, and the girl said yes. The fallen nobleman told her to sit quietly, and he himself rushed down the corridor, saying that he would take care of everything. Even minor turns can be controlled. His skills have improved significantly, so problems can be solved using information. But there will definitely be variables that cannot be solved by hand. Jane or Laurel's participation in the battle can still be dealt with somehow. But no natural disaster intervened. Many players have tried to solve this problem many times. The answer remained the same. Lucy is a completely invulnerable enemy. A lazy cat is the reason for the bad ending, 27. The bad ending only occurred under certain circumstances. Ed had to prevent Lucy from appearing here at all costs. Zixs was practicing in his room as usual when a worried Mac came in. He was barely breathing and was pretty battered. He asked for help to save Ayla. Thus began the first phase of the pursuit of Glast, Zixs becoming the first one that Mac took with him. Ed has to go through the entire battlefield in reverse order. Fortunately, the last level will only become a problem when the monsters are dealt with later. Since the meeting of Lazy Lucy and the professor is a bad ending, he must hurry. The problem was the Library of Souls and the spirit that guarded this place. Raina is a dangerous ghost. Ed planned to come here after eliminating her. Of course, he remembered her patrol pattern. He could even defeat her since he knew the working strategy. But this intermediate boss represents important experience points for the main character. In the second half of the game, there will be those who cannot be defeated without intensive training from Mac, so he must be prepared. In this act, Mac had to push himself to the limit, catch the resurrected demon, and master the necessary skills. And Raina gives the most points, so she couldn't be killed. So Ed decided to quietly take everything he needed and leave unnoticed. He calmly checked the list, knowing that he would not be noticed. When it was all over, he would just come back here again. Although it was a shame that he couldn't take everything at once. Bruce helped Ed keep an eye on Raina by telling him where the ghost's gaze was directed. But when Ed was already thinking about leaving the shelter, an earthquake happened that should not have happened. An unstable cabinet fell next to Ed, leaving him without cover. Raina immediately noticed the noise. The earthquake didn't bother her much. But because of this, Ed fell into her field of vision and lost the opportunity to hide. 30 minutes before the vile earthquake, a battle with golems was raging in the hall where the ritual of transferring the sage's seal was taking place. But one sorceress deftly dealt with them with a blow of her ice magic. Laurel was worried that if there was a fuss, her reputation would be ruined, and she was outraged that her book had been stolen by an academy professor. Director Oelis said he would take full responsibility and asked for time. Whatever the professor had planned, it clearly could not end well. Oelis decided that since things had come to this point, it was high time to inform the head of the trading company and asked if she knew about the 3 great taboos, distorting the providence of the world, blurring the current flow of time, rejecting the framework of human destinies. 3 taboos. Raising the dead, reversing time, and seeking eternal life. Laurel was horrified that the director knew and did nothing. Glast had a habit of saying that talented people accelerate the progress of the world, and he immensely respected and looked up to the sage Sylvania. On the other hand, his daughter Murray, who died tragically after believing in her controversial talent and going too far. If he suddenly completed the spell of star magic capable of resurrecting the dead, then which of the 2 would Professor Glast revive? Oelis wanted to know. Laurel didn't know what to say when she heard this madness. The secretary ran into the hall and reported the bad news that the student McLaurin had set off in pursuit of the professor. According to eyewitnesses, the professor stole not only the book, but also 2 students. He called out the names of Isla and Ed, and Laurel, who had been listening calmly until then, turned around, alarmed. The cunning fox immediately began to calculate in his mind that Director Oelis had promised to take responsibility and could instantly save Ed. Of course, it would have been wiser to just wait in place until it was all over, but she heard a strange noise and grabbed her binoculars. Putting it to her eyes, she looked in the direction of the source of the noise, towards the entrance to the sewer. The huge dragon Tarkin carried the mistress on his back and spewed out streams of her anger in the form of flame. Jane was in a hurry to save Ed, and Laurel resolutely declared that she was going to save the book. She stated that since the director was so indifferent, she should go and take the sage's seal herself, and pulled up her hood to hide her eyes. The cunning fox resolutely ordered everyone to follow her and to leave only a couple of people for negotiations. A combat alchemist who had gained recognition, Dorothy, the head of the 3rd faculty, her combat skills were at the highest level. But when she first started, it was Glast who recognized her talent first and helped nurture it, so she idolized the professor. So she thought that since the professor had gone to such extreme measures, there must have been some sense in it, even though she knew nothing about his intentions. She still decided to carry out Gast's order to protect him, but what she encountered was not at all what she had expected. A furious fire spirit of the highest rank appeared before the unfortunate girl. But even more frightening was his owner, who demanded to know where Ed was. But by that time, Dorothy had simply fainted from fear of death. Jane didn't understand if they were on the right path because it was Tarkin who directed them here. She ran through in her head all the twists and turns of the intricate water supply system beneath the academy. And then it dawned on her that she might be involved in the current state of Dorothy, whom she recognized. Jane decided to cover the unfortunate girl so that she wouldn't freeze. When footsteps were heard in the corridor and more people appeared, Laurel thought about Jane. She was the top student in the academy, with impressive fighting power, if you don't count Lucy. Whatever Jane does, be it destroying all the channels or fighting, she can ensure Ed's safety herself. In this case, it is she who will receive the laurels of the winner and savior. Laurel immediately painted herself a picture of the worst that would happen next, and what this could lead to in the long term. The red fox began to wave her arms furiously, driving away the intrusive thoughts. Usually she could analyze everything, but not now. Laurel told Jane that Ed had in fact already been rescued and that he had been badly hurt when he was kidnapped but was already lying in a hospital bed. But Jane did not believe such a blatant lie and asked why the younger one was telling her this. As soon as she determined Ed's location, she immediately rushed there and waited at the entrance. So how did they manage to save him? Jane was surprised. While Laurel's brain failed at the mention of the guy, Jane, on the contrary, began to think. So now they were equal in abilities. The cunning fox realized that she had been found out, and suddenly the trusting and naive girl gained a grip. At first, Jane asked the lazy cat for help, but she went for a walk yawning. But Lucy never listens and does everything her own way. So now she too decided to act alone, and a fire of rivalry flared up between the girls. Words were no longer needed. There was no point in arguing now. Each of the rivals simply chose their side of the labyrinth. The main thing was to save Ed from danger, Laurel decided. And with all her might, she rushed down the corridor to be first. Jane did exactly the same. And now the homeless forester has started having real problems. Suddenly, the earthquake repeated itself and collapsed the ceiling right on top of the ghost. Ed thought it would be better if it really was an earthquake. But in the rays of light that penetrated into the dungeon through the shafts she had made, a lazy cat sat and stretched. The reason for the bad ending was that she was tired of boredom and came after him, thus putting an end to the rivalry between the two sorceresses without even suspecting it. The director stood on the roof of the academy and watched the sunset. Obel decided not to interfere. Although it was a risky move for the students, it was a great opportunity to practice. Although this should be done within reasonable limits, his interlocutor objected. The current generation of students is not even golden, but diamond. There were none like them in all the previous years. In just one academic year, many talents have emerged who will be the ones with the greatest expectations in the future. But to Obel, it sounded like a warning that the trials ahead were so great that only such people could overcome them. A light smoke was smoldering on the roof of Ed's hut, left there from the fast start. The same one came from the mountain that was on the way from his house to the academy, and which was lucky enough to meet Lucy. And so she made a straight path where there was none before, ignoring all the laws of magic and common sense. Ed grabbed his head, realizing the disaster he was facing. The lazy cat asked him, as if nothing had happened, if he had any more dried venison, to which the forester replied that it was not there, and Lucy, disappointed, went to look for a place to sleep, but Ed said that it was impossible. The situation was dire. Jane and Laurel had already entered the labyrinth. They were easy enough to stop. Given Mac's height, if he defeats all the other bosses, the scenario won't be much distorted if one is missed. So while everything was fine, the problem was the hungry cat. If she meets Glast, it will be the end for everyone. Ed told her not to go anywhere and to be with him until the very end, and Lucy asked why. He had been told before that the greatest strength comes from the one who stands silently next to you in difficult times. Because she was strong, she didn't have to do anything, just be there for him, and then he would be safe, Ed said. But she started talking about meat again, and the fallen nobleman insisted that she just have to stay with him until they got out. Lucy offered to help him get out, but Ed objected that he still had a couple of things to do. In return, he had to carry the snoring cat on his back, which fortunately weighed almost nothing. Ed decided to just take what he needed from the library, find Laurel and Jane, and get out of the maze. In one of the corridors, bats attacked them. They were easy opponents, so Ed dealt with them using ignition. Only then did he feel the real taste of hunting, and experience poured down on him like golden rain. He mentally apologized to the main character who would have to work harder on himself. Unlike Jane, Laurel found the right path much faster. She had a talent for magical insight. But now her thoughts were far from joyful. She realized that she was striving to achieve something out of pure and good motives. She felt that she had found the key to a new relationship that could not be achieved with money, and her heart gave a loud thump. The same feeling as back then in the Oelis building, the sound coming from a nearby place. But while she was thinking, the wall in front of her exploded. She saw the one she had been thinking about for so long and was surprised. Looking at the girl, Ed told her that he had been kidnapped recently, although she already knew this. They had met very well, Ed said, and asked her to carry his things for him. They were high-class recipes, Laurel noted. But what was more important was to find out why he was not in deep crisis. He said he was like that, but everything was resolved, and then Laurel noticed another unusual piece of luggage from the guy. She felt a sharp pang of danger for her promise. Jane Phylor was a coward who would not dare to act, while Laurel achieved success through her actions. But how could Ed stand in front of her calmly with another woman in his arms, but the guy loaded her with errands instead of explanations? Now Laurel had to take a tough stance, push him against the wall, and take the initiative, the girl thought. But suddenly his face was so close and he said that he could not rely on anyone else but her. No matter how you look at it, Ed crossed the line by turning to Laurel even with such requests, increasing the already considerable debt. But his words about trust and gratitude completely destroyed her ability to think rationally. Another man appeared in the corridor and addressed Laurel. All this time he ran after her and was glad that he found her because they had problems. Meanwhile, Mac and the protagonist's retinue entered the labyrinth. Klaus, as usual, was standing behind everyone and was very nervous. But Elvira quickly brought him to his senses, saying that they would not leave without Isla. Mac also said that he was very sorry to bother them, but he wanted to save his friend. Zixs put his hand on Klaus's shoulder and said that even though they didn't get along, she was a good person and needed to be saved. They were led forward by the prophet Adele, a self-proclaimed romantic. She sensed something and showed them the direction. She had a feeling that the person they would face in the future would be a difficult opponent. And at that very moment, the wall she pointed at exploded. A dragon appeared, dragging someone in its teeth, and she begged for mercy. Jane still had trouble finding her way around this maze, so she simply went straight ahead. Leaving Claire behind, she turned to the heroes' team and greeted them warmly. Zixs also greeted the girl, unlike the others who immediately remembered the sensations of the past battle. Fear can deprive people of their reason and the ability to assess things soberly. There was no guarantee that they would prevail, but Mac decided to put all his strength into the attack. Jane didn't understand why her friends had such expressions. She hadn't done anything bad, she hadn't even hit Claire, who had simply lost consciousness. Zixs tried to calm down Mac, who had misunderstood everything and was rushing to save Ayla. When a third party appeared in the corridor and shouted at the hero to cool down, Mac was taken aback when he saw the face of his longtime enemy and rival in other matters. Jane immediately ran to Ed. She was glad to see that he was okay. Mac and Elvira bristled again. They already knew Ed's fighting style. With only basic skills in both shooting and archery, he managed to stop 3 opponents single-handedly who were stronger than him. Now Ed was surrounded by strong allies who protected him. Moreover, after the battle in Oelis, the fallen nobleman's abilities increased, and Mac could still break through Jane, but this wall was insurmountable. His chances of winning were close to 0, and Ed confidently headed in his direction. But when they drew level, the enemy slapped him on the shoulder and said that Ayla was waiting for him. Then Mac had to go and catch Glast, and everyone went their separate ways. Mac should have been writing the script as the lead character, Ed thought, and Ed had to deal with the variable that had arisen. From that moment on, the hunt for Elta was on, he decided. The report brought by employee Laurel said that private soldiers had arrived on Akan Island who had hired Elt. Elta was completely defeated and had no chance of returning in the original story, but he was overthrown in another time, giving him a chance to escape. Laurel knew that her adoptive father was planning a counterattack according to Kraid. But despite this, the experienced tycoon still found a loophole to repay the debt. There were many employees in the labyrinth. Its exit was not covered. The obtained materials could be much more useful than the original. If someone asked Ed what his best survival tool was, he would answer without a doubt that it was information about the future. The script plan has not changed, as in the original story. Elt, the intermediate boss, must leave at the end of the second act. Ed warned Zixs that the road was clear and they could save Ayla, and they would ask her guard their questions. Eventually, Mac has to figure out the script, because only he had all the necessary skills that he had learned before, thanks to which he would be able to meet that guy. After this, the magical tower summoned by Glast will cover the sky and release terrible magic. There are many hardships in Mac's future that will be difficult for the human spirit to cope with. There is no need for long approvals. Ed just wished him luck. The fallen aristocrats' company headed for the exit. Elt was targeting the Laurel Trading Company, and it was necessary to let the teachers know about it. Jane wanted to ask something, but Ed said that they had to hurry. The girl couldn't stand it, stopped and screamed loudly that he would suffer again. He was going there to capture the Golden King. Jane didn't know the details, but before that he was kidnapped and barely escaped. But a couple of days ago he was lying there without strength, and this was the business of a trading company. And this story had nothing to do with Ed. She didn't want him to suffer. Ed realized that Jane was right. It was someone else's story. He couldn't tell her the truth, which eliminates variables in the scenario, like Elty, Luckily, Laurel needed her and Jane to catch Elt, so she had to resort to trickery to lure them to her side. But Laurel instead agreed with Jane, saying that bringing Ed in was selfish and that he just needed to go somewhere safe. Of course, it was nice to see that an idyll of harmony had emerged between the two eternally quarreling girls, Ed thought. But this was not a situation where he could rest. He thanked them for their concern. And he said that, unfortunately, Laurel's case was not a foreign story to him, which stunned Jane. While Laurel was in a rosy dream about his words, not a stranger, Jane demanded an explanation. But Ed just ran on. First he needed to speed up. It was always so difficult for him to find an adequate reason, he thought. But Jane had thought of it for him. She remembered that he was bound to Laurel by contract, and if she lost the company, all the benefits would be over, she asked. Ed immediately agreed. It sounded more than plausible. It was not for nothing that Jane was the best in the second year. Ed paused for a second and turned back to the destruction. Mac was really scary. He swept through here like a hurricane. At times like this, he really can be cruel, Ed thought, looking at the lying girl. Jane adjusted the towel on the alchemist's face and didn't know what to say because all the destruction was her doing. The kind-hearted girl immediately began to justify herself, saying that she didn't mean it, and that she wasn't cruel at all, when they understood everything. Ed decided to put it off until later. They saw the light at the end of the tunnel. First of all, they needed to warn the teachers. But when they emerged from the labyrinth, Laurel's carriage and her men were completely destroyed. Elta had gotten here earlier than they thought. He stood alone, knee-deep in the stream from which the academy drew its water. Elt told Laurel that he taught her everything about data management, so even if he went through all her documents, he wouldn't find any evidence there. But she had gaps in personnel management. Even with simple threats, she was quickly betrayed, and the old man hid behind Elta's back. Even in this situation, Laurel smiled. The Golden King noticed. It took him a long time to see such a face. The only proof Elta could get was her confession, so he would have to resort to torture, he said. At his click, the people who were pretending to be killed jumped up and attacked Ed and company. But Laurel quickly intercepted their sword attacks, putting up spell barriers. Of course, she knew that her father would not come alone because last time he also arrived with mercenaries. But Elt asked not to compare. Now he was much better prepared and took archers with him. The second line was occupied by the best shooters on the continent. But the main fighting force of their team has not even woken up yet. Except for Laurel, Elta didn't care about the lives of the others, so he gave the order. The archers fired a volley, the arrows flying so densely that they seemed like a shower of steel. But Ed met them indifferently without even moving, because on his back was the best protection in the world. While Jane and Laurel were able to defend themselves, Jane told him to be careful. The opponents were acting in a coordinated manner. Ed thanked her, but realized that Elt was prepared for this too, since he had already encountered Jane. He took out a magic scroll from his pocket, an engineering item of legendary level. He suppressed the magical power around him for 10 minutes. This joke was a one-time thing, but it cost tens of gold coins. The mana limiter was similar to the Mothflower, the reagent that Elvira used, only this one also suppressed high-level magic. It had the disadvantage of requiring time to operate and preparation for activation, but it was a dangerous item. They were outnumbered. There was no way to get through a group of experienced mercenaries, and what was worse, their team consisted entirely of mages. Laurel became nervous, as expected. Her father did not come empty-handed. He knew the composition of her group, and as soon as the scroll took effect, they would be finished. She asked him how he would answer to the academy for this incident, to which the madman laughed and said that it was still better than losing his life. He sounded like some third-rate villain who had shaken up the world by limiting magic, Ed thought. If Elta survives, it will be a major factor in the world. He should have left the scene after being stabbed in the back by Laurel. Evil incarnate who killed her parents and used her to achieve his goals, but Ed did not feel any hostility towards him. After all, the reason Elta is so desperate to get in their way is because he's trying to survive, just like Ed himself. But even so, he wasn't going to give in. This wasn't an attempt to honestly eliminate variables in the script. It was just his selfishness, Ed thought. And he said to the lazy cat, "Stop sleeping." The girl stretched sweetly, getting off his back. "Too noisy," said the tiny sorceress, and a flash of magic blinded everyone. Magical bolts were shooting out around her as Lazy Lucy woke up. The great magician Glock wrote his last book in solitude in a hut unknown to anyone except one girl. He already had talent and the blessing of the stars, but Glock believed that this was no reason to stop learning. "Live and learn," he told Lucy. "Use power for good and be prepared for the loneliness that will overtake you because the power of superiority accompanies loneliness. Glast asked to promise him 3 things: not to kill, to avoid getting little hands dirty with blood, even if it was an accident. And also, at least while she was studying and living in Sylvania, to live like the other students, the girl remembered her promise. The mercenaries that Elt brought were the best, if only because they were all veterans. All their lives they had walked on the edge of a knife, avoiding death, and managed to survive, and now their developed instincts told them to stop immediately. Elt shouted at them that they were crazy if they stood still. But those who were younger did not have this instinct developed as much. They did not know this magic, and they went into battle. Being a mage, Lucy wasn't very good at using magic. These are just physical forces that appeared under the influence of the pressure of magical forces. The blow of the mercenary was thrown back. Elta became nervous. There was still some time left before the scroll was activated. Lucy realized that he was the leader, which meant that only he needed to be eliminated and prepared to give him a flick. But Ed put his hand on her shoulder and stopped her. Elta was already broken and disgraced. And at that moment he felt an earthquake and immediately understood what caused it. 7 great stars created a line, Professor Glast's star magic, whose level makes the laws of nature tremble. Finally I woke up, as if the devil had come to earth. The final scene of the second act. The magic tower that blocked the sky. Max should have already destroyed all the monsters in the sewers and acquired the required skills. Although it took him a long time to gather his team, he was able to delay Glast. Glast's magic was different from usual, so everyone except Ed. Everyone was shocked. Even Jane and Laurel didn't understand what was happening. Each of the 10 towers was absorbing stellar energy, Lucy said, barely glancing at them. She immediately understood Glast's plan and realized that it was possible. Resurrection of the dead, the girl whispered, and was stunned by her discovery. Epilogue. After the end of the second act, Lucy spoke like this after waking up after everything that happened. According to the script, she was supposed to sleep on the roof as usual. But if you wake her up and take her into the team, Professor Glast will have problems, and then he will propose to her. Bring back to life not Sylvania, but another star mage, her student. The great magician Glast, Lucy's teacher, after which she becomes an enemy. The player's team is immediately destroyed, and a bad ending occurs. All that's left to do is watch Lucy walk away from the sewers alone, even though she's not an enemy. There's no way to defeat her. Since the deviation from the original plot happened suddenly, Ed was able to make his own changes by intervening personally. Sometimes it seemed to him that these changes could prevent a bad ending, he thought, when the scroll was activated. A vase appeared that drew in all the magical power. Elta directed its action at Lucy, who looked at the magical towers of Glast as if spellbound. Elta gave the order to the remaining people. Now the students were without protection. But turning to face the mercenary, Ed effortlessly used the wind blade, easily throwing him away. Even the scroll couldn't contain him. Elta's face froze into a mask of amazement. Even legendary-level suppression items had their limitations. Everything has its exceptions, Lucy said. She was in a hurry. A place appeared where she wanted to go. Elt looked at the witch with a crazy look. He was on the verge of life and death and seemed very tiny in front of Lucy. He felt his imminent death, and the lazy cat gave him a flick. Ed told her that if she couldn't kill him, she'd better stop, and the sorceress was surprised that he was worried about the villain's life. She immediately remembered the promise she had made to her teacher. Ed looked at Lucy silently, as if he had already accepted any outcome. But the girl gave up her intentions and turned around to leave. Ed asked her where she was going, and the lazy cat replied that she was on business. Conversations with Ed always ended like that. She thought he wouldn't answer, but Ed asked if she was sure she wouldn't regret her decision later. And Lucy thought, losses are inevitable. Those who experience them become resilient, although it is sad, Glast wrote. And he wished his student to be stronger on the pages of his book. She became the end of his life because he entrusted his last proposal to her. The old man died with a smile on his face. Lucy briefly replied that she wouldn't regret it and teleported away. All 50 mercenaries left the island in their boats. Ed put aside his thoughts about how to deal with the defeated Elt and climbed the hill, breathing heavily. First, he needed to lure his recruits into the organization. Laurel took it upon herself, and she would also carry out the sentence. Ed gave it his all. It wasn't easy to get to the top quickly. The Trix buildings, the starting point of this episode, a lone tower on a hill. Glast took the sage's seal during the transfer ritual. Mac chased after him. This is where the story begins. There was something ironic about the fact that this was where it all started and where it was supposed to end. Ed opened the doors to the roof. Glast lived poorly. He gave all his property to the academy. Traces remained in every corner of the academy. So it wasn't hard to find Lucy in a place where the entire academy could be seen. For her, this entire academy is a memory of the teacher who raised her. Sitting on the roof and watching the apocalyptic scene, Lucy asked him again if he had any jerky. But Ed was forced to remind her that he had already said this, and Lucy hissed in disappointment. This conversation was already familiar to Ed. He asked her what she was doing, and Lucy said she was reminiscing about the past and patted the one next to her, inviting him to sit next to her. Ed looked over the edge of the railing. If he fell from here, he would die instantly. In the past, Lucy had a hard time. She cried a lot, but now she let go. She thought for a long time about the reason for her relief, but then she realized that it was simple. Too much time had passed. So much had passed, and she was still trying to heal the wounds like a fool. She just needed to save her grandfather with the magic of her ancestors and not let him go. Glock had finished all his business before his death, so for the Archmage, resurrection would be the strongest poison, and she would have to kill him again. Lucy knew from the start that saving, or something like that, was an act of her greed. Ed asked her if she was really okay now. For his part, he couldn't dissuade her and tell her not to go. But at the same time, he couldn't help but ask her why Lucy, who wanted to resurrect her teacher, changed her mind. If she gives in to her desire again, something terrible could happen. For a second, Ed thought she was going to talk about meat again, but Lucy asked him to lend her shoulder and leaned against him. Ed wondered why he had to sit on the very edge. But looking at the dazzling performance in front of them, he understood what was going on. In the future, it will be extremely difficult to find those who will study star magic as passionately as Glast, the magic of rebirth. This is the end. What is dead, and the only way to make up for the loss is with what is currently available. And Lucy realized that. So they sat together, watching as the magic tower rose into the sky, and the stars seemed to become higher than usual. A steel giant rose from the depths to protect the offering. The team of students stood frozen in indecision before him. An ancient weapon created by Glast using star magic, the magic golem. Isla was imprisoned within its core, and Glast was in control of the machine. He directed all his power at the annoying Mac and his friends. They were saved by Zixs, who possessed power equal to that of the golem. Turning around, he shouted at Mac to move forward. While the golem stood motionless, Mac yanked his arm up. He was able to attack Glast, and the professor cursed his nearsightedness. At some point, he could no longer see anything without his glasses, and Mac's sword reached its target and wounded him. The life of a teacher is a static law. He lived in his office, studied the seal of the sage, analyzed star magic, and only in passing he noticed that it was snowing outside the window. A first-year student from the Faculty of Elements was constantly coming into his office. She keeps saying that she wants to study star magic. It's raining outside, and in the office, the assistant who caused the problems always comes and tearfully asks for forgiveness. The spring wind is blowing. The best dean of the academy has dropped in to see him. Even after he became rector, nothing changed. I still dropped in to see him for a cup of tea. That's how he lived, sitting in one place, completely immersed in work. He wanted the painful memories to disappear one day. Even the wounded Glast was able to throw Mac back with a shockwave. He used minor time reversal, and the star magic reversed his wounds. But the pain of the memories did not go away. Waving his hand, Glast caused a huge flash. Zixs, who had been holding the golem all this time, began to fall down. A huge burst of magic covered the entire battlefield. Glast used a multi-layered time prison, and the entire squad froze, caught in a trap from which there was no escape. Zixs grabbed Mac and pushed him out of the way of Glast's attack, but was caught in the stop wave himself. Mac caught a piece of his sword on the wall of the magic tower. Sometimes his vision becomes blurry, and then he sees something behind the darkness of his eyelids. And this is his main loss, thought Glast. Closing his eyes, he almost reached his goal. When Mac climbed onto the roof of the magic tower holding a piece of a sword in his hands, Glast shouted at him to give up and did not try to stop him. He went against reality with all his might. The golem that was supposed to take down Mac exploded after being cut multiple times when he used his skills. The flames of the explosion almost knocked the professor off his feet, but he remained standing. Mac used the holy sword technique. His hair became white as snow. But even the complete resolution of the golem could be reversed. Time moved backwards, even for the guys he slowed down. Glast shouted that it was all useless, even if the rest of his lifeline was cut off. But then he was pierced by the ice magic of the barrier and then lowered by an ice spear. Zixs, who had thawed out from the time magic, came to help Mac again. The entire squad worked together to neutralize the professor's forces. And then Glast realized that he had reached his limit. There was a monstrous explosion, and the golem, no longer protected by magic, was destroyed. And Mac managed to pull Ayla out of the core at the last second. The professor admitted defeat and fell from the roof of the main tower. He missed Murray so much, the professor thought as he fell into the abyss. But then he activated the magic circle of transference that he had prepared in advance. With the power of star magic, he moved under a tree near the academy. He prepared it in case of escape, but activated it too late. It was useless to stop the bleeding with magic. Even in the original script, there was no follow-up action on the part of the professor. One look was enough to understand that the professor would die here, Ed thought. An hour earlier, when the battle in the magic tower had just begun. Jane threw the mercenaries off the island, and Elta was locked up in a trading company. All problems were solved. Laurel was rushing to the meeting they had agreed on. She just needed to check that Ed was okay. And she found him down at the Trix's tower, with Lucy holding on to his sleeve. And this did not escape the keen eye of Laurel. She experienced that feeling again. All her instincts were screaming and sounding the alarm of danger. At this time, Student Dorothy and Professor Claire's assistant appeared, which meant that the situation in the reservoir was resolved. Both girls were crying. Ed was surprised. He didn't know why. And then their crying turned to screams of horror, but they looked past him. After all, Jane had landed behind Ed, and their squad was assembled again. Earlier, when he told her that the magic tower was powered by star magic, she wanted to check something. Although her recent actions resembled total surveillance of Ed, initially she wanted to protect the northern forest. However, a few days ago, Tarkin detected magical energy similar to the one currently emanating from the tower. However, there was not a single magical tower in the northern forest, and they became curious about what Glast was doing there. In the novel, after the main events, nothing happened. Ed thought about leaving everything as is. But even Elt, being a fake boss, had a huge impact on the plot. It is difficult to imagine what the professor was capable of if he did not leave the stage. Then they went to check anyway. Glast was lying under a tree and asked him why he wasn't home during curfew. Jane was horrified, being more sensitive to such scenes. Glast told them he was just looking at the moon, even though he looked funny. Jane objected that this was not so, but the professor was laughing at himself. It was all because he realized he had failed, Ed said. And the professor praised him, as they said. He had been beaten by ordinary students. Even if Glast had won, he would have been defeated by Director Obel. Ed was a more talented student than he initially thought. It was unlike him to notice him so late. He kidnapped Ed to somehow include him in his plan because of his great talent, but the plan failed because the young man was overtired. So he caught him in a hurry, but when he returned, Ed had already escaped. Dying alone was a small price to pay for what he had done, but his 17 years with his daughter were not lonely. 17 years so much and at the same time so little. Ed asked the professor if he had not been friends with Claire if their relationship had lasted until his retirement, which would have been exactly 17 years. He told Glast that on the way here he met Claire and she cried despite his terrible character and actions. He was the most stubborn old man Claire had ever met, an arrogant curmudgeon who left all the work to her. And yet, he was a true scientist in every sense of the word. Perhaps Claire guessed his plans. Dorothy, too, said in a trembling voice that she had not known of his plans, but that for her he had been a precious teacher who had discovered her talent. But despite this, the professor was the one who arbitrarily disposed of the student's life. And no one will deny the fact that he is a criminal. But now, while he was thinking about his life, there was no one around. That's why he ridiculed himself for dying alone, but this was a delusion. If you think about it, Claire became a teacher at such a young age. And Dorothy, a senior in the alchemy department, was the one who was considered untalented. But the professor, although he said that they were no good, continued to stimulate their development every now and then, revealing the talents of each one. Just like he said his daughter also has value. He spent too much time in the company of others to die alone, for he was a benefactor in the hearts of others. He was extremely nearsighted, and at some point, he stopped seeing what was in front of his eyes, and even himself. The professor visited the Soul Library and praised Ed for his hard work. He chose all the legendary recipes. But he said that it made no sense, since Ed himself had messed things up. He had to clean up the mess, the professor told him, and handed him the key. This personal library is his now, the professor whispered. Ed asked why the key was being given to him, and the professor scolded him for his displeasure. At the bottom of the table that Rain's ghost guarded was a safe. After completing the investigations, he should head there, the professor warned. He addressed his last words to Lucy, who was nearby. He wished her to sometimes look around herself and not repeat his mistakes. Ed wanted to see Lucy's face at that moment, but the only thing he saw was Professor Glast closing his eyes as if he had fallen asleep. He lay peacefully under the tree in the soft rays of the moonlight, and one might have thought that he was simply sleeping. So for a while they just looked at him. not believing that he was gone. The dean scolded Ed for getting himself into trouble again, just like with the capture of Oelis, and now with the seal of the sage. Moreover, he was in the very hell. As a completely unlucky person, Ed listened to the rector's lectures all night long, which was the main bad luck. According to him, the dean realized that Ed did not know why he was kidnapped, and then ran away on his own, after which he ran into Mac. Ed said that was exactly what happened. Jane and Laurel quickly came to his aid, then Dean asked why he left Isla alone. Ed replied that the girl was unable to move and did not trust him at all. That's why he went alone for help, Ed answered, but the dean abruptly interrupted him. He strongly suspected the fallen nobleman and did not hide it. It is not surprising, because although Ed's words were logical, his story is full of coincidences. Even though he was pretending to be a third party, the dean thought he still knew a lot, but the guy just brushed it off. It was worth admitting, however, that in the incident with the dormitory and with the professor, he suffered damage due to the negligence of the management. Ed was surprised that the dean was holding his report card in his hands, and the teacher noted his diligence in his studies. Therefore, the academy should reward him for his work and efforts. The dean surprised him. He left the office silently, lost in his thoughts, but they were already waiting for him. Ed apologized to Jane for making her worry and asked if she was okay since she had to fight, but the girl brushed him off. But after the sparrow's advice, she said that she was not completely confident in her health, so she suffered a little while saving him. Ed showed genuine concern and asked what was wrong with her, and Jane said that her back was a little sore. Ed said he thought a lot about her because she had been so diligent in helping him, that she even suffered while he took everything for granted, and he asked if she felt anything after Glast's death. Having lost something, it was too late to regret. Ed said he was definitely ashamed. He felt like a burden. He was grateful to her, but in the end, she always suffered. Ed took it all so seriously, completely unaware of her game, and suggested ending their relationship, so Jane immediately apologized for her lie. And Ed decided to change the awkward topic, remembering that she lived in Dex's dorm now. And he too, starting next semester, will return to this building, which made Jane very happy. A lot had happened, but it all passed in the blink of an eye, and now it was safe to say that the second act had been cleaned up perfectly. The dean suggested that he end his life as a hermit and return to the normal life of a student. Ed had the right to do so. He allowed him to return to the hostel, and the boy looked thoughtfully at his forester's hut. He was filled with greed. He built a fence, sowed annual plants, strengthened the dwelling, but all this turned out to be useless. This meant that his life in this hermit camp had come to an end. But as he was entering the house, Lucy fell out of the sky, wearing only her pajamas. It was starting to rain. A little girl was walking through the forest. This place was not an academy, but a mountain range in the north. After so many years, she had a dream about her childhood, Lucy realized, seeing a familiar house. And she thought that maybe, even through the veil of sleep, she would be able to see the old man again. But a completely different picture appeared before her instead of the expected one. Dust, cobwebs, stench. It was a nightmare in which the dead man turned to her, screamed, and asked why she didn't save him. Lucy woke up in a bad mood after a nightmare. The maid who came to wake her up said that it was time to get ready for class. But Lucy used a high-ranking teleportation spell and disappeared in a purple flash. She herself did not know for what reason, but she wanted to go to the northern part of the forest. The young man who lived in the house he himself built was returning. For no particular reason, she felt calmer in her soul when she saw him. But when she heard the words that he would leave, she lost her balance and fell. Like all representatives of the feline family, she was very unpredictable. If you want to touch a cat, they avoid it and build up their value, but if you are busy, they start following you around like a tail. It is worth noting that all cats are like this, and making them obedient is not easy. To achieve what you want, you must immediately give up any manifestation of interest in them. If they wanted to get a feline familiar, they just needed to attract attention and take a neutral position, the teacher said. Then the cat will reach out to you, although this is more difficult than building a love relationship, said the professor of monstrology. The lecturer, Flavian, was very experienced. The course was very popular. Ed's grades were not high, but because of this, things went better. His progress became so high that even according to his notes, he surpassed many. The lesson was over, and the teacher asked him to stay late and come to his laboratory. Professor Flavian asked him if he knew about the undergraduate scholarship that provided a discount on tuition. It was a good opportunity for Ed, and he asked about the specifics of the job. Most of the professors had done their work, but Claire needed help. She had a lot of work to do. His student Anis had an amazing ability to cope with everything, to create study plans, to conduct exams for first-year students. Flavian asked not to stand in too strict a pose at the first-year meeting. Ed wondered if that same person would be among the newcomers to the academy. Laurel's magical senses were going crazy, and she didn't know what was happening. She thought about something else. Could she really sell it to Crade? Ed initially approached her because he didn't want the thing to go to the Duke, but she immediately pulled herself together. She had to think about the proceeds since she bought the book for resale. She should be more mean, Laurel convinced herself, and decided not to put things off for too long. Of course, she didn't think he would grant every request she made when she reread Ed's letter. Only if she has the certificate, the sly fox smiled at her thoughts. She had a special notice on her desk about the winter holidays, but Professor Glast was no longer there, and the question was who would replace him. She wouldn't have to worry about camp anymore. It was the end of the semester now, so Laurel wasn't the only one busy. Jane and Ed had all been working like crazy, and there was a good chance Lucy wouldn't change either, Laurel thought as she bent her pen. Suddenly, she felt a strange anxiety, and she couldn't understand where it came from. Lucy told Ed that he was running low on firewood and that with the cold weather coming, his supplies would not last. And he hadn't been hunting lately, the girl said, and Ed was surprised by her unusual participation. He looked at her and thought that in her eyes he looked careless, but soon they would see each other less often, and that would help stabilize the scenario. Jane ran into the camp. Her classes for the day were over and the afternoon lectures were canceled. With the holidays coming, she won't be able to visit the camp, so she should come here as often as possible, the girl said. She had had so much fun here that she was even upset that it was all over, she said under Lucy's watchful gaze. Although it was sad to leave the camp, a healthy environment was more important to Ed, and Jane told him to visit her when he decided to move. While Jane was chattering happily, Ed thought it was time to visit the secret library and the key to which Glast had left him, and Jane put a letter in his palm with a key. It was an application for a room in Dex. It needed to be submitted quickly so as not to miss the chance. Ed thanked the girl for taking care of even such small things. She offered to help her put it together. This was an important part, so Jane wanted to solve it right away, but a shadow flashed in front of her. Lucy shielded Ed as if he was being threatened by a pack of hyenas. Lucy didn't know what to say or even how to explain her impulsive behavior, so she simply told her to stop. Turning to Ed, she said in a trembling voice not to take it. That was the day it all started, Ed thought, staring at the sorceress in surprise. Jane continued to help him practice his spirit magic. Ed was making progress, but Jane was troubled by something. She felt an obsessive presence. Unable to bear it, the girl asked Lucy what she had done wrong. Usually, Oelis's maids looked after Lucy's neat appearance, but today the sorceress ran away from them from the very morning. Ed's mana has also increased. At this rate, he will be able to master mid-level magic. He was quietly reading a book when a lonely cat landed on his lap. She didn't leave him alone even at lunch at the academy, and Ed, who usually ignored her, didn't know what came over her. For some reason, the lazy cat was especially hostile towards Jane, even though she offered her apologies, although she looked more like a guard than an aggressor. However, learning intermediate magic was more difficult than he thought. Even in a whole day, Ed had not mastered the basics. Lucy asked him what he was going to do when she left, and Ed replied that he was just going to visit somewhere. He also had to check the fireplace and the fire. At night, the temperature dropped below 0. If something was wrong, you could freeze to death. Although if he moved to the dorms, he wouldn't have to think about such things anymore in any case. There were things to do before going to the Glast library. But Lucy did not lag behind and came closer, demandingly seeking his gaze. Without understanding why, she suggested going together. Ed climbed down the rope he had tied to the tree through the passage Lucy had made last time and asked why she was coming with him. The sorceress replied that he could have come down simply with the help of her magic. Ed decided to drop the subject. In any case, he had to check if he could get down or up here on his own. He was not able to take all the goods at once, which meant he would have to come here more than once. Ed pushed the broken table aside. Who would have thought that Glast would arrange his hiding place in such a place? He didn't know why the professor kept the keys with him until the very end, but when he put it in the lock and turned it, a stream of magic hit them in the face. The items ordered from Laurel would arrive soon, but Ed was hesitant to order a ladder from her. He could barely lift the load. He offered her a break, and Lucy asked what thing he had taken from the hiding place. Ed showed her the Phoenix ring, which distorted the timeline, transferring power from the future to the present. This allowed him to use the powers of his future self in the present, so he could use high-ranking magic right now. But if you use it, you will be unable to fight for a long time, equal to the amount of effort expended. If he used such power hastily, the price would be enormous. If he wanted to use it in battle, he could only do so when he was pressed against a wall. But if it wasn't a fight, Like a contract with a spirit, Jane could control strong spirits due to her huge mana reserves. Beginning spellcasters had little experience in mana, and even just talking to a spirit required practice. But if he increased his maximum magical power at least temporarily, then he would have a contract with a high-ranking spirit in his pocket. There were risks here, too. Lucy said that if she had time, she would create something else. But Ed objected that all this was a relic of the past, and there was no point in thinking about it. After all, even if he returns to the library, he will not find anything more valuable than this, Ed said, and returned the ring to his pocket. The professor wouldn't waste time on useless things. Ed had something in his hands that could break through the limit of magical power. It was for this reason that the professor began studying magical engineering, and he hid it from everyone until the very end. All this was a gift for his daughter. As they were climbing, Lucy began from afar, with a story about a lost button that she had not previously noticed until it disappeared. She was very tormented by this, because it often happens that what you consider important disappears at some point, the girl said. It may have been a trifle, but it turns out that it has weight. She wanted to ask him about something. That's why she went after Ed. The talk was about moving him back to a dormitory, albeit for commoners. With trepidation, Lucy asked him not to move if possible. It was a phrase that even with pliers you couldn't extract from a taciturn cat. In his heart, Ed was neutral. Both options had their advantages. If he moved to Dex, his life would be more comfortable, and living in the woods in this weather was crazy, Ed said. Lucy covered her face with the wide brim of her witch's hat and agreed with him. She noticed that it was going to rain soon. Lucy usually always accurately predicted the arrival of bad weather, but her predictions weren't always accurate, Ed thought, looking at the crimson clouds in the sky from which white flakes were falling. After all, rain was not the only form of water that fell from the sky. The long period of rain had long since passed, but it still reminded them of itself. And they looked silently at the sky. Ed casually said that he had been busy lately and hadn't had time to prepare firewood for the winter and asked her to help with that. After all, he can't cope alone, and she herself said so. Hearing his words, the girl immediately grabbed him into her arms. Even though she was lighter than a feather, Ed still fell to the ground from her pressure, but she didn't believe that he would stay. And Ed said that he had already gotten used to life in the camp, and if he worked a little more on the conditions, then life in the camp would give more advantages. Lucy pressed herself against him again, dropping him to the ground, and the second act ended. As soon as you close your eyes, a whole bunch of thoughts about the upcoming confrontation, that the battle for the post of student council president, creeps into your head, until new enemies join the academy as new students. And the final boss of the third act, Lucy Merrill. Even though it was not an easy matter, Ed decided to put his worries aside for a while because after the next episode, everything would be fine. He had this confidence because after all the scenes and trials, he saw such an expression on Lucy Merrill's face for the first time. Winter had arrived, the time of year when cold weather sets in. Although it had snowed, the weather was calm. Ed made it a rule not to overwork himself even if there was a lot to do, but tomorrow there was a lot to do at the academy, so today he was solving all the issues at the camp. It was necessary to sort out the preparation of firewood and food supplies. Thanks to the cold weather, the storage period increased, and he was able to quickly prepare the required amount of provisions. Ed gave up the dorm in exchange for a discount on tuition and was able to solve the payment issue. He no longer had to work as much as he did in the beginning. He looked with displeasure at Lucy, who did nothing but sleep, but he stopped throwing the cat out of the house. She wouldn't have frozen anyway because she was surrounded by protective magic. But it was more a matter of mood, a feeling of relaxation that no one knows when else I'll be able to experience. And if we talk about the least risky point, now was the perfect moment to call upon the mistress of the forest, Marie. And Ed squeezed the ring